The tale kicks off in the year 550 of the Madak Kingdom. Ramsay and his father were deep in an intense conversation. The father jabbed his finger at a spot on the map. Then she looked him in the eye and swore this land was his from that moment on. Hans Rugel the father was a lowly baron, clinging to a tiny sliver of land in the north of the Madak Kingdom. The land hands pointed out that Ramsay sat at the farthest north, nothing but a brutal, empty wasteland with not a single soul. Baal, Ramsay's oldest brother, sat on the throne of the Rugel domain, while Kun, his older brother, stayed in the shadows as the emergency backup. And since he was the third son, Ramsay got tossed aside and left to wither in everyone else's shadow. In short, he was just a pain in the neck, another mouth that didn't make things easier. Ramsay grinned at the news that they'd finally get the land, and the moment it was announced, he practically declared himself a branch of the Rugel family. Hans shot forward and they both agreed. Ramsay told him he'd better swap his last name too, so he wouldn't get mixed up with the main family. From that moment on, he vowed, "Call me Ramsay Bartlett." When Hans heard it, he blurted, "Wait, was that really okay?" And Ramsay couldn't shake the feeling it was almost cruelly ironic to play pair and wind up totally useless. He admitted it wasn't great, but he swallowed his pride, understood the situation, and begged, "Could I at least get some startup money?" His mother shoved the bag of money into his hands, and Hans leaned in and swore he'd already lined up 1,000 rubellas. Ramsay mentally crunched the numbers. One loaf meant one rubella, and figured as the third son, he'd grab every last scrap of advantage he could. His mother leaned in, eyes brimming, and admitted, "I'm sorry," and he shot them a look and demanded, "Is that everything you wanted to talk about?" His hands opened up as he admitted, straight from the heart, that as a father he felt nothing but regret for not being able to do more for him. Ramsay flashed a grin, told him to breathe easy, and promised he'd be out in a week. Then he slammed the door behind him and headed straight for the village, shouting that he was on his way. Right outside the house, he swallowed hard and thought, "Yeah, I get it. This is exactly how it has to be." Since he was a reincarnator, his mind was way older than his body, like a 13-year-old kid wearing an ancient soul. Before all of this, Shaitru Ikaruga was just a normal Japanese guy, until a brutal black company grind in the northern lands swallowed his life. Then out of nowhere, he was ripped away in the most cliché way possible, splat against a truck. He suddenly snapped to it, he'd been reincarnated as Ramsay. He had zero links to the nobility, and being the third son meant inheriting the family legacy was basically a dead end. He could also try hooking himself up as a retainer to another noble through marriage. But instead of backing down, he charged straight to the land he'd been given. He rolled up his sleeves, turned that untouched land into something thriving, and built the village he'd always dreamed of. He was dead set on making it happen. Right then, his buddy Danny rolled in just to say, "Hey." Danny was the village's fourth son, the only one in the whole place with that title. Like Ramsay, he had an older brother he couldn't inherit from, so that turned into a bond they leaned on hard. Ramsay walked up, said hi, and told him he had to pick something up for him. He leaned in and told him he'd need rye beans, turnip seeds, and an axe gleamed, a saw waited, and then cloth and salt lined up like the tools of a grim little ritual. Danny intercepted him and demanded to know what he thought he could possibly use it for, then pressed him on whether he was really about to set off on a journey. Ramsay shut it down, said it wasn't like that at all, then told him, "Leave," and handed him some land so he'd have a place to live. Danny was completely stunned, and Ramsay firing off, "You okay?" made him snap. He yelled at him. Ramsay snapped back, saying he just found out about it that very day, like he should have been told sooner. Then Danny fired off a whole bunch of questions, like, "Where's the territory?" and told them everything he knew about how big it was. Ramsay answered it all, and Danny leaned in and asked, "So what's your plan?" And the guy admitted he hadn't really thought it through yet, then fired the question right back at him. Did it not seriously make him lose his temper? They shoved those babies into the world, then tossed them aside the second they weren't useful anymore. Danny was completely stunned. Ramsay knew it, just like him and Danny, the world was packed with endless, pointless people. He shot him a hand and promised, "I'm gonna make those guys swallow their pride, one bite at a time." Danny grinned, dabbed at him, and promised, "We'll take a shot." Ramsay grinned because he finally had an ally in his corner. Danny leaned in and asked, "So what am I supposed to do?" Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know how many villagers were trapped in the same mess as them. He shot back maybe there were around 10 men and women mixed in. He ordered him to go face those people and tell them they'd build a brand new village side by side. Danny nodded and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." They said their goodbyes, and Ramsay snapped that he finally had to handle his own part from here. Back home, Ramsay and Hans were bent over stacks of books and papers, soaking up every last scrap of info about the land. Hans shoved more books into his hands and insisted, straight up, that he should use every bit of that info too. Ramsay realized he had to scout the land ahead first, because every bit of intel could mean the difference between winning and getting wrecked. And yeah, the weather mattered most. No rain-by-rain temperature chart meant they could only gamble, using records from nearby villages to guess what was coming. He'd watch the snow usually roll in around mid-December, bury everything, and then finally start melting by the end of February. Vanishes for good by April, and he can't stop wondering, was this the same kind of fate as Hakodate? Hands pressed him for an answer, asking if that information actually helped him. Ramsay nodded along and said, yeah, then leaned in and asked if he could show him the map. They did just that, then together they stared out at their lands, tracing the exact borders while they argued and worked it out. He jabbed a finger at the tiny river and demanded to know if it could serve as their boundary. Hands shrugged and said, yeah, I'm good. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know which lands touched this one, east, west, and straight to the north. Hands leaned in and told him that Baron Bowden waited to the west, and the Beverly Mountains carved out the very edge of their territory. To the east stretched the kingdom's own lands, until the Tess River cut it all off like a hard border. To the north, Baron Hendrik ruled over the land, and right at the edge stood a towering wall marking the boundary. Ramsay couldn't stop wondering, would he have enough timber to build, and enough drinking water to keep everyone alive? He told the hands he was scared the soil wouldn't hold, but he made them promise, keep working it, step by step, and stay patient. He thanked Hands with real sincerity, admitted it helped, then turned and headed back to his room. After he stormed out of the office, Ramsay headed to his cold, barren room, empty, quiet, and lifeless. He plopped onto the bed and declared it was time to leave this cramped, storage-sized room behind for good. He told himself, all I've got to do is haul my clothes, that coat, a knife, and a blanket, and that's it. And then he pushed the thought aside and stuffed 500 rubellas deep in his pocket. He tilted his head up and spotted a spider web, and even then he couldn't call it a good place. Sure, it was comfy to snack without lifting a finger. Compared to being a corporate slave trapped in a brutal black company, his new life felt like jumping from night into daylight. He stretched and thought, Danny S. got to round everyone up, because now he had to get the deed to that land from his father. He already knew his plate was overflowing with things he had to get done. Right then his door got yanked open, and his brothers barreled in right behind it. They taunted him, yelling that Ramsay was finally being disowned, and that he was leaving for good. They kept taunting him, and Ramsay snapped back. He'd stay right there because he owned the land. His brother burst out laughing at the whole thing. He insisted there was no way he'd survive on that lousy little plot of land, and called him completely naive. Then they noticed Ramsay still grinning, and it instantly lit a fuse in them. His older brother yanked the ball away, spat on him, and snarled that he was absolutely furious and he couldn't stand it anymore. He just wanted him to hurry up and drop dead in that new territory. They both stormed out of his room, and Ramsay cleaned himself up. Then he started telling him about the old world. They used to say, be the top chicken, not the bottom ox, because leadership beats dragging behind. He stared out the window and saw the whole night sky blazing with stars, then shot his hand up like he could snag one, and he couldn't ignore it. He'd been handed a second life, and he was going to grab that chance. He'd be the head of the chicken, never the tail of the ox, and with those hands, he'd forge the new world from nothing. The very next morning, Ramsay stormed onto his land, itching to claim his territory and start the grind. He stared at the map, hunting down the markings that proved his territory was his to claim. He dropped to the ground and felt it, hard, brittle, ready to snap under him. When he finally clocked it, tilling was gonna be brutal. He trekked into the mountains and stumbled on birch trees everywhere, like the whole peak was covered in them. He was sure getting through, the wood was going to be a total breeze. He knelt, pressed his hand into the soil, and felt it, soft, rich, and fluffy. And when he looked up, he realized the mountain dirt was way better than anything the plains could offer. He realized the smartest move was to set up the base right at the mountain's feet. He realized waking up early was the smartest move. And now he couldn't stop thinking about whether he should head back to the village. Morning slid by, and by afternoon, Ramsay finally stumbled into the village, knuckles white with hunger, because he hadn't eaten a single thing since morning. Right then he spotted a boy calling his name and yelling for him to stop. It was Roger, the lumberjack's youngest son, and he sprinted up to him, practically bursting with relief that he'd finally found him. When Ramsay cornered him and demanded to know why he was in such a rush, he told me Danny had been hunting for me. He leaned in with excitement and told him Danny said he was getting out of this village. Ramsay made it crystal clear he wasn't choosing to abandon the village. He was getting driven out. Roger begged him because his older brother bullied him nonstop for being fat and painfully slow. Ramsay realized every single household was living the exact same nightmare. He was thrilled to find new companions, but the moment the crowd grew, he realized he couldn't spare a single extra meal. Roger told me his family had been lumberjacks for generations. Then his older brothers swooped in and grabbed all the logging rights. Then it hit him, he'd been planning to build a base right at the foot of that mountain. He asked Roger if he could cut down the trees, and Roger nodded right away, telling him to leave all the wood to him. They both locked eyes as they shook hands. Ramsay threw him a warm welcome and Roger lit up, saying he couldn't wait. After what felt like forever, they finally reached a house. Right where Danny and the whole group he'd rounded up were already waiting, staring them down. Danny shot a warning to Ramsay, he was running late and demanded to know where he'd been roaming. He leaned in and told him, "I've been scouting this territory." Danny then threw the spotlight on everyone he'd gathered. Willie, the farmer's fifth son, and Eric, the carpenter's second son. Danny said these two were ready to jump in and help Ramsay chase his dreams. Ramsay thanked them both, then leaned in and demanded to know what made them decide to team up with them. Willie told everyone his parents had left him nothing but empty hands, so if he was going to grow crops, it didn't matter where he did it. Eric swore there was zero special reason behind it. He stormed out because the bond with his brother was completely broken. Ramsay's eyes widened when another sibling started a full-on fight. Then it finally hit him that was exactly how it all worked. This village was broke to the bone, and every day of survival fanned the flames of pure discontent. Living in poverty numbed their hearts and minds, and bit by bit, they stopped caring about anyone else. Ramsay wanted to build a village that wouldn't end up like the one they were trapped in. Then Eric snapped at Ramsay, telling him they weren't like him. Mess up. No problem, they could always just turn back. Ramsay froze for a second, then realized he was right, they weren't thrown out. If something felt off, they didn't hesitate. They could toss their bags, turn around, and head back to the village anytime they wanted. But even so, it still burned Ramsay deep, and then he forced himself to stop replaying it in his head. He lifted his hand and swore they'd build a brand new village, just the 5 of them. They all nodded in sync and shot their hands up like they meant it. Then Ramsay leaned in and promised he'd reveal their next big plans. Danny and Eric kept poking him, shouting chief and esteemed lord like it was a joke just meant to get under his skin. Ramsay snapped that they had to build a base house first, then hit the fields and start farming. He told Roger and Eric to run the house, and put Willie and Danny in charge of the fields. Eric quizzed him about the wood, and he pointed out that birch-like trees were thriving up on the mountain. Eric said if we're ever building a house, we'd better surround it with oak. Ramsay said they'd have to tear through the mountain to find it. Then he grabbed Willie's attention and asked what crop he could grow best. Willie leaned in and told him, "Back home, I used to grow beans, wheat, and garlic myself." He leaned in and asked Willie if he could slip a few seeds away, and Willie snapped back that it was fine, just don't take too many. They'd kick things off by raising a little birchwood house, and then plant rye and beans that were easy to grow. They'd hunt the mountains for a fresh spring first. Then, if nothing turned up, they'd pull water straight from the river. Ramsay shot back an apology for the rush and told them, "We can start tomorrow." The others waved it off, but Eric leaned in and said, "I'm not ready yet, I've got to get a few things in order first and ordered them to cut down a few trees. Danny stormed out and blurted, "A traveling merchant just pulled in." Everyone spilled out, and Ramsay stepped forward, introducing himself and promising he'd take charge of the northern half of the territory. The merchant's name was Slay. He stepped forward, introduced himself, and thanked him for his kindness. And then he let slip that Ramsay was still pretty young. Ramsay leaned in and told him, "You'll be 13 this year." He told them he'd heard from Danny what he needed. Then he hauled his cart over to show where all his stuff was stored, and he straight up asked what they needed. Ramsay weighed it for a second, then snapped that he needed a whole year's worth of salt. He even admitted he needed nails. Eric leaned in and said he wanted 100 of them. Then they kept trading ideas and going over more stuff. And after all that chaos, the merchant finally snapped, "Your total is about 1,200 rubelas." Ramsay's jaw dropped. This was way higher than he'd ever expected. Now he had to hustle for food and stash money for emergencies. He tells Slade to lay out every cost for him right there and then. Slade leaned in and told him straight up, 1 full year of salt would cost 500 rubelas. They charged 3 rubelas per nail. Boom, 300 rubelas gone. Then the cloth hit you for another 400 rubelas. Ramsay couldn't stop wondering if that price was honestly fair, because he'd never once bought anything like this in this world before. After all, he'd only ever grown up as a noble's kid. Danny burst in to save the day, grinning, and said it was just a little high and then he'd have to hand over the cloth. And when he asked the price, he offered 700 rubelas just for the salt and nails. Slay told everyone straight up that what happened didn't leave him with much profit at all. But the second he spotted those young kids so eager, he couldn't help but. He told himself, if I nail this first impression, they'll stick around and become regulars. He nodded and signed on, saying the deal was totally acceptable, and Ramsay thanked him on the spot, his face lighting up like he'd just won something huge. After a little while, they finally rolled up to Willie's farm, right where his mom was clocked in and working hard. She grabbed Willie's attention and demanded to know where he'd been roaming all this time. And when she spotted Ramsay, she blurted out, "Who are you?" He stepped up and said, "I'm Ramsay Rugel, Willie's friend." Rugel's mom heard his name and her jaw dropped, Turns out he was the Lord's son. He leaned in and told her to drop the formalities, then admitted he had a favor to ask her. He told her he wanted to get his hands on her agricultural products. He leaned in and demanded to know exactly how much she could prep. And she told him, if it's rye, I can handle 3 giant bags, plus 1 big bag of beans and up to 2 small bags of garlic at most. He bowed his head to her, then leaned in and asked, so what's the grand total? And she told him it was worth 600. But she'd cut him a deal if he agreed to settle for 500 rubelas. Ramsay dropped the payment up front and she shot him a grateful smile and promised, don't worry, I'll deliver the goods to Willie. Ramsay walked away convinced he'd already nailed the bare minimum preparations. At Ramsay's place, right before dawn hit and the world started to wake, Ramsay was seconds from walking out the door when his parents stepped in to send him off. And he thanked them for raising him all the way to this moment. And he swore he'd never, ever forget the kindness they gave him. His mom leaned in and demanded, so you really plan to work your territory hard, and insisted there was zero reason to split so soon. He slammed the denial shut and swore he just wanted to get everything ready as fast as humanly possible. He told himself, I don't hate my parents. But as long as those brothers were hanging around, he knew one thing for sure. He could never stay in that house. His father nodded like he got it, but the reluctance still clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. Handed him the deed to the territory, exactly like he promised. Ramsay snatched it from him, thanked him like he meant it, then told them to stay safe and slipped out. After what felt like forever, he finally burst into the spot where Danny and the others had been waiting. And Danny snapped at him that he was late. Ramsay broke the tension by apologizing, admitting he'd gotten so caught up with his parents that he lost track of everything. Willie rushed over with the food he asked for and then Ramsay thanked him and felt the tension finally ease, like he could breathe for the moment, until he knew he'd have to stock up on supplies soon. That time, thanks to his name, Rugel, he snatched everything up for cheap like the world was handing him deals. But from that moment on, it would get brutal real fast. He slapped his own face awake, then barked at his squad, all right, let's move out. When he finally touched down on the land, Ramsay jammed a stick into the dirt and declared it their base. Roger said, I'm heading out to chop some wood, watch me work. And Willie said he'd go check the soil right there. Danny tried to think up something fun, but nothing clicked. Then Ramsay leaned in and said, if you're free, I need a favor from you. He leaned in and asked if he could forge him a brand new millstone. Danny froze, then blurted, you're serious? Ramsay nodded, dead serious, and he was clearly rushing as they couldn't live without a millstone, because if it stopped turning, the wheat wouldn't become food. Danny snapped with frustration, stormed out, and agreed to make the millstone. Willie spotted him heading out and immediately grilled Ramsay. What's his deal? He told him not to fret because he'd just slipped off to scout for some stones. Willie told him, just like he'd heard, that the ground was awful and the drainage looked like it would never hold up. Ramsay nodded and said he knew for sure that he thought. He figured that mashing his thoughts into mountain soil would actually help. He cornered Willie for his opinion, and Willie nodded right back. Back then, that was all they had. He grabbed a hoe, swore he'd find the perfect patch, and then started tearing up the soil. Ramsay ditched Willie and headed straight for the mountains to make sure Rogers was okay. He tracked him down and fired off, so what's the update, how's it going? Rogers leaned in and told him everything was finally going right, and there were. The place was packed with birch trees, and up ahead the scenery shifted into stretches of beech and towering pine. Ramsay asked them to crank up the pines and birches when they planted. He couldn't stop thinking pine resin could be the fuel that powers everything. And if they could tap the birch and pull that sweet sap, they'd flip it for a fat profit. Rogers told him if we let them go wild, we can still handle planting them. Ramsay couldn't help it. He got fired up and told him that once they chopped down the trees all around there, they'd kick off planting right away to stop landslides before they could happen. He asked Rogers if birch could even grow, and Rogers nodded like, yeah, you've got this. While Willie was stuck tilling the ground and Danny was working the millstone, he jumped in and helped Rogers haul the trees down. As the day was about to wrap up, everyone gathered, and Ramsay leaned in asking if he should report how things went that day. Willie said he'd been tilling, but the soil was rough and wouldn't cooperate. So first they had to till it the right way, and only after that came mixing in the mountain soil. Rogers grinned and said the birch was stacking up perfectly, and they'd already hauled in nearly 30 logs. Danny threw in an apology, admitting he still hadn't turned up a single thing. Ramsay finished the report, nodded his thanks to everyone, and declared, all right, that's it, let's call it a day. He knew everyone had a home waiting, so there was no reason for them to stay stranded like that. Everyone stared at him like he'd just shown up in the wrong play, and Danny blurted out that they'd hustle to build a comfortable environment right away. Everyone cleared out and Ramsay got stuck there alone. He decided to gear up for camping. He knew he had to grab water and fire, so he rushed to the stream for water, but realized he had no way to carry a drop. When he pictured that crackling campfire, he realized he had no clue how to even begin. By day it was warm and he totally forgot Then night fell, and surviving it without any warmth felt flat out impossible. And yeah, he didn't even have a lighter. Panic slammed into him like a tidal wave. After a bit, he finally got a campfire going, then curled up in a blanket like the night couldn't touch him. He had to sneak a handful of embers from Danny's place, because one more cold night and he'd have frozen to death. He thought he'd mapped out every move, but the moment it hit, he realized he'd been completely caught off guard. But he still had so much life left to squeeze into that place. Eventually, his eyes fluttered shut, and sleep finally pulled him under. When morning finally hit, he jolted awake to his friends pounding on his door and shouting him up. They hated seeing him like that, so Ramsey finally asked, "When did you pass out?" Eric snapped to himself that he had to build a house fast, or he'd die. Rogers believed that if he didn't eat the right way, his body would run out of strength fast. Will he finally decide to grow crops at full speed, so everyone can stop going hungry? They all drifted off already thinking, we've got to set up a livable setup, like right now. Ramsey barked that he had to get moving too. He stormed over to the river stream, cupped the water in his hands and drank. He'd just been thinking about food but realized he had to forge the utensils first. He knew he'd never turn out real masterpieces, but he'd picked up the basics back in elementary school, so he figured he could at least knock out some simple earthenware. He grabbed some clay, poured in water, and mixed it until it turned perfectly smooth. Then he molded it into a pot with his own hands. He felt like he had to leave it alone for roughly 2 whole weeks to dry. But he knew one thing: slowness wasn't an option. So he went for it, rolled the dice, and braced for a few brutal failures. He finally let them lie out in the sun for a bit, and then he spread them out by the campfire to dry up. When the moment hit, he hurled it straight into the flames. After everything he went through, he ended up with the ugliest pot imaginable. He swallowed his disappointment because he knew it hadn't dried or baked long enough, and now he had to stay locked on the fire's temperature the whole time. He tried it out, and when it worked, relief hit him. At least now he could fill it with water. He hoisted the pot over the crackling campfire, and he tossed in salt, piled in beans, and finished it with thinly sliced garlic. He whipped up a wild garlic bean salt soup that hit like a flavor punch. He couldn't even decide if this so-called cooking deserved the name. Right when he was about to take a bite, he suddenly realized he had 0 cutlery. He stopped overthinking and just decided to go for it. Down the hatch, he chugged it straight from the pot. He devoured the meal and just couldn't believe it. Who would have guessed plain boiled beans could taste that amazing? Once he was done, he jumped right back into crafting pots. He churned out a few lopsided, ugly pots and cups. He said that plain practicality mattered more than artistry. Even if it was a little rough, if it worked, then yeah, it was good enough. Time dragged on, and then boom, it was evening. Ramsey realized pottery wasn't a quick hobby. It was a whole-day grind, and he figured he'd better start experimenting with something new. Right then, Willie shot him a call and said, "Everyone's here, every last one of them." Ramsey leaned in and told him, "I'm coming on my way." When he finally showed up, he snapped, "Where's Danny?" Because Danny never came in that day. Rogers leaned in and told him Danny was absolutely buzzing, like the best stone was within reach. Ramsey burst into tears at that, convinced he was pouring his heart into building the stone mill. Eric pulled him over and showed the tiny bed he'd made just for him. Ramsey practically beamed at what he saw and shot Eric a huge thank you. Rogers shrugged it off like it was only a roof and a floor, but Willie shot back that it was still more than nothing. At night, once everyone vanished, Ramsey scrubbed the whole place clean and climbed into bed, still fired up because his makeshift stove wasn't nearly solid enough. He wanted to build it for real, brick by brick. Next day, he took one look at the clay and decided he'd turn it into bricks. He collapsed onto his bed, almost laughing with relief. Just having a roof over his head and a floor under him felt like pure salvation. He slipped into sleep, already convinced tonight was going to be the best one yet. The next morning, Danny showed up with a whole crew. "Ramsey, I brought exactly what you asked for, don't worry, I'll show it to you later." He called everyone in, pumped them up, and declared, "All right, let's go, today starts now." Eric leaned in and demanded to know why he was the one calling the shots. Ramsey ordered them to split into carpentry and farming crews, then thanked everyone like the day was finally over. Eric and Rogers slammed through the carpentry, while Willie and Danny dug in on the farming. Ramsey had no time for doubts. He had to get their shelter up right now. They pushed to get rye planted by mid-April, and he vowed to stretch those fields as far as humanly possible in the next 2 weeks. And he just knew that if they teamed up, they could absolutely pull it off. After a bit, Danny finally showed up and told everyone, "Come on, give my handmade stone mill a try." Roger said he was putting his vote behind it, full force, to make sure it succeeds. But Eric said he was voting for it to break on purpose, and Willie nodded right along. Then Danny barked at everyone, "No bets unless you've got permission." Ramsey admitted it looked at least decent, and Danny snapped back, telling him not to just call it nice. And then toss in some rye and crank up the grinding. They tried it, and right away something felt off. They stared at the results like, wait, is it even working? After he cracked it open, they realized the machine wasn't grinding smoothly, and the whole operation was running way less efficiently than it should. Ramsay then lined in and told Danny the stone mill was carved with grooves, and showed him the exact way it should be, sketching it right there in the sand. Danny said it's a real pain, and it's going to take a little longer to get it done. All the other guys stared at each other, dying to know who pulled the win. Then Roger smirked and said it ground him out, so yeah, he took it. Ramsay watched the whole group chat and debate with a bright smile, convinced they were finally making slow, steady progress. So yeah, that's how he saw it, and that's where the story was headed. The lab's real development was finally about to kick off. Time raged on end. And boom, 2 weeks had already slammed by since Ramsay moved into the territory. He watched the project surge forward, and suddenly it felt like a real village was taking shape right in front of him. He said the surge in allies was the biggest game changer. 3 new guys just showed up beside Ramsay on his quest. Henry, for starters. A 15-year-old who was super friendly, always smiling, and couldn't stop drawing her way through every day. Gordon was 19, bursting with justice and carrying a heart that never stopped caring. And Charlie, just 12 years old, still younger than Ramsay, moved like he might crumble at any second, with nerves running hot and a body that couldn't quite keep up. All 3 were farmers' kids, and that meant the fields were exploding outward, growing day by day. Ramsay watched it turn into a full-on boys' only village, and still something felt off, but they'd upgraded the mill to grind silky fine flour, so bread and dumplings became their main food back then. Danny packed up his life and moved into the village, starting fresh right there. Ramsay stewed all night because that snoring wouldn't stop. But seeing his territory grow into something real lit him up with pure joy. Ramsay blared to everyone that today was the long-awaited seed-planting day at last. He kept talking, saying Eric was almost done with the house, so they'd split the work between all 7 of them and slam it out. Willie shouted at everyone to pack those seeds tight and make sure they were covered all the way. It was a 70-30 mix. 70% rye, 30% beans, and a whole punch of garlic. He asked Willie if they could slam this out in 1 day, and then he told Ramsay that finishing it within 5 days would be more than good enough. After a bit, Henry finally broke the silence and admitted he wanted a girlfriend. He grabbed Danny and told him, "Get me introduced to that girl." Danny pressed him, asking about the girl he'd been introduced to, and he admitted she was set to marry his brother. He told her that once he had a house and fields, then he'd finally be able to marry her. Danny cracked a joke and said he finally had fields, but still no house. Henry burst out laughing, and Ramsay clocked the real issue fast. There weren't any women around, and it was starting to bite. Without them, their territory couldn't grow an inch. Danny leaned in and asked Willie if he wanted a girlfriend too, and Willie hit him with the bombshell. He already had a fiancée. Everyone froze when they heard it. Danny and Henry grilled him, demanding if he meant it and who she was. Willie leaned in and told them, "I'm Kathy from Peter's place." Danny snapped with frustration because he'd been watching her all along. Henry leaned in and asked if she was cute, and she told him, "Yeah, I'm the kind of girl you can't help but want to protect." The teasing kept going for a while longer, and it got louder and more ridiculous by the second. Eric came back, opened his mouth to speak, then froze. Wait, where'd everyone go? Ramsay told them they were headed back to Rugel village to chase their dream, while Eric just stared, completely baffled. A few days later, everything changed fast. Ramsay shouted that the planting was finished, then swept everyone out to explore the mountains together that very day. He told everyone they'd climb the mountain in bursts, racing for the peak to hunt wild strawberries and fresh mountain vegetables. And they tore off to hunt down fresh spring water, drawn straight from the melted snow. Danny turned it into a showdown. Whoever hit the top first was the winner. Ramsay lunged to stop him, but Eric barreled in beside Danny and laughed. "I'm talking about the so-called sewer rat of Rugel village, speeds his whole thing, so I'm not Lawson." Gordon called out from behind, deadpan, asking if that was meant to be a compliment. Danny shot back to Eric, saying everybody knows him as Danny the Skirt Lifter, and he wasn't about to lose a single step in speed. Gordon jumped in again, teasing, "So, is that a compliment?" Danny shot back at Gordon, barking for him to shut up, like Danny was the only guy in the whole building with a girlfriend. Eric slid up and said they'd been talking about all the fun stuff without him. Gordon bolted to escape and get there first, but Danny lunged to stop him, and then all 3 sprinted up the mountain, and Roger stared in shock. Everyone was moving so fast he couldn't keep up. After a while, Ramsay leaned in and demanded, "Did you all find the spring water?" Danny and Eric shot their eyes away, mortified, like they couldn't believe what they'd just seen. William Gordon leaned in and told him they'd tracked down multiple places where berries were growing, but there wasn't a drop of spring water anywhere. Ramsay realized the hard truth. finding it wouldn't be easy at all. Right then, Charlie came charging straight to him, telling him he caught the sound of water. He dragged everyone to the very place where he'd built it from the ground up. They were almost at the mountain's base, and Henry couldn't help wondering, was the water really this close? After listening in the quiet for a while, they finally caught the unmistakable sound of water. Danny just couldn't believe they missed it, until Gordon snapped, "You didn't notice because you two are blasting all that noise nonstop." After chasing that sound, they finally stumbled on the spring water. Ramsay couldn't stop thinking about how they'd pull it off and feed it to the bass. If bamboo was anywhere, they could have carved it into a waterway, but he scanned the area and found nothing like it. He practically yelled, asking every single person if they had rope, or anything that could serve as rope, and every single one of them flat out denied it. Then Ramsay slammed the decision down. Brute force was their only option, and it was happening. And carve a clear route from the spring straight to the base. First, he figured it out. One person had to drop down to the exact spot where they could spot the base. Henry decided to strike next, chasing after the next person who went down. Then he stopped right where he could see the first one. Gordon made the call to do it, and then they ran it back again and again, until the cycle kept rolling. And at last, Ramsay drew one final line that tied everyone together. Then they'd lock onto that line and follow it, no hesitation at all, and stomp straight through the paths. He told everyone to clear out those pesky weeds, so there was nothing in the way and they could move without getting stuck. They could dash from the base to the spring and back in just 5 minutes. Ramsay declared it a win because the water source was finally secured. After a few days, Danny trudged through Rugel village, drowning in disappointment. Eric bumped into him and Danny immediately grilled him, asking, "So how's it going?" Both of them sank in disappointment after yet another day of bombing at flirting, and Danny blurted, "I want a girlfriend too." Eric said hunting for a girl in that tiny village had its limits fast, and he pushed them to hit up a different village, because he could already feel the strange stares coming. Danny told him it was time to end it right there, and after they kept walking for a bit, a noise suddenly snapped their attention. It was Ramsay's older brother, Paul, who grabbed a worker and demanded to know what his idiot brother was up to, and why he still hadn't ended it all. Danny clocked it instantly and realized Paul was Ramsay's brother. Paul's workers leaned in and told him Ramsay's village was finally taking off. There were under 10 people backing him, and every single one of them was a third or fourth son, stuck in the curse of never inheriting a thing. Paul's frustration spiked the moment he heard it. Ramsay had moved into his territory without a single word, like he owned the place, and he swore straight to his face that he'd end him. Eric pulled Danny aside and told him that Ramsay had officially snagged the land from his own father. And that's exactly what was gnawing at Paul's mind. The worker grabbed Paul's attention and demanded, "So what are we supposed to do about this?" And Paul shot back that he should just torch the whole village down to the ground. Eric and Danny stared in disbelief when they heard the news. They bolted toward Ramsay to spill the news, and Ramsay gladly welcomed them in. He told them he was mapping the area with Henry, and Henry's drawing skills were an absolute lifesaver. Danny shot him down, saying now was absolutely not the time for that. Ramsay leaned in, demanding to know if anything had happened then, and they both rushed to tell him everything they had heard. Ramsay suddenly, that Paul was plotting to set the whole village on fire, and snapped that his idiot brother only knew how to cause trouble. Eric lined in and demanded, "If they really come at us, what are we supposed to do?" Ramsay leaned in and said he'd think it over. Eric snapped that they couldn't just sit around and do nothing. Ramsay pushed out a reassuring grin, waved it off like it was nothing, and dove right back into mapping. Danny still couldn't shake that heavy, uneasy feeling. After a bit, Willie showed up to Ramsay and blurted that he wanted to start growing grapes. He leaned in and asked if they could grow them right there, and Willie told him, "I still don't see why grapes are tough as nails even when the soil's awful." Gordon leaned in and told them, "I used to grow these at home so I can help out." Henry said he was craving a glass of wine, and Ramsay shot back that they could stash wine away for ages. He promised they'd build that vineyard, and the whole group instantly snapped into action, mapping out every detail. Danny and Eric showed up with worry written all over their faces. Ramsay saw it happen and told everyone, "You've got the rest, take care of it." Gordon and Charlie stepped up and swore they'd take care of it. Ramsay ditched them and slid straight to Danny and Eric, telling them he was tied up making plans. Danny said, "Yeah, I get it," then pressed anyway, "So what about Paul?" Ramsay leaned in and told him, "I swear it'll all somehow work out." Danny went totally silent from the shock. But before he could even get a word out, Ramsay stormed off and promised they'd talk again. A few days later, everything changed. Eric and Danny were back in the village, but no matter what they tried, they still couldn't get a single girl. Eric said they still hadn't cracked the problem with Paul, and he couldn't shake the feeling Ramsay was cooking up something big. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that the territory was about to go up in flames, so he said they'd just have to wipe it all clean and start back at square one. Eric's patience snapped. He snatched his shirt, warning him not to mess with him, since it was him who had kicked up the whole mess and got everyone riled to the max. So he couldn't even think about leaving on his own. Danny finally demanded, "So what's going on here and what do you want me to do?" Eric's irritation skyrocketed when Danny slammed a punch straight into his face. I slapped his face and barked at him to wake up. Danny grinned, wiped his face, then drove a kick into Eric's stomach and said, "That's rich coming from you." The crowd caught sight of the fight and immediately surged in, boxing them in from all sides. Danny demanded Eric let him go, and Eric shot back, "Apologize first." The crowd was roaring their names, begging them to step into the fight. Just then Paul and his workers came strolling nearby, and when they spotted the crowd gathered in one place, they couldn't look away, and demanded to know what in the world that noise was all about. Eric shattered the fight, then he stormed off, leaving Danny crumpled on the ground. Paul locked eyes with Danny and instantly knew it was him. He ordered his worker to take him along with them. Danny's co-workers grabbed him, hoisted him up, and rushed him straight to their base. Danny groaned awake, still raw from his fight with Eric, and now he couldn't stop wondering where he'd ended up. He blinked and realized he was locked inside a storage shed, while Rugel's mansion loomed outside, right there beyond the walls. He suddenly realized he was standing in Paul's playground. Right then Paul showed up, slid beside Danny and leaned in like, "So what are you doing here?" Danny shut his mouth and said nothing, and Paul told him, "Answer me right now." He told everyone he didn't belong in the village anymore, and he knew it was because he'd been running around with Ramsay. Danny denied it. Paul looked shocked and he burst out laughing, saying he just couldn't stand that dull village life. He leaned in and told him he was heading back to his village, then introduced himself, Danny from Rugel. Paul burst into laughter, and Danny kept pressing, asking who in their right mind wanted to take on that painfully boring land development. Paul turned to Danny and begged him to join them. His workers jumped in, shouting that Paul's place was the best, and they got to crack open the good booze and soak up attention from a whole crowd of beautiful women. Danny's face lit up when he heard it, and he blurted out that it was going to be awesome. Paul grinned and thought, "I've found a crack in Ramsay's camp, and now we strike while they're still exposed." He thrust his hand toward Danny and declared, "It's a deal." Danny grabbed his hand and nodded, sealing the deal, then buzzed with excitement about teaming up with him. A few days later, Danny was living it up with booze and women, and he couldn't stop smiling like, "This is the life." He swore that hitting the bottle with cute girls in broad daylight was the absolute best. Paul stared him down and declared it was time to smash Ramsay and his whole crew. The workers leaned in and demanded, "So is it finally time?" And if they were ready to fall in line behind Paul. Danny told Paul it was way too early, and he said, if they were really going to pull it off, they'd better wait it out until autumn. Paul looked at him in total confusion, demanding to know what he meant, and whether he was planning to show them mercy, but Danny immediately shut it down, saying they were working like mad right then, planting wheat and beans in the fields. So yeah, it was way smarter to hold tight and wait for the harvest, then grab it all in one huge haul. Paul nodded and said, "All right, we'll wait until autumn." And until that moment, he'd gear up to destroy them. Then his workers couldn't stop buzzing with excitement at the news. Back in Ramsay's turf, Roger strode up to him and fired off the question, "What's going on?" Roger leaned in and told him, "No, it's nothing like that." But he hadn't seen Danny around lately, and it gnawed at him. What in the world happened to the guy? Ramsay tried to dodge the blame, claiming he was too busy charming girls, and he wouldn't let it stress him out too much. Roger cackled at the sight as Eric shot them worried looks, then rushed up to Ramsay, ready to blurt out something important, right before it all happened. But Ramsay slammed the brakes on him and told him, "You're good, your next move is already forming." He told them they'd be heading straight to Baron Hendrik to meet him. He leaned in and told them he was heading a bit north. Everyone's jaw dropped. Then Charlie shot straight up and asked if the north belonged to Baron Hendrik, and Ramsay answered him with a confirm. He said he'd sell every scrap of wood the village didn't need, and the biggest town nearby was Hendos, the Baron's capital. He already stacked the logs on the cart and was raring to roll, and Eric leaned in like, "So this is the next move you said you'd make." Ramsay confirmed it right there. He asked if he was heading into town, could he grab some nails too? Ramsay said sure, and that he'd also pick up rye and salt. It took him about half a day to reach Hendos, so he figured he'd be back by the very next day. Kathy, engaged to Willie, was there too, and Ramsay leaned in and told her, "I'm counting on you to take over everyone's meals for a bit." She finally got it, and with that he launched forward. After a few grueling hours, he finally realized yanking that card solo was way harder than he ever imagined, and his spirit was slipping like he couldn't hold on anymore. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spotted the town of Hendos in the distance. He'd trekked twice as long as he'd planned, and the moment he realized going alone was a total mistake, he knew he should have swallowed his pride and asked for help. As he came charging toward the town, they cornered him and demanded to know what he wanted, then clocked it right away. He was from the lumberyard. Ramsay leaned in, told them it was his first visit, and fired off a question. Where's the shop that buys lumber? The soldier grinned and told him to slip through the gate and take a left. He nodded, thanked him, and as the soldier swung the gate open for him, they warned him, don't let it shock you. When Ramsay laid eyes on the town, he froze. This place was way too alive to believe, and he couldn't help but stare. And he said it wasn't shocking at all. This was the Baron's capital. He hunted down the lumber store until he finally spotted it. The shop owner spotted him the moment he arrived, greeted him warmly, and realized he'd come to sell wood. He ran his hands over the wood, checking every inch for clues, and he took one look and said the quality and the amount looked perfect, then told him he could sell him a whole 1,000 rubara. Ramsay thought it over, then demanded more, groaning that hauling everything all the way there was a pain, even though it was in perfect condition. The owner pondered it, then asked, how about 1,200 rubara, and made it clear that was his absolute limit. Ramsay nodded at the price, and the owner handed him a bag stuffed with rubara. Ramsay nodded thanks, then walked off, already locked in on what came next. He burst into a seamstress's shop right on time, and he swore he wanted a suit made just for him. The woman looked him dead in the eyes and demanded, so what are your requests? And he leaned in and told her he needed a decent outfit to meet the Lord, without blowing all his money. The seamstress got it and told him she'd whip it together from the cheapest linen for 200 rubara. Ramsay nodded, agreed. She measured him for the suit, and when he asked how fast it would be done, she told him to expect it in about 3 days, and sprinted straight for Baron Hendrik's residence. He walked right up to the guard outside the building and claimed he was Baron Hans Ruggles' messenger, and his lord demanded a meeting with Baron Hendrik. The guard caught it, snapped, wait a second, then ushered him inside. After a while, they finally came back. Stumbling over his words, he apologized for the weight he was carrying, and telling him their lord was swamped, but he'd carve out a little time, 10 days from now, and that's the word. He asked, is this okay with you? Ramsay nodded and said, my lord will be thrilled by this. He bolted out of there with joy blazing in his chest, confident he'd finally nailed the perfect outfit for his meeting with the Baron, and that this time he'd locked in the appointment. Now all that was left was to grab the supplies he needed. After grabbing nails, rye, and salt, he tossed everything into his cart and bolted for the exit. He looked up and realized the sky had already swallowed the day, and he couldn't afford to burn a single coin or even sleep a night there. He clenched his teeth, swallowed the fear, and charged back in under the cover of night. Ramsay burst back into his village, and Gordon leaned in and asked if he was okay since he'd been gone forever. And Ramsay snapped back that he'd managed, and he'd already put in the prep work. He told me that in just 10 days, he'd finally get face-to-face with Baron Hendrik. Gordon shot back right after getting home, apologized for the interruption, and told him that yesterday, after he stormed through Rugel village, he spotted Danny right there with his brother Paul. He tried to dodge the whole thought, then demanded, could Danny really have betrayed them? Ramsay grinned and declared, I've got to tell everyone. He marched up to everyone and dropped the news straight into their ears. And then the story snapped to June 25th, the day Ramsay was finally meant to face the Baron. Rogers stayed by his side, and when he saw just how huge Hendo's was, he couldn't believe it. So he turned to Ramsay and thanked him for bringing him here. Ramsay told him he wanted to sell firewood too, and that offer turned his help into a total lifesaver. He promised they'd tear through the city after their business was done, so first, they had to hawk that lumber. As soon as he finally got to the shop, the owner's eyes lit up. He recognized Ramsay instantly, like they'd crossed paths before. He looked back and realized he'd hauled in even more than before that day. Ramsay leaned in and told him, this time you brought them in pairs. The owner promised he'd slam the price down fast and told them to hold up for a second, and Rogers leaned in to Ramsay, saying, I'm telling you will walk away with a great price. Once he eyed the lumber and weighed it up, the owner leaned in and told them straight. This was the best he could offer, 500 rubaro. Rogers practically gasped, saying that was way too low. Then the owner rushed to apologize, explaining they had an abundance of burr, and he'd offer them $2,700, and if that didn't hit the mark, he'd tell them to go hunting elsewhere. Ramsay signed off on the deal and sold the wood like it was already sealed. Rogers was absolutely crushed by this whole situation, believing he could score 3,000 rubara. Ramsay threw his hands up and said there was nothing he could do, and so they ditched the cart right there and pushed forward without looking back. Both of them burst into the seamstress shop. She greeted Ramsay at the door and told him his suit was ready to be worn. Ramsay slid into the suit and the seamstress leaned in, asking what he thought. He grinned and said it fit perfectly. Rogers even chimed in, calling out that he looked absolutely amazing. Ramsay shot him a grateful nod and said that with this outfit, he'd be totally fine walking into a meeting with the Baron. He leaned in and demanded, so are we going? After what felt like forever, they finally reached the Baron's place. He told the guards, I'm Hans Rugel, and said he'd come to speak for his father. He marched straight in and demanded a private audience with Baron Hendrik. A soldier strode up to Ramsay, called him Lord, and demanded he hold on for just a moment. Rogers suddenly remembered Ramsay wasn't just dangerous, he was a noble too. After a while, they finally stepped into the palace, and a maid greeted them with a warm smile, thanking them for sticking it out and waiting, and promised she'd lead them the whole way. They trailed the maid through the halls, and Rogers couldn't stop staring. This palace was straight-up breathtaking. The maid swung the door open, ushered them inside, and told them to step in. Once they stepped into the room and took their seats, the maid pulled the door shut behind her and ordered them to stay put for a moment. Rogers was still staring in disbelief, and this time he couldn't stop himself from telling Ramsay that this mansion was pure mind-blowing glory. Ramsay nodded, saying this place wasn't just any tavern, it was the Baron's residence, the real power that ruled the area. And that's exactly why he showed up in the first place. If he could win Baron Hendricks over. But just as he started to finish his sentence, Baron Hendricks strode into the room like he owned the air itself. He rushed to Ramsay and apologized for making him wait. Ramsay dropped into a bow and told him straight to his face that it didn't bother him at all. He snapped his head up and caught Baron Hendricks standing right in front of him. He couldn't shake the question, would he actually earn the Baron's support? Ramsay then marched right up, told the Baron it was truly an honor to meet him, and introduced himself as Ramsay Rugel, son of Hans Rugel. The Baron swept in, greeted Ramsay by name, and boldly called himself Darrell von Hendrik, the ruler of that very territory. He motioned him to sit down and leaned in, asking what was burning on his mind. Ramsay sat down hard and tried to replay the negotiations from his past life, because he knew exactly how he had to act around a superior and not mess it up. And he had to steer the negotiation like his life depended on it. The maid swept into the room with a tray and poured them wine, and the Baron leaned in, asking if he was enjoying it, then waving him on like he could indulge as much as he wanted. Ramsay shot him a thankful look, then flat out refused his offer because it looked like the guy was already slammed. So he kicked straight into the main topic. He thrust an official paper into the Baron's butler's hands. The butler leaned in and promised, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." He yanked the door open and handed it straight to the Baron. The Baron stared at it for a long moment, then finally, he figured out Ramsay was Lord Rugel's third son, and that the Northern Territory was his to claim. The Baron claimed he'd arrived expecting something bigger, then snapped, "Is this all Ramsay wanted me as his retainer, since he can't even handle the wasteland?" Ramsay shut it down, flat out denied it. Admittedly, it sounded tempting, but he still shut the door on it and picked another path. He shot Rogers a look, and Rogers shoved the bag of money into his hands, the same cash they'd gotten after selling the lumber. He yanked it open, flashed the cash they'd brought, and told the Baron, "As that letter promised, the land is mine now, so I claimed it and made it my territory." And he didn't just stop there, he even swapped his surname to Bartlett. He marched up to the Baron and demanded to be taken under his protection. They locked eyes, then the Barons leaned in and said, "That's interesting." He told Ramsay, "I'll spot you as Sir Ramsay Bartlett," but warned that stepping into his protection wouldn't be free, and asked if Ramsay was okay with that. Ramsay nodded and agreed, and then the Baron leaned in and demanded to know how big his village really was. Ramsay told him this isn't really a village, more like a tiny settlement with only around 10 people. The Baron promised him 30,000 rubella every year for the Hendrik family, and said starting next year was totally fine. Ramsay froze in pure shock as these words hit him, then he stumbled mid-sentence, like his breath got ripped away. He figured he had to scrape together 2,500 rubella every single month to save the day. Back then, all they had was wheat and timber, but the forests were running out, so planting couldn't happen fast enough. And to make it worse, they were short on hands. He couldn't help wondering whether the Baron would cut the taxes just a little. Before he could even open his mouth, the Baron snapped the truth into the air. One single coin would never be cut. Ramsay let out a heavy sigh, realizing this was the kind of moment where desperate times demanded desperate moves. He marched up to the Baron and swore he'd accept every single one of those terms. The Baron leaned in and said, clear as thunder, that he'd made the smartest move. His butler shoved a paper into his hands, and he snapped into action, scratching out the official order, even asking, "Is that all you want?" Ramsay shut him down fast, insisting he wanted one last thing. He leaned in and told the Baron to deliver the message to Lord Rugel. They wouldn't interfere. The Baron stared in shock as Ramsay explained everything. His father had officially handed him the land, but the eldest and second sons of House Rugel were furious, and they're supposedly lining up to set fires the second the perfect moment hits. The Baron caught on fast and told them straight up it was the last thing they needed, tax revenue sliding down, and told him right then and there he'd write that letter immediately. Ramsay told them he'd need a copy too, just in case anyone dared to invade his turf. He made it crystal clear, if they took down the invader, nobody would come after them for it. The Baron got it instantly and leaned in to warn Ramsay. He said he'd make sure they'd be told to not invade. Breaking that order meant payback, Severe punishment was coming, no questions asked. He signed the letter, shoved it into Ramsay's hands, and promised he'd tell Lord Rugel himself. Ramsay looked him in the eye, thanked him with all his heart, and then waved him off, leaving him standing there. He and Rogers burst out of the palace and charged into the unknown. From his upstairs window, the Baron stared at them like a hunter on the hunt, and then he turned to his butler Anthony and demanded, "So, what do you think?" He said it was downright laughable that something so tiny could actually sway them. The Baron snapped at him, telling him to go easy, because they weren't evil, they were just desperate to survive. He said a true noble had to have the grit to swallow hardships like that. He praised Anthony's loyalty to their house, then warned that sometimes it crossed the line. Anthony apologized, saying the surge in tax revenue was more than welcome. It was downright exciting. The Baron nodded and promised, "Sign a few letters and you'll pocket 30,000 rubella. Pretty sweet deal, right?" He said he didn't expect much at all, and then he wished, right there. Right after he stormed out of the palace, Rogers blurted out that he was starving. Ramsay leaned in and told him, "Thanks for keeping me company, I'll make it worth your while." Rogers practically beamed, then spun around in search of food and blurted that he wanted the skewer soup and bread. Ramsay snatched them up and, as soon as Rogers dug in, he snapped a warning, "Don't you dare choke." As they were eating, Ramsay caught sight of a frail kid staring at them with all the hunger in the world. Rogers leaned in and demanded, "What's wrong with you?" And when he finally saw what Ramsay was seeing, sadness hit him hard, so he grabbed his shoulder and begged, "Is there anything we can do?" Ramsay swore he genuinely wanted to help, but his hands were tied, he just couldn't. Ramsay strode up to the kid, demanded, "Is my stomach getting smaller?" The kid nodded, and Rogers slid over his soup like it was a lifeline. The kid stared at him, totally baffled, like he couldn't understand a single thing. And Rogers leaned in and told him it was insanely tasty, so he better dive in now while it's still warm. The kid dug into the soup, and Ramsay shot himself a grim thought, Rogers, the total glutton, really went this far. Still, even if they stuffed their hunger right here, it wouldn't fix the real problem underneath. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know if this town was packed with kids just like him. The kid nodded, quick and decisive, like they'd just made up their mind. Ramsay couldn't shake the thought. He leaned in and asked Rogers if he wanted to jump in and help them. He stepped in and promised he'd lend a hand to save those kids, and Rogers nodded back like, "Anything, whatever it takes, I'm in." Then Ramsay made a decision that flipped everything. Then he pointed him toward the lumber yard and told Rogers to gather up everyone who was stuck in the same kind of trouble. And he'd rush out to grab groceries every time. Rogers hunted through every corner of town, dragging along the kid to find people with no home, no job, and nothing at all to eat. Ramsay rushed into the shop and snapped up some supplies. After a while, Ramsay finally rolled up to the lumber yard, and there it was, a packed crowd. He ran straight to Rogers, slapped him on the shoulder, and said, "Good job," because he'd pulled in a serious turnout. Rogers' words basically screamed one thing: there were way too many people who needed help. Ramsay knew that in the shadows of that rich city of Hendo, starvation was everywhere, and hungry people were suffering with nobody there to even lift a hand. He figured that if Bartlett territory rolled out citizenship for them, they could band together and save everyone. He screamed for everyone to stop and listen, like it was life or death. He slapped out his name, Ramsay Bartlett, and declared himself Lord of Bartlett Barony, right there south of the Hendrick territory. The whole crowd froze when he said it, claiming his territory was starving for manpower and promising them food in plenty if they just cooperated. The crowd erupted into loud whispers and heated debates, all talking over one another at once. A woman shot her hand up and demanded, "Okay, tell me exactly what we're supposed to do." Ramsay told them, "If you bust your ass the right way, you'll end up in Bartlett, married, building a family, and living every last day to the fullest. That would turbocharge the territory's growth." The woman leaned in and demanded, "Is that seriously all?" Ramsay leaned in and told them that one day, the price of surviving would be taxes. But right then, he desperately needed them to help him build the village from the ground up. An old man stepped up, then demanded straight to their faces that they didn't need someone like him. Ramsay stared him down and demanded his name. Then the old man replied, "Archbold." He bared his leg and admitted it was wrecked, warning him he might not be able to help with the development. Ramsay couldn't stop thinking about what the hell happened to his leg. He leaned in and grilled Archbold, asking if he had any real martial skill. Archbold froze, saying he knew exactly what he meant, and then he leaned in like, "Back when I was young, you were a full-on mercenary." Ramsay spotted the scar on his knee and declared with total certainty that it could only belong to a truly valiant warrior. He told him every last fighter was gone from his territory, then demanded he train the whole crew there. Archbold said he felt honored, and if that old body of his could still help, he'd be more than happy to jump in. Ramsay threw him a grateful nod and then shouted to everyone. Even if they weren't built for hard manual labor, every single person still had a place. Each one carried their own role and job. He told them, if you want in, come find me or come to Rogers. A woman snapped her hand up and declared, I'll go. Bit by bit, everyone finally nodded in agreement, and then Ramsay jumped in and started hammering out a list of them. After a moment, his eyes caught them, 73 people standing there in front of him. He told Rogers, we're meeting early tomorrow morning, no messing around, and promised they'd ride out immediately so they'd be there before nightfall. Rogers hit him with the warning. There were kids and elders around, so they had to hold back and not push anyone too hard. Ramsay leaned in and told him he'd turn back first. Rogers froze when he heard that. Then he insisted he had to talk to everyone in the village first, because if he came back with a full crowd out of nowhere, it would spark total chaos. Rogers nodded, swallowed his sadness, and stepped back to wait. Ramsay leaned in and told him, I'm counting on you, don't let me down. And Roger leaned in and promised he'd give it everything he had. Ramsay realized the time to expand the village had finally arrived, but he couldn't stop thinking about how on earth he'd explain all this to everyone. It was June 26th. Like the calendar just flipped into something dangerous. Ramsay tore back into the village, and Willie lit up to greet him. Then Ramsay demanded that Willie round up everyone for him. During this visit, he stood up and told everyone, Baron Hendrik just recognized me as a Viscount. So the Bartlett territory slipped under the Baron's protection. Henry and Eric practically buzzed with excitement when they heard the news. He said he'd even heard Paul and his crew were plotting an attack too. Henry leaned in and asked if they were talking about that incident from the other day. Eric sighed and said it was nothing but a hassle. Ramsay assured them it was already handled, because a letter from the Baron to Lord Rugel was en route, ordering everyone to stay out and not meddle. And if they crossed that line, severe punishment would slam down on them. So yeah, there was nothing to worry about. Eric practically buzzed with excitement hearing this. And Gordon realized Eric had been freaking out about this way more than anyone else. He leaned in and dropped the bad news on them. In return for the Baron's protection, they'd cough up a whopping 30,000 rubara every single year, each one of them. When they heard it, the whole room went silent. Then panic and shock hit them all at once. Ramsay shoved in and tried to cool them off, saying that in Rugel's territory it was double at 60,000 rubara. But it was still less than last year, and this year they'd been exempt, so everyone had to pull together. He leaned in and said, wait, there's one more thing. And even though it wasn't all bad, you could feel it changing the mood. Eric leaned in, asking why he was stalling, and Willie snapped, just spit it out already. Ramsay warned them an army of people was rushing into this domain. Everyone stood there stunned. Then he broke down exactly what went down, and Willie snapped that Roger and Ramsay got bewitched by those beggars. Henry and Gordon eyed it with clear doubt, like something fishy was going on. Ramsay said he'd pay everyone fairly right after, then pushed for a quick answer like, is that not good enough for you? Henry leaned in and told him, that right there is a good deed. While Willie beamed at the thought of a booming village, Eric couldn't wait, because girls were coming. Ramsay broke down and swore that everyone was backing this move with full support. Gordon slapped a hand on his shoulder and said, if that's how it's going to be, we've got to get ready to welcome them. Now let's split up the roles. Cassie told everyone she'd cook the meals, and Ramsay promised her he'd help, and he told her this. Since everyone's going to be starving, they'd better whip up rye porridge so their stomachs don't get rocked. Willie swore he'd take control of the fields and make sure they were taken care of. And Henry promised he'd grab way more spring water than he normally does. Charlie scratched his head, then Gordon lit the way. Since more people were coming, they'd better whip up the daily essentials like dishes and spoons. Eric said he'd stay with carpentry like always, but this time he'd make sure the bedding was ready and waiting. Ramsay pressed him, asking if they'd built a few houses so everyone finally had somewhere to live. Eric snapped, we're not done yet, stick with me, and once we've got more hands we'll crank this up and blow past the clock. Willie pressed Ramsay on when Roger and the others would finally show up, and Ramsay told him they'd leave early, so they'd be there by evening or maybe straight into the night. Charlie and Gordon couldn't shape their utensils right, so Kathy jumped in and took charge to help. Henry scrambled to find them, but the path stayed empty. No one was coming, not a single soul in sight. Ramsay started worrying they'd gotten lost in the dark, and whether he should go find them. Then Gordon and Eric immediately stepped up to help. Eric and the others tore into the search, and he demanded, tell me, are you guys really coming? Then right out of nowhere, they heard a sound and watched Roger roll up with a crew right behind him. Roger shot his hand up and waved at them, grinning like he owned the moment, and then he moved on. Ramsay blurted that he was already late, and that confession had worry crawling all over him. Roger told Eric the cart was brutally heavy and begged him to swap places with him. But Eric was too busy flirting. He checked in on her, asked if she was okay, and swept her into his territory like he owned the night. Gordon tore into Eric as Ramsay demanded whether they felt sick or hurt, and Roger insisted they were totally fine. He thanked everyone for the brutal grind they pushed through on that long journey, and told them the village was right up ahead, begging them to hang on just a bit longer. The whole scene snaps to July 1st, like the story just flipped a page. At the Rugel family's house, where Hans had called his oldest son Paul, he showed up with his sibling, demanded to know why they'd called him, and then Hans thrust the letter into his grip, telling him to read it. Paul spotted the letter's seal and knew it belonged to the powerful Hendrik family. He stared at the letter in pure shock, because it declared that the Hendrik family had recognized Ramsay Bartlett as a viscount and ordered everyone to leave this land and its people untouched. Paul snapped with rage, grabbed at the Hans' attention, demanded to know what they were doing, and told them to hit the streets and protest it. Hans snapped at him, calling his move foolish, then pressed, "So what exactly are you trying to protest?" Paul snapped that Ramsay was sweeping in and taking the territory without a single permission. And Hans told him, "Yeah, I officially ceded it, because all I did was hand back unused land." Paul snapped with frustration, then stormed off, his sibling hot on his heels, tearing after him. Hans aside at this, but he couldn't help smiling because Ramsay was finally doing great. He realized that when Ramsay demanded the land transfer papers back then, it was never random. It was setting the stage for this exact moment. Even when it was his own child, it still blew him away. His foresight was unreal, so he rushed off to tell Helena, his wife, what he'd seen. Paul was posted up at his place, cracking open drinks and taking sips like he owned the night, and rage surged in him for being this close to storming in on Ramsay, and he was itching to smash through anything in his way. His younger brother raced in and tried to cool him down, but he snapped, telling him to shut up, then demanded everyone figure out what to do about those guys. His brother and the workers ditched him and left him standing there all alone. The story snapped to Danny, and he declared that the moment was finally here. He strode up to Ozma, the hunter's third son, and snarled that he was about to bring him down. Ozma told them to snatch the weapons and armor from there, and he'd already spotted a cart sitting right nearby. Danny told Ozma he was stoked to have him riding along, but Ozma shot that idea down. He said his brother was watching his back, so tracking prey in a brand new land sounded like the perfect change. Danny leaned in and told him, "I'm counting on you, don't let me down." Ozma told Danny to hit the village first, and Danny nodded fast, swearing he'd catch up in a blink. Ozma stormed off to the village, and Danny headed straight for the girl he'd met at the pub. Her name was Colette, and just saying it feels like trouble about to start. And he told her right to her face that he was riding back to Ramsay, and he leaned in, asking her, "So you coming with me?" She demanded he hold up, then paused, eyes narrowing as she gathered her thoughts, and slammed the door in his face, shutting him out like he didn't even matter. Danny refused to sink into sadness, because he still had to bounce to other houses too. He tracked down Roger's girlfriend. "I rushed over to Eliza's place to drag my friends in with an invite, and they locked eyes, then sprinted off for Bartlett Village." Danny's heart sank because he couldn't get his girlfriend to show up, and the very next morning he slapped Ramsay hard just to drag him out of sleep. Ramsay jolted awake in a panic and found Ozma and Danny already standing there. He couldn't believe it, coming back felt so right, and it left him grinning from ear to ear. Danny fired off an apology for making him wait, then grinned and admitted he'd brought a little something as well. He pointed out his ally Ozma, and Ozma snapped, "Let the hunting be mine, go on." Danny stared at the village and realized the place was packed, like everything had gone down while he was gone. Gordon rushed in, slammed Danny into a hug, and admitted he was still reeling from the news that Danny had betrayed them. Danny threw out a quick apology and told everyone, "To fool the enemy, I had to mislead our own team." But it turned out the time he bought still gave them the edge. Eric came and leaned in and demanded to know what was hiding in the cart he'd just brought. Danny told them he'd collected every weapon Paul had set up and promised that would shut their mouths, at least for a while. Ramsay praised Danny, calling him rock solid, and Danny just grinned like the compliment hit right in the heart. Ramsay ordered him to take command of the soldiers there while he was at it, and he nodded along, only to realize a second later that he just walked into a fatal mistake. Ramsay dialed Archibald, pulled him in on the call, and introduced Danny like he mattered, claiming he was the one they'd chosen to become their soldier captain. He told him he'd make them train like monsters, then snapped at Danny to listen up and give Lord Archibald his full respect. Back at Paul's place, his worker jolted him awake, telling him that Danny and Ozma were nowhere, gone without a trace. Rage exploded in Paul's chest the moment this happened. How dare they treat him like this? He swore he'd wipe them out. On July 3rd, exactly 4 months had passed since the Bartlett territory was founded. People kept pouring in, and the village buzzed non-stop like it was alive. They even set up a registry for everyone who'd fled from Hendos. They started logging every name, age, and gender, so they could measure the harvest output and tally who brought what labor to the table. They came in as a full crew, 14 kids and 59 adults, plus 2 elderly people in the mix, and the numbers leaned toward women, roughly a 3-to-4 ratio. Most of them were battle-tested farmers, with only a handful of seamstresses and blacksmiths mixed in, and their day jobs mostly boiled down to hauling goods and getting them from point A to point B. They split the fields like pros. Willie got stuck with the rye, Gordon took charge of grapes, Henry handled the beans, and Charlie was left to manage garlic and turnips. With Roger, Eric, and Osmo in the mix. Teaming them up with apprentices, they pulled in helpers to tackle the work. Danny led 5 soldier trainees for now, while everyone else dug in farming and clearing the land. Ramsay looked around and saw the whole squad locked in together, grinding every day to lift the village up. He couldn't stop thinking about how they were going to grow, because he'd been dying to add some local specialties too. Ramsay was grinning from ear to ear, because this was exactly the life he'd always dreamed of. A few days later, on July 14, Kathy marched up to Ramsay with a whole group of women at her side, telling him she had to pull him aside for a quick word. Ramsay got an uneasy feeling, and Kathy led him through the warehouse, saying the food was almost gone and they only had one last bag of rye left. Ramsay could feel it in his bones. This was going south fast, and Kathy snapped that they wouldn't make it past 10 days at this pace. Ramsay leaned in and told Tina to call everyone in right now. Eliza told them she'd been slashing it down for a while, but now she hit the absolute limit. Ramsay couldn't stop thinking, could they rip the village crops early and steal a head start? Once everyone finally showed up, Ramsay jumped in and said, "I've got a question I need to ask all of you." He pressed them for what crops were in the fields right now, and demanded to know exactly when they'd be ready to harvest. Willie told him they'd be ready by mid-August, and the yield was looking downright promising. Henry promised the beans would be ready by early August, but Gordon snapped that the grapes still needed more time, so everyone had to hang in there. Charlie insisted the turnips were almost ready to be harvested. Ramsay and the other women stared straight at Charlie, and Charlie shot back, "What's going on?" Ramsay led him through the warehouse and snapped that they were running out of food, so grabbing those turnips fast would be a total lifesaver. Charlie told us he wanted to plant at the start of April so they could pull off 3 harvests in a year, but this time he came in late, so they only got 1 harvest, and the next one won't hit until early November. Cassie leaned in and demanded to know what kind of yield they were chasing. Charlie told her that with everyone about to chow down, a month's worth was probably the sweet spot. The women started chatting between themselves, convinced the turnips would carry them through the month, so the beans would be ripe by then. They figured they'd get rye too, so they could finally breathe. Yet they knew turnips alone wouldn't last even half a month, so they sprinted to gather wild greens and begged Ozma to help. The guys realized the girls were rock-solid dependable. Ramsay clocked their food crisis in an instant, and he knew he had to whip up a plan before everything collapsed. He headed to Ozma and asked if he had a minute. Ozma called him Lord, and Ramsay snapped up the moment and stopped him cold, telling him to call him Ramsay like always. Then he gave Ramsay the green light and told him to ask for anything he wanted. Ramsay admitted he wasn't just making noise. He actually wanted to get into what was going on with the food. After laying it all out, Ozma finally snapped into understanding. If they wanted to feed the whole village, they'd have to go hunt down some serious heavyweight boars. Ramsay asked them if they could go for something just like that, and Ozma warned him because those boars were huge, they left a thick trail behind them. He told him that starting tomorrow, he was going straight for the big game, and Ramsay leaned in and said he was counting on him. When Ramsay finally left Ozma's place, a hard truth hit him. He couldn't bank on Ozma alone, and he'd need a backup plan fast if one even existed. Ramsay mulled it over for what felt like forever. Then at dawn, he headed to the spring water. The Test River ran right along the royal territory's boundary, and with every step he could feel it. His plan just might work. He made plans to go stone fishing. He slammed a stone onto a rock in the water, blasting nearby fish into a daze, then scooped up the stunned catch before they could swim away. He tried to keep the ecosystem safe, but when things got desperate, he had no choice but to push the limits. He heaved a giant stone into his hands and marched along the river like it owned him. Then he slammed the stone with it, and the nearby fish shot upward like they'd been yanked by an invisible hand. He dug in and decided to give everything he had for every soul in the village. After a bit, he hauled in tons of fish and packed them all into his cart. He had to get it home before the freshness faded, because he was sure everyone would be thrilled. When he finally tore back into town, he noticed everyone huddled together, whispering and trading theories about something big. Right then, Kathy called Ramsay and demanded to know where he'd vanished. He tried to explain the story and the fish he'd seen, but she shot him down, saying it wasn't the right moment for that. As Ozma came back with a massive boar for them, Ramsay tried again to explain that he'd caught a few fish himself. Kathy brushed him off, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how she'd cook that boar. Ramsay couldn't hide his heartbreak. He'd thrown everything he had at it, and still this is what he got. And Danny soothed him, insisting it was only awful timing. Now it was August 2nd, and a gorgeous harvest had finally burst into bloom. Ramsay leaned in and asked Willie if it was finally time to harvest, And will he snap back and claim they just need a little more time to ripen first? He handed the decision to Willie and told him to come get him when it was time to harvest. Ramsay then stormed over to Henry. He asked how things were over there, and the guy lit up and told him the harvest was looking absolutely amazing. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know if he'd really expand the fields. Henry leaned in and told him the tasks were handled, then promised to come back later with the map so he could examine it. Ramsay then stepped in and offered to help with the farming, but Henry shut him down. He told him there was zero need to panic, so he should just chill. Ramsay walked off, leaving Henry alone with his own thoughts, so bored it practically hurt. He'd finally wrapped up the paperwork and locked in the village expansion plans. Roger and Eric had apprentices of their own, so he just sat there, twiddling his thumbs like he had nothing to do. Just then, Danny showed up and caught him lounging around like nothing mattered. Ramsay saw exactly what Danny was about to pull, and he scrambled to stop it, telling him he had some things to handle first. But Danny snatched him up, hauled him to Archibald, and told him, starting today, Ramsay was going to step into the training, like, right on cue. Archibald practically basked in that saying, because as a lord, he'd have to fight with everything he had to shield his people. He strapped in, then sprinted off. But that armor was a brutal weight, and every step felt like pure suffering. Then he had no choice but to drill his sword swings, cranking power into every move with that wooden blade. He demanded to know when it would end, and Archibald swore he'd keep pushing him until he finally mastered the right form. Then Archibald snapped, "Get into real combat training now," and made him jump straight into it. He said, "Take that slash, that stab, and everything else. Hammer those techniques into your body until they're part of you." Ramsay locked in sparring with Danny, trading hits like it was a fight that could break the whole night, telling him that he'd be nursing that grudge for good. Danny told him straight to his face that the grudge was still burning in him. Archibald lit up seeing everyone in such high spirits, until someone shrugged and said, "Yeah, that's not peace, that's just a brawl." It was October 15th, and everything was about to change. And Paul tore back to the tavern once more. His workers couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd been at the tavern way too often, and they were starting to notice. Paul thudded his empty mug on the counter and demanded the bartender pour him more booze. The bartender threw his hands up and apologized. He was out of ale. Paul said, "If there's no ale, then don't just stand there. Bring me wine, mead, or whatever you've got." Ramsay still had him fuming, and he couldn't stop thinking of a way to force the man to eat his own words. Just like that, one of his workers, Ivan, came rushing up to him, telling him that if he didn't like Ramsay, then he should just end it. Paul hucked his empty mug at him, yelling that he was stupid, and bragging that his old man would stop him from trying anything like that again. Ivan warned him, telling him Paul could get banned for it, but they weren't nobles, so nothing was off limits to them. Paul's eyes widened at the thought and burst out laughing and kept going, saying it was brilliant, because he couldn't believe he hadn't thought of something this simple sooner. He bragged it was easy, switch out Paul Rugel, dress up as thieves, and hit their base like a full-on raid. He clocked that they were totally unarmed, then barked for everyone to move fast and get ready. His worker pressed, "So when do we do this?" And he answered, "After the snow melts." His worker burst in, all fired up, demanding he do it right now, because his muscles were already itching to explode into action. Paul pushed back again, insisting he didn't have a single weapon. He told them it would take at least 3 months to get everything ready, and warned that the snow was starting to stack up fast. But then it would be a nightmare to set it ablaze. He told Ramsay in his head to hold tight and wait. As he charged in, determined to wipe his hideout off the map for good, Ramsay and Danny were finally laughing off the sweat from training, feeling wiped out in the best way, because now it was November 3rd, and the winter was creeping closer across the territory, right on the edge of arriving. Ramsay paced around, feeling the cold breeze bite his skin, and he knew snow would blanket the ground by mid-December, so they had to brace for winter right now. He told Danny and Eric he was heading straight to Hendo's to grab supplies, and he shot them a question, asking if they'd help this time, because he had a whole mountain of lumber coming in. Danny nodded and promised, "I've got you, I'll back you up as your guard." And Eric said, "That sounds awesome," then decided he was coming too. He could tell they weren't trying to talk their way out. They just wanted to tear into the town, but he finally got it. Everyone needs a breather sometimes. So he cut it loose and left it to just the two of them. All three of them booked it to Hendo's and showed up right on schedule. The guard clocked Ramsay instantly, then closed the distance fast. He marched up to the lumberyard and told the owner he wanted to sell his lumber. The owner glanced at the load this time, wood stacked high like mountains, and as usual it was top-tier, perfectly crafted quality. He told them he could cough up 9,000 rubra for these. Ramsay thought Birch was drowning in oversupply, so he figured negotiating the price was going to be a real headache. Danny leaned in and demanded the owner round it to a clean 10,000 rubara. The owner shrugged like it was fate and just hammered the deal at that price. Ramsay's jaw dropped at this, and he marched straight up to the owner to confront him. He told them the other day that he'd got an excess of birch, so what the heck happened next? The owner fought for words, and Ramsay leaned in, demanded he spill the beans, and swore he'd keep coming back for round after round. The owner snapped that Lord Hendrik of the frontier had hoarded every last log, so they were left scraping by on a shortage, and he'd hauled in almost 3 times the usual amount that year. That's why he decided to grab every last piece of lumber he could get his hands on. Ramsay blinked in shock at what he just saw, and Danny finally turns to the owner and blurts out, "Thank you." As they headed out, Danny blurted, "So the Lord's household really burns through that much firewood?" Ramsay shot back, "Yeah, it's a huge mansion," like it was nothing. And Danny said, "I should have hiked the prices straight up." Ramsay said that if he hadn't known it, this truth would have stayed buried and never seen the light. He caught Eric staring at something and snapped, "What do you see?" Eric snapped that it wasn't like that at all, and Ramsay clocked it instantly. He was staring at charcoal. Danny took one look at the charcoal and nearly choked. This stuff cost a fortune. And Ramsay claimed winter was on the way, so suddenly everyone's demand was exploding. Eric leaned in and asked if they could forge charcoal in the Bartlett territory, and then he pushed for an answer. Ramsay nodded and agreed. He couldn't forget that old TV show from his past, where an idol group built a charcoal kiln from scratch, step by step. Ramsay lined in and said they could. Eric lit up and insisted they should make their own charcoal. Danny leaned in and asked, "So what's the point? Any real advantage to making charcoal?" Then shrugged and said firewood was plenty. Eric leaned in and told him charcoal was going for top dollar. Danny told them just buy charcoal cheap instead, making it as too much work for no payoff. Ramsay and the others went back and forth for a moment, then he stepped in hard and tried to separate them, because he insisted both sides had real points. He told them to hold the line for now, then Eric demanded to know why. He said, "First things first, if you can even make charcoal. If the charcoal is half-baked, it can blow up, turning it into a safety nightmare. And here's the twist. Firewood and charcoal burned for the same amount of time. The only real difference was whether they choked the air with smoke. To stop the poison before it hits, they needed smoke you could actually see." Eric finally got it, and Danny threw him a sweet compliment that hit him right in the chest. Sounded like he knew way more than anyone expected. Ramsay said that if they had a little extra, they should try making some, because learning it firsthand would be worth it. Eric's face lit up as soon as he heard that. He shouted that they needed to finish their shopping fast, and everyone nodded and agreed. After he snatched up a mountain of items, Danny demanded to know if they were truly crazy enough to stock up that much. Ramsay leaned in and told him straight up they'd better figure it out, because the food was vanishing in the blink of an eye. Eric's frustration flared when he saw them drag rye in, and then, bam, he watched them claim rye needed wheat. Danny said growing rye in the village was way easier, then leaned in and asked, "Can't we just buy wheat?" Ramsay told them rye was cheaper than wheat, because at that point, they needed it in huge quantity to taste everything. And hey, rye packs way more nutrition. Eric and Danny were thrown off by that, and Ramsay just stared ahead thinking, in a world with no hospitals, if you get sick, you either fight your way back to health or you don't make it. He needed them to hold on. He told them to grab supplies and ride back to the village, and every single one of them nodded in agreement. When they finally loaded everything, the weight hit them all at once. Turns out they'd stocked way too much. Eric looked around and snapped, "So when are we getting back?" Ramsay snapped that they should shut it down and keep driving forward. Then Eric told Danny to step aside and give him the lead for a bit. Ramsay stared at the cart and felt its sheer weight bearing down in his mind. On November 10th, Danny and Ramsay dug into the earth with full force, ripping up the ground like they meant to uncover something huge. Danny said he'd just told them they weren't making charcoal, then asked why they were trying to build a charcoal kiln that very day. Ramsay admitted he hadn't planned it yet, but his reasoning still stood rock solid. He blurted out that it finally hit him, he'd figured it out. And that's when it hit him, those logs were brutally heavy. He pressed on, saying that if they carbonized it and stripped out the moisture, it would turn way lighter and be way easier to carry and use. Danny agreed, and Ramsay told him straight up that he'd need his help. Danny didn't hesitate and said he'd be there. After they dug a giant hole, they built the flue and lined the walls with clay. Ramsay leaned in and told Danny, "Don't miss a spot, line the bottom with straws." They shoved every scrap of wood they could find into the fire pit, logs and branches all tightly packed to turn into charcoal. To cut down on oxygen exposure, they piled on rye husks in similar layers. They slammed bricks over the entrance, then set the wood inside a blaze, burning it down until it was sealed shut for good. And the charcoal kiln finally finished burning out. Danny leaned in and asked, "So this really turns into charcoal, right?" Cole and Ramsay told him straight up he wasn't super confident, but maybe he could pull it off, and he nodded like, "We'll tighten everything up as we go." Right then, 2 kids popped out from the mountain, bags full of leaves and twigs, and they immediately spotted Ramsay and Danny. Ramsay chased the question to the ends of the distance. asking what they were doing out there. She told them she'd come to collect leaves and branches for the campfire, because the cold wouldn't let up. Ramsay warned her not to stray past the village, because the mountains could bite, and the girl nodded right away. Danny promised he'd help too, and the boy snapped at him to get back to work. Danny told me he'd just wrapped up yet another mission. Ramsay started mentally ticking off everything else they'd need to get ready. He stormed up to Henry and fired off a question about how to craft through the winter. Ramsay told them that once the snow buried the ground, farming was out of the question. So he decided wooden crafts was their ticket to survive. Henry asked if he meant spoons and forks, and Ramsay immediately nodded like, yeah, exactly. He said he'd begged Charlie to whip up a prototype. They burst into a house. Charlie and Eliza were hunched over the wood, building something with their own hands. Charlie told him he'd tried building a chair, and Ramsay lit up and said it looked amazing. He told him they might not be big sellers, but they'll work just fine in the village. Then he laid eyes on Eliza's work, and it hit him like a spark. And it was some totally weird thing when he asked her what she was making. She blinked in shock when he couldn't name it, and she insisted, "No doubt those are bear tracks and it's carrying a fish in its mouth." Ramsay's eyes widened at that news, and he blurted out that he really hoped they'd sold like crazy. Eliza was so sure of them she called them a masterpiece, like there was no question they'd sell. Ramsay grabbed Charlie and told him straight up they were running out of wood. He wanted to keep Eliza out of it, and Charlie immediately agreed. Eliza asked what was wrong, but Ramsay waved it off and insisted it was nothing. He said that the truly skilled hands should be shaping figurines and decorations, while everyone else could be making spoons and bowls. Eliza said it looked safe enough to her. Ramsay shoved the assignment onto Henry and Charlie, then grinned and said he was taking a quick tour around the village. Right then, Eric shot a call to Ramsay, telling him the construction crew had all gathered. Ramsay told them to waste no time, start the renovations on every house right now. They hurried from house to house, loading everything up to survive the winter, and they had to handle the heating with absolute care, so nobody freezes to death or chokes on carbon monoxide in cramped small homes. They crammed simple flues into every house's fireplace, so the smoke finally had a way out. They decided to turn that spot into a fireplace, and he snapped at the other workers to make sure the chimney rose tall enough to vent straight outside. He kept insisting the houses were built the same way, so they'd just copy that design for the rest too. Eric and the crew were itching to jump back into work, and then Ramsay dropped them off and vanished. He let out a breath of relief because for the first time, it finally looked like they'd pull it together in time for winter. So the very first winter finally slammed into the Bartlett territory. After just a few days, Danny was out in the snowball fight with the other kids, but the moment they started losing it, they snapped at him to stop acting so young. Danny snapped that it was way too sweet for his taste. In a no-jokes showdown, age didn't stand a chance. Right then, a snowball slammed into his face, straight from Eric. He snapped that Eric was a jerk, and Eric shot back that he was nothing but a slowpoke. They clashed for a moment, then the kids hatched a plan, jump them together and take both of them down. From his cabin, Ramsay stared at it, and his disbelief hit him so hard he couldn't even speak. I swear they were still doing it even in that freezing cold. The Bartlett territory had fully surrendered to winter, and snow was stacked up to his waist. They handed out supplies, but worry clawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the residents trapped inside, so he pushed to go check on them. But somehow he could tell he was running dangerously low on money. With Baron Hendrik demanding taxes, they had to hustle for steady income, no other choice. He started plotting how to rake in the cash, and then he clocked 2 ways they could go about it. They decided to crank up productivity and ship a mountain of goods. He knew brute force wouldn't cut it, so they had to turbocharge their farming and forestry, streamline everything, and make it actually work. He couldn't stop thinking about tractors and chainsaws, and realized that with the tech they had right now, he could only dream up problems they were totally unready for. He already knew that plan wouldn't pan out, so he ditched it and sprang to the next option on his list, making the products themselves shine even brighter. He scrambled to figure out what he could sell for a decent price, but he knew grapes weren't ready for harvest yet, and they couldn't get enough animal pelts to make it worth selling. They had rye, beans, turnips, and even timber to work with, and he knew rye was the easiest thing to turn into food. He wrestled with the idea of a rye-based product. Then, right when it hit, a voice suddenly cut through the air. Then Danny and Eric just froze in place, muttering that those kids had way too much energy, like it was gonna blow up into a problem. Eric nodded, and together they slid outside by the fireplace and settled in. People swore the place was packed with draft after draft, and, in that freezing air, he could have really used something to torch the cold from the inside out. Ramsay heard that and sparks flew. He knew rye could make quick, simple alcohol. He suddenly remembered his past life in the northern lands, back when a young exchange student named Artyom showed up, coming from even farther north than he could ever imagine. He leaned in and told them they could turn bread into booze. The alcohol he taught them to make was so simple that it felt almost criminally easy, like it was missing a step. Slipping right out of his mind, held on by the thinnest thread of memory, Ramsay gathered everyone together and ordered them to start brewing alcohol. William Gordon stormed in to lend a hand. Gordon told everyone, just like he promised, that he'd cooked up rye bread, then Ramsay thanked him. They were about to brew kvass, a lightly alcoholic drink Russia and beyond basically can't get enough of. But there was one brutal catch. It still wouldn't hit 3% alcohol. He baked the rye bread until it turned that perfect golden brown. Then they'd stir the yeast into warm water, letting fermentation kick off early. Then they poured in warm water, tossed in the toasted bread, wild berries, and fermented yeast, and sealed the whole jar tight. Tossing in berries would squeeze those natural sugars into alcohol and crank the flavor up to a whole new level. Now all they had to do was sit tight and let the fermentation finish up. Willie asked how long they should let it sit, and Ramsay shrugged, admitting he had no clue either. And they had to taste it every half day just to make sure it was right. Danny signed up to taste, but Eric snapped in claiming Danny had no palate, then shoved Ramsay out and demanded the task be handed to him. Ramsay said he'd leave it to the two of them, then warned them, "Don't you dare touch it without permission." They chugged it in one go between it all, and after a few days the pot was bone dry and they both dropped into silence, guilt written all over their faces. While everyone else was losing it with rage, Ramsay had already seen this coming. Henry lined in and demanded to know what time was truly the best. Danny swore it was the morning of the third day, but Eric shot back that it was the second night. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know if it had truly all turned into alcohol. And Danny backed that up. He said he felt warm, so he figured the drink had turned into alcohol. Willie swore the brew was already going great, but Gordon snapped that they had to nail down exactly how much rye to throw in. Ramsay leaned in and promised he'd crack open the ledger and tally every last number. He marched up to Eric and Danny and said, "You down the whole thing without permission. Then congratulations, your punishment is picking berries off that mountain." Eric demanded whether they really had to do it in that freezing cold, and Ramsay snapped back that it was a punishment. They trudged up the mountain through thick, pounding snow to hunt for berries. It's January 6th, right here, right now. A full week had passed since New Year, and that icy cold was still cruelly biting through everything. Ramsay took a sharp sip, grimaced, and said next time he had to boost the yeast. Right then Danny burst in, shouting at Ramsay at the top of his lungs. Ramsay snapped at him to calm down, then he pushed in. Danny snapped at him, saying this wasn't the moment for that. And Paul still insisted he wanted to finish him for good. Ramsay's patience snapped, and frustration hit him like a punch. He told me his brother had a hardcore obsession, and if he'd just aimed that passion somewhere else, everything could have turned out different. He pressed Danny for where he'd heard it. Danny leaned in and told him he'd been heading back to Rujal village to see his girlfriend, and that's exactly where he heard the news. Ramsay told them to stop stalling and talk about what was coming next, and basically dared him to call Ozma and old Archibald to his face. Danny nodded and hauled everyone straight to Ramsay's house. Ramsay hurried up, braved the snow, and apologized to Archibald for bothering him. Archibald leaned in and demanded to know what kind of trouble they'd stumbled into this time. Danny laid out what was going on, then added the horrifying truth. Paul was stockpiling weapons and armor all over again. Ozma leaned in and demanded to know if the story was even believable. Danny leaned in and told him he'd heard it straight from Colette in Rujal village, and if he was uneasy, they dispatched someone to scout it firsthand. Ozma goes, "Wait, didn't Earl tell you not to mess with Ramsay?" And then he turns to Paul like, "So why didn't you get the message?" Archibald swore that even after the warning, he was still determined to get the Lord's head. Ramsay snapped that as long as nobody ever found out he was the killer, he was untouchable. He kept talking, straight up saying the real issue was that everything was stacked way too perfectly in his favor. Danny asked what was going on, and Paul snapped that his win condition was simple. If he could take Danny down, he'd win, get caught or killed, and it was over. On their end, all they had to do was hold Paul back, without taking a single unnecessary hit. Ozma warned that torching their own homes would be a brutal nightmare, and Ramsay leaned in and said the attack's timing was his call, so the whole future was sitting in Paul's hands. Archibald said the smartest move was to bait Paul out and then hit him hard. Ozma said Ramsay would probably be the bait, then warned that the village could still get hit while they're waiting. Danny asked if he should run this to Ramsay's father and have him step in and rein him back in. Ramsay claimed Paul and the others would act clueless, because everything they were doing had to stay hidden in secrecy. He said either way, once the snow finally melted, they needed to move right then. He told them to dig up every scrap of info and have a game plan ready by then. On January, Ivan and Paul burst into the house. One of his workers spotted the armor and swords and blurted that this stuff was absolutely top tier. He leaned in and grilled Paul, demanding to know how he'd got his hands on it. And Paul told him straight from the merchant's sleigh that tension was boiling in the capital. So they slapped that truth on thick to smooth things over with his father. Ivan leaned in and asked, "Can I try on the armor?" And then he just couldn't wait. Paul told him, "Yeah, you can. Once the snow melts, we're going in hard. So start getting used to that iron sword right now." One of the workers shouted, asking what they were supposed to do about that rat that had slipped in. Paul snapped at him to drop it and walk away. He knew Ramsay's allies had slipped into Rugel village, but if they claimed they'd come to visit their parents, no one could just shove them out. So yeah, turning all that energy into their own power was the smarter move. His whole mission was to crush Ramsay, so every other villager was nothing but background noise, as long as they didn't stand in his way. Paul told him to leave the weapons and armor behind, then warned his worker not to lose a single piece, or take a thing, because if trouble struck again, they'd pay for it. He'd make sure they paid for every last bit of it. The workers shook with pure terror at what they just saw. Ivan burst outside. Paul had barked an order, "Deliver the gate to Tom and John," so he hauled that brutal, heavy bag through heavy snow and rain, even as Paul demanded non-stop results. He sprinted to Tom's house, pounded on the door, and shouted, "You in there?" The lights blazed on and he knew exactly where he was, so he started pounding the door even harder. Tom yanked the door open and blurted, "Sorry, I was just grabbing a drink," then leaned in and asked if he wanted to join him. Ivan told them, "I'll jump in for a little while," and then he stepped in like he couldn't resist. Tom swung the door open and welcomed him in with a grin. Then Ivan spotted another guy inside and he snapped, "Who's that?" Tom grinned and said, "That's my buddy." Henry strode up, introduced himself, and said he'd brought drinks, then told Ivan it was great to finally meet him. He told them the drink was called kavos. Honestly, it wasn't great, but it was plenty strong to knock you out and get you drunk. He spotted Ivan clutching a bag and blurted out, "What are you carrying in there?" Ivan's stomach flipped with nerves as he thought, "I can't tell this to any outsiders." He leaned in and told Henry that tensions were spiking in the capital, and they might soon start conscripting people. Then he leaned in and demanded, "Wait, tell me that's true." Ivan admitted he didn't know much either, and Paul had filled him in on all of it. He shoved the bag into Tom's hands. He said it was for him, then chugged a glass of kvass like it was nothing, only to grin because it tasted way better than he expected. Henry nodded and Ivan snapped that since Paul kicked off all that chaos, he hadn't gotten a single drink. Henry leaned in and asked, "So how much would you charge for that drink?" Ivan promised 3 rubra for the mug, because 5 rubra was way too much to stomach. Ivan and Tom burst into laughter and got carried away, laughing their way into the next part, until it was like they couldn't even finish the sentence. Henry watched their fun unfold, and in his mind he thought, "Yes, our plan is working." The moment snapped us straight into Hendrik's palace, where he leaned over and demanded from his butler the king's health. His butler warned him, straight-faced, that things looked grim, and said it was only a matter of time before he finally slipped away. He said the battle over succession was heating up fast. Hendrik swore the feud for the throne between the prince and the king's younger brother was pure adrenaline. Magic V, the current king, was fading fast, so old he could barely stay upright, teetering right on the edge of death. The race for the throne was exploding, Prince Emil locking horns with Duke Ignaz, and that younger brother was closing in fast. Hendrik already knew the rightful heir was Prince Emil, but the butler snapped, claiming the prince was a die-hard supporter of the empire. They stared at the map of the Pendra Empire and realized he'd already snatched a princess from the western Pendra realm, plus they'd even had kids. Hendrik snapped, "If this keeps going, our kingdom could get swallowed whole by the empire's ambitions." The butler leaned in and asked, "Should we keep backing Duke Agnes?" And Hendrix declared the empire wouldn't recognize a single faith except the Holy Divine Church, and that shockingly became a massive, dangerous problem. He couldn't stop thinking about what move they'd make next. The butler leaned in and demanded, "So what's the game plan?" Because it was obvious he'd already cooked something up. Hendrik burst into laughter when he realized the butler was already in on everything. He said he'd use the chaos as cover to grab more land and expand his territory. He blared that he was going to storm Baron Borden. The butler leaned in and told him straight. Baron Borden was pro-empire too, because he'd married into an imperial noble family, and word was he'd piled up a real fortune through trade. He demanded to know why he'd be forced to invade in the first place. And Hendrik swore he'd build it all from nothing, fresh from scratch. It's the 18th of February right now. Ramsay trudged around, watching the snow finally give way, but the ground still felt treacherous. Then he had to rush to the shops in Hendo, and it wasn't going to wait. He burned through more rye than he'd ever planned just to finish the Kavo's research. Danny rolled in with a loaded cart, shouting that every single wooden item worth selling was finally packed and ready to go. Ramsay leaned in and asked if they should bounce, and Danny nodded without hesitation. After he kept walking for a while, they took a breather and Danny leaned in like, So where do we sell these wooden goods? Because this time they couldn't get lumber from their usual supplier, so everything went sideways. He grilled him for any leads and Ramsay shot it down, saying he'd been thinking about it. He swore the smart move was simple. Find someone who knew every corner of the whole town. They rushed straight to Hendrik's residence, and Ramsay leaned into the guard and told him there that Ramsay Bartlett, yeah, that was him, and he was ready to meet Mr. Anthony. The guard stormed inside to get him, and Danny's temper flared. This was Count Hendrik's mansion, and they couldn't just barge in like that. Ramsay nodded and said he couldn't see the Count, so he demanded the steward be brought to him. Hendrik's butler Anthony burst out of nowhere, all smiles, and greeted Ramsay. Ramsay swallowed his pride, apologized, and said he had to ask for something. He grilled him, asking straight up whether you needed a permit to sell alcohol in this town. Anthony told him if you're stocking supplies, especially for the public, then you're going to need one. He leaned in and asked if he was thinking of making business in that place. Ramsay shot it down, claiming he was only juggling the money for his excellency. He said he was hoping Anthony could point him to places that sold lumber, wooden goods, and even alcohol. Anthony couldn't help thinking, Ramsay's got some serious nerve for a little monk. Ramsay could read what was going through Anthony's head, but as the court's representative, he knew Anthony couldn't just wave him off like that. They didn't want rumors flying around, so the Count shut down anyone trying to claim he didn't care about his vassals. Anthony let out a heavy sigh, then told Colin straight up that his trade, wood for alcohol, soaps for the tavern, and timber for Daga's shop, was the absolute best. Ramsay shot him a thank you, and Danny's patience started to drain fast. He was getting seriously bored. Then Ramsay leaned in and asked Anthony if he'd heard any juicy rumors coming out of the capital. Anthony leaned in and demanded to know what he meant by that. And he just told himself, come on Ramsay, get out of there already. Ramsay leaned in and asked if he'd heard nothing yet, then promised he'd fill him in. He said there were strange, unsettling moves stirring around the capital, all tied to the succession, and pressed him for his honest take on the whole situation. He said that Steward Anthony had to know this for sure. Anthony froze, realizing that once he'd pretended to be clueless, there was no way he could afford to talk recklessly. If he didn't answer when Lord Darrell Hendrik called his name, he'd snap back, weren't you the one who promised no action? But he still couldn't just pass the Count's intentions along by himself. He just realized he'd massively underestimated Ramsay. Like seriously, he'd been treating him like some backwater bumpkin. And he just had to wonder, how far ahead was he really thinking? He snapped at Ramsay to hurry and get those goods sold like now. And Lord Darrell would talk to him face to face, then order him to come back there right away. Ramsay shot him a grin and waved him off, promising he'd be back in a flash. Once they tore out of the mansion, Danny shot, that was nerve-wracking. And then he asked Ramsay was he truly convinced he'd end up meeting the Baron. Ramsay leaned in and ordered him to track every move his guardian made. Right then, they tore up to the Collins Trading Company. As soon as they stepped inside, the place was packed wall-to-wall with people. Danny said this place was buzzing non-stop. Ramsay leaned in and told me this spot was one of the top trading companies in town. Then I spotted a group of people huddled together, talking like something big was going down. And he told them Anthony had sent him there. Ashley, some Collins Trading Company. They were totally caught off guard when Anthony introduced them, and they immediately fired back, asking if they had come to deal with them. Ramsay nodded and said he was dreaming of selling off his wooden goods. Ashley eyed the goods, then grinned and said, honestly, they're not bad at all. He said the final total came to 1,200 rubella. Ramsay couldn't stop thinking about it, and asked straight up if they were selling rye too. Ashley confirmed it with a grin. So it really was the legendary Collins Trading Company after all. Ramsay lit up and said it was amazing, then leaned in and asked if they'd swap it for 3 barrels of rye. Danny leaned in and asked, are you sure you don't want cash instead? Ramsay leaned in and told him rye was the real prize, and that it was smarter to swap straight for what he wanted than burn money on fees. Ashley pondered it for a second, then Ramsay shot back that he was rushing, because he had an appointment with Baron Darrell right after this. Ashley couldn't believe it. She snapped at him to stop messing around. Ramsay snapped at him that he wasn't lying, then laid down the stakes. If Ashley's story was true, Ramsay would pay 4 barrels of rye, but if it was a lie, only 2, and then he turned to Ashley and demanded what she thought. And Ashley thought, for a merchant, honestly, either way, that's still a pretty sweet deal. He slammed his hand down and said, I'm in, let's do this. Ramsay barked at him to move and Ashley ordered his workers to stay sharp and watch the cargo like hawks. They stormed up to Darrell's estate, like the night itself had come to demand answers. And Ashley straight up told Ramsay, if you want to bail, do it right now, don't wait. Ramsay strode up to the gate. The guard recognized him and gestured him inside. Ashley froze in shock and Danny grinned as if he'd just won. When they finally pushed through the door and Ramsay told him he could go ahead, but warned that his crew had to stay put in the room. Ramsay stormed into a dark room and found Darrell Hendrick sitting there waiting. He told me he was thrilled to finally see Ramsay. Ramsay rushed up to him, grinning through a quick apology for his outfit. Darrell told him, "Don't stress, make yourself at home," and somehow that calmed everything down. Ramsay slid into his seat across from him, and Darrell snapped that he was getting straight to the point. He proved Ramsay right, saying something was seriously off. Troublesome moves were stirring across the capital and tells him he'll use this chance to seize control and expand his territory. Ramsay's eyes went wide when he heard it. He planned to use the ball to ask Darrell for help, but then he blurted out his plan to everyone instead. He felt trouble rising, like a storm getting ready to break. Ramsay sank into silence. Then Darrell leaned in and praised him, saying this kind of quiet was pure gold. He kept insisting his real target was the Borden barony out west. And that day he didn't show up by accident, he had a plan. He cornered Ramsay and begged him to help craft a pretext so he could invade. Ramsay's jaw dropped in pure shock. He forced himself to breathe, then lined in and demanded to hear what he stood to gain. Darrell lined in and demanded to know what he wanted. Ramsay went straight for it and demanded land and a fat pile of money. Darrell admitted that the land might trip them up right away, but he promised he'd line up the money fast. He told him, "If you pull this off, I'll fork over 50,000 rubella." Ramsay pushed for a full 5-year tax break, and Darrell fired back by agreeing to 3 years. Ramsay figured that if he could finally snatch some real financial freedom, then yeah, how could he turn that down when refusing was getting harder by the second? If he's gonna poison the well, then don't play it safe, go all the way. Ramsay pressed, asking if it was only meant to set up a pretext, and Darrell didn't hesitate to confirm it. He adopted the whole plan and then leaned in like, "I've got a proposal to add." Then the story swung over to Danny, pretty drunk, leaning in and telling Ramsay that he and Ashley had been talking for ages. Ramsay noticed Danny had an absolutely wild time. Danny told them they wouldn't stop, carrying wine and piling in dried meat nonstop. Ashley marched up to Ramsay, apologized for doubting him, and told him that just like he promised, she'd set up 4 barrels of rye and a place for them to sleep tonight. Ramsay flashed a grateful smile at Ashley, then gripped his hand and shook it hard. He said he couldn't wait to team up with him, and Ashley cut in fast, asking exactly who he was. On March 2nd, time to stop talking and hit the gas. Action starts now. With him and his crew geared up, they were finally ready to spring their plan. He shouted to everyone that it was time to move, and one of his friends burst with excitement because they were finally getting out of there. Paul said the early bird always gets the worm, and they were already drilling into the base under the cover of night. Ivan panicked and told Paul to slow down. Last time, Ramsay and the others swooped in and stole their crops. Paul said Ramsay's thoughts had flipped. He'd heard they were sitting on a stash of liquor, and just that alone felt like the biggest score of all. Ivan couldn't shake the feeling that Paul had suddenly turned eager, until he realized someone must have planted that mindset in him. A shadowy man in a dark hood loomed behind them, grinning like he knew exactly what they were about to face. Paul snapped, "Hurry up, get ready," and every single one of them jumped to it without arguing. Under the cover of night, they slipped through the bushes, silent and tense. He told them to talk while they kept moving. He told them Ramsay was hiding in the biggest house, so they'd hit it soon, but for now they had to stay silent and wait. One of them lined in and demanded, "So what's the plan?" And Paul told him they'd torch it from every angle, and since it was the dead of night, they wouldn't snuff it out fast because that smoke could drop him. One of them cornered Paul and demanded, "Since you won't let him kill me himself, is it okay if I do it instead?" Paul said all that mattered was one thing. As long as Ramsay was gone, that was enough. He said that once you got so obsessed with doing it yourself, death usually showed up way too soon. The hooded man cracked up, praising Paul as brilliant and flat out, saying he had a natural gift for leading others. One of Paul's workers leaned in and asked, "Yo, who's that dude in the hood?" And Paul finally clocked it. His workers were about to meet that guy for the very first time. He introduced him as Keith, clamped down on the details, then made it crystal clear he was working under a noble's command. Paul broke into a grin and said, "My luck finally flipped for the better." His worker told him, "If Paul says it's true, then we'll trust you, period." Right then, one of them caught sight of the village and shouted to Paul that it was finally coming into view. Paul ordered them to kill the lights and move in, then warned them they'd start by covering their faces. And warned them, "Don't you dare forget, act like bandits." After a while, the night's silence swelled until it felt deafening. They charged toward the village and immediately spotted Ramsay's house. One of them leaned in and asked Paul, "Is that really it?" And Paul snapped back, "No doubt about it." He ordered them to light the torches and go all in. They did it, then hurled the torches at the house, and the whole place instantly went up in flames. The moment the house burst into flames, Paul just laughed, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ramsay got blasted with a scream, as if the speaker was sealing his fate. All the other villagers rushed outside and froze when they saw the fire already burning. One of the workers lunged in to scare the villagers off, barking that this wasn't some performance, and if they wanted to stay alive, they'd better scatter. Danny and the other soldiers came charging in right on time. He demanded to know what they were doing in their village. The workers fully believed they were nothing but weaklings. Paul told them, "Back Tony, and I'm sure we can beat them too." Just then Ramsay burst out in full armor, sword raised, and charged straight at Paul. Paul snapped up the block, and when he looked back, Ramsay was still standing. He shoved Ramsay back hard, staring in disbelief that he was still alive. He leaned in and demanded, "So did you bag yourself a lady, or at least pull off that rescue and save your own skin?" Ramsay tore into the idea that this was a brother, sneering that it was pathetic, and then he crumbled and let himself cry. Paul shot back with trash talk, telling him not to worry, because he was seconds away from making him cry blood. With a grin blazing on his face, he lifted his sword and slammed into Ramsay. Ramsay snapped his guard up in time, blocking the strike and parrying the follow-up. They traded punches back and forth. Then Archibald's brutal training kicked in, and he could actually stand his ground, but the power gap between them was just way too brutal to overcome. Ramsay was getting crushed while Paul breezed through it, and Ramsay realized, if this kept going, he was finished, yet he refused to fold. Right then, Keith snapped Paul's name and called him out, telling him this is where it all ends. When Paul demanded an answer, Keith snapped, "Look around," and Paul's eyes landed on most of his workers gathered as captured prey. Tony and Paul's younger brother, Kun, both dead, and the shock hit him like a punch to the chest. Danny and the others were still raring to go, ready to back up Ramsay. Keith snapped to Paul that they were boxed in, urged him to hand over the reins, and pushed for a regroup so they could reassess everything from the ground up. Paul had no choice but to nod and bolt with Keith. Danny lunged after him, but Ramsay cut him off, said there was no rush, and slammed down fire control first. Charlie and the other villagers hauled water in buckets. Ramsay snapped that if they struck now, they could cage the damage to the base alone. Then he roared for everyone to team up and smash that fire down before it spread. Keith and Paul sprinted for their lives, and Paul kept cursing Ramsay's nonstop, promising he would never, ever forgive him. On March 4th at Hendrick's mansion, Ramsay showed up with Danny and Ozma, and all three looked dressed to impress. Darryl showed up to Ramsay and quickly threw an apology his way for making him wait. Anthony also welcomed Lord Hans Rugel, and when the Lord stepped in, it was clear he'd come broken, sad, shaken, and completely distraught. Darryl dropped into his seat and fired the question at everyone there. Should they start hashing out the details? Ramsay broke down the brutal attack on Bartlett Village that just happened, and fired a question at his father, Lord Rugel. Did he have any objections or any counterarguments at all? Those hands looked crushed and sad, and he can't help wondering, could it really be Paul? "Ramsay, do you have any proof?" Ramsay told him, yeah, of course he did. He told him every single attack came from people of Rugel Village, 6 in total. Paul, Kun, Tony, Ivan, John, and Tom. He told him they'd already hauled in 3 of them, and if he still doubted, they'd drag those captured ones right there to prove it. Hans demanded, so what about the other 3? And Ramsay dropped the bombshell on him. Paul, the mastermind, had vanished and left everybody behind. The last 2, Tony and the second one, are still out there. Kun, the Rugel family's second son, was dead. Hans froze in utter disbelief. Then he clapped his palm over his face, swallowed his sadness, and told everyone, "I get it." Ramsay leaned in and promised, "I'll drop the bodies at your estate later." Darryl's grin widened. "All right," he said, "now it's time for the verdict." He leaned in and told Hans Rugel to stop ignoring the fact. Those warnings weren't there for nothing. Attacking Allied territory was a brutal offense. Even if it was his own son who did it, the parent still had to make sure it never happened. He swore he wouldn't end his life. He'd steal his title, seize his lands, and drag him into exile, and when Hans nodded, Darryl took the next step, saying Lord Ramsay Bartlett wouldn't have to carry a single shred of blame for defending his territory. Then he slammed the whole chaos shut, like that uproar was finally over. Through the window, Ramsay watched his father stagger off, drenched in pure shame and crushing sadness. Danny plopped down and admitted that standing out in the barren borderlands was making his nerves scream, and Ozma nodded in agreement. Ramsay quickly shot them both an apology. When Ozma finally asked why he'd thrown out that sudden suggestion, Ramsay finally cracked and told them he needed to apologize for how badly he'd communicated before. He leaned in and swore this whole mess was a scheme he cooked up with the Baron of the Borderlands. Then the story snapped back to when Ramsay was face to face with Darryl, and he leaned in like he had the perfect idea. He told him flat out, Paul, his brother, still hasn't given up on killing him, so why not hand Darryl the endorsement instead? Darryl couldn't stop himself, this had him instantly hooked. Ramsay broke it down like this. if he started whispering lies that the Baron and Lord Borden couldn't stand him. Paul bit the bait like a predator and stormed right into Bartlett's lands. Darrell got it right away, so he warned that if he pretended to let the Baron escape, the Baron would lure him straight into a trap. Then he'd end up guilty of plotting that attack. He leaned in and told Ramsay it was a damn good idea. Then he picked his squire Keith to carry the message, motioning Anthony to make it happen and told Ramsay he'd give him the attack date ahead of time, then warned him to lock in and focus on defending the village. Back in the present, Ramsay finally stopped talking and Danny caught the truth. Ramsay already knew an attack was coming that day. Ozma said, "We cleared out our stuff ahead of time, so the damage stayed barely noticeable." And Danny said the place that went up in flames was getting rebuilt anyway, because the reconstruction was already on the schedule. Ramsay nodded, then admitted he'd shoved everyone into danger. So yeah, he was truly sorry. Ozma told him he didn't have to apologize at all. He must have seen the only way forward. And sure enough, it all worked out because somehow everyone ended up safe. Ramsay's heart soared the moment he realized his people trusted him with everything they had. Just then, Darrell stormed out, praised Ramsay for a job well done, and thanked him for all the hard work he'd put in. He kept on weaving him into the crowd, and soon Jorg, another general in the Borderlands army, stepped in and got him introduced. Then he leaned in and told him, "Get ready, full-scale invasion prep starts now." But before they could move, he handed them bags stuffed with rubra, swore this was the promised 50,000, and told them to spend it like it mattered, because it did. Danny and Ozmo froze in disbelief when they laid eyes on all that money. Darrell blurted that he had just gotten a message from Keith. Paul looked like he'd pulled off the impossible and made it to Lord Borden safe and sound. So now it's time to plot their next move. Ramsay said it first since it was agreed. He'd fold the formal Rugel territory right into Bartlett's lands and pressed him, "Are you sure this is really okay?" Darrell said, "Give me a reason to hit from that side. Because if I think they stole the land that's rightfully mine, you're gonna see me come for it." He kept insisting that once Paul realized Ramsay was on the other end, he couldn't stay silent. He'd demand Lord Borden hand over Paul, because if he said no, the next move would be force. Ramsay leaned in and asked, "What if the barons just agreed, no games, no hesitation to hand me over?" Darrell shot Ramsay a wink and promised him he'd corner him so hard there'd be no way out. Only a refusal. Ramsay caught his meaning and realized Darrell would demand a fat compensation for hiding Paul. And that's when he knew this guy was sharp. It was March 8th, right on the calendar, and everything about to change. Paul sat at Baron Borden's mansion, stuck in the waiting game. Right then, a maid burst in, calling Paul by name, saying Lord Costello had summoned him. Costello de Borden, the hard-hitting head of the Borden family, greeted him and Paul dropped to his knees, trying with all his heart to pay his respects. But Costello bulldozed the moment with a quick stop and told him there was zero need for that little church greeting he'd been using for business. He leaned in and asked Paul, "Do you remember that story I told you the other day?" Paul insisted, saying the Baron was demanding his safety. It weirded him out, so even Hendrik the Baron had to hate Ramsay. Keith still hadn't come back, so he couldn't confirm a single thing. Costello backed it up and promised a payday of 200,000 rub. He tore up the paper and declared that, per Hendrik, it was Lord Paul who kicked off the whole attack, and Paul's father would be yanked from his title, stripped of everything, and thrown into exile to carry the blame. Then they dropped the bomb that Rugel territory was going to get absorbed into the Bartlett domain, and Paul nearly exploded from shock into pure rage. Costello kept going, claiming Keith had told him the truth, that he'd been thrown out unfairly, all because his brother's rebellion got them both caught in the fallout. So he stepped up and guarded him all the way through his territory. Costello pressed him, "Are you lying or not?" And Paul snapped back, "No, I'm not." And that Baron was hunting for any excuse at all to start an invasion. Costello figured that was just how things worked, then told himself that even if he went along with it, when Hendrik refused compensation, it lit a fuse in his mind. Because either way, he had the perfect excuse to strike, and it worked. He told everyone he had to talk this over with Lord Gardel too. It was March 12th right now, and Ramsay leaned into Eric, saying he was done waiting. He planned to build a brand new, bulletproof stronghold to stop the next wave of attacks. He slid over the blueprint he'd drawn, swearing he'd tear into the flatlands to build moats and mounds. Then crown the top with a watchtower, ring it all in walls, and tuck storage and housing inside. He ordered Eric to rally everyone in Rugel village and start immediately. And Eric promised he'd do everything he could. Danny showed up and straight up asked if he was finally going to see his father. Ramsay nodded along and admitted he'd heard the guy was ditching the estate today. Ramsay grabbed his father's hands right on time, and you could see the relief on his face when he realized Ramsay had made it. He told him, "I've gathered every document we need, I've already informed the villagers, so you can stop worrying." He admitted he never once expected Ramsay to be the one who'd actually pull it off. And it all came crashing down because nobody could truly take care of him. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know what would happen to him and his mother from this point on. He told them, "If you've got no legs, then stick with me, I'll have you covered." Hands cut him off cold, saying, "You've been sentenced to exile, so if Ramsay won't play along, your own position gets crushed too." He leaned in and told him, "We're heading straight for the capital." Helena's brother was inside the palace, and he could help them track down a real military position. Ramsay flashed a smile like he was finally safe, even though it was all an act. Hands finally stepped up and apologized for how they'd treated him, right up until this moment. And still, all he managed to do was stir up trouble. He told Ramsay that Paul wasn't always twisted, that as a kid Paul had actually cared for him, and he demanded, "Do you remember?" Ramsay snapped back with a memory from childhood, his brother looking after him and the two of them being genuinely happy. Hans snapped that it was his own fault for expecting way too much. He could only pray he'd take this territory and drive it wider. He pushed him hard through every lesson and every fight, and this was the outcome he'd forged. He knew deep down it was on him too. He pushed that kid too far, and the blame landed squarely in his own hands. For a split second, everything went silent. Then he snapped his bag open and showed Ramsay the gift like, "Yeah, this one's for you." He thrust the sword into his hands, swearing it was a family heirloom, and that he was finally meant to take it. He handed it to him and warned him to look after it, then called him his son. Ramsay choked up and a tear slipped out, because that thin thread of father and son was fraying right in front of him. He could feel it in his bones. He'd been reincarnated. And being the third son in this land, he figured he was useless, like the world had already written him off. Ramsay sobbed, lost in his own thoughts, and it all just spilled out. Clutching the thought in his head, he finally accepted the truth. Hans really was his father, and it hit him hard as he remembered the day he and his mother hugged him close while he watched them walk away. March 15th had finally arrived, and Ramsay and the others were down on their knees, digging like their lives depended on it near their base. Stress crushed him under the weight of everything he had to pull off as Lord, and his mind instantly got swamped with a mountain of things he had to figure out. First, he had to race to finish the Mott and Bailey Fort in the moat. No delays, not a second to waste. Right then, someone surged up to Ramsay and shouted, "My lord." It was this young guy named Johnny, fresh from Henderson, and Ramsay leaned in like, "So what's happening?" And Johnny blurted out that since Danny was tied up, he'd be the one to deliver the message. He told him a letter had finally arrived, courtesy of Baron Hendrik from the frontier. Ramsay tore open the letter and his eyes locked onto the words, "A summons right there waiting for him." He went completely speechless and blurted out to Eric to rally every carpenter in Rugel village and finish the fort right away. He asked Johnny to tell Danny he was rolling out for Henderson. Johnny agreed on the spot and immediately asked about his escort, but Ramsay shut it down and told him, "Don't worry." Once the fort was finally done, they hauled in weapons, armor, and enough food to keep everyone ready for whatever came next. He told Johnny to take care of the arrangements, and Johnny snapped back, "You got it." Night had finally swallowed the sky. Ramsay barreled up to the Hendrik residence, gasping for breath and shouting at the guard that he'd sprinted over there, only to realize it was already way too late. The guards grinned, told Ramsay they'd been waiting just for him, then motioned him in like a maid was ushering him to his fate. Ramsay tossed his things aside, slipped into a sharp suit, and followed the maid straight to Darrell's private room. He burst into the room, breathless, and apologized for making everyone wait. Darrell marched Ramsay into the room, introduced him to the guys, then made sure the guys met Ramsay too. The flashy show-off was Gilbert, heir to Viscount Berkeley, and the other guy so drenched in sweat he could barely stand was Oliver, the heir to Baron Lloyd. Ramsay shot out a handshake and told them with a grin it was awesome finally meeting them. They said the same thing and Darrell said, "We've been friends since we were kids, so now it's your turn to borrow our strength again." Gilbert warned me that bond was poison, and that's exactly why Darrell always hauled them into his chaos. Oliver, the other guy, nodded along and snapped that Darrell's reckless demands were draining every ounce of energy. Darrell ended the small talk and snapped that they needed to jump straight back to the main topic. He shoved a letter from Baron Borden into their hands. Gilbert snatched it up and read the note out loud. Turns out it's originally Paul, the firstborn, who's set to inherit the Rugel territory. Paul is the true heir and Ramsay, the third son, must hand everything back to Paul right now. If they get turned down, they'll march the whole army in and tear back what they came for. Ramsay snapped that this was a straight-up declaration of, and Darrell nodded, locking it in. He said that with opinions clashing this hard, they had no choice. Fight it out and settle it once and for all. But once the declaration of war came down, there was no question. Earl Gardel backed Baron Borden all the way. Oliver swore that Earl Gardel's family was one of the country's deadliest military dynasties, and Gilbert warned them to brace, because their side was about to take massive damage too. Darrell snapped that the whole army's claim was a straight-up lie. Ramsay stayed stone-cold quiet while Darrell kept laying it out. If Bartlett's territory got hit by the full army, they'd be finished. But if the Baron's territory was left wide open with no guards in sight, the frontier army would come hunting them without hesitation. Oliver said that meant they'd strike with 300 troops, and Hendrik snapped that that number was dead on. Ramsay realized that even 300 would turn into a nightmare for them, because that number was dangerously close to how many citizens they had. Gilbert then leaned in and said Baron Borden's troop count was capped at around 500. So if he burned through 300 of these, his own turf would get wiped nearly clean. Oliver totally agreed with it. They swore they'd lure them straight into the Baron's lands and slam them with Gardel's troops all at once. No warning, just chaos. Gilbert clocked their scheme, and Darrell said, if Earl Gardel could raise 2,000 troops and keep 500 in his own territory, then the other 1,500 are lurking in the Baron's land. So if you underestimate the enemy's true strength, you don't just lose, you get wiped out completely. Ramsay stayed stone still, soaking in every word, while Oliver bluntly said that depending on the battlefield, they'd need 3 times the troops just to seize a castle or fort. Gilbert leaned in and demanded to know just how many troops they could pack up and move. And he leaned in, telling him he had 2. Oliver had 400, Gil had 300, and Ramsay had, what could he possibly have? Just as he was about to finish, he slammed the brakes, telling them not to expect too much from their forces. Ramsay felt mortified when Gil said it. That's 2,700 total, because a siege like that was about to get brutal. They kept talking, and Ramsay glanced at the clock. Over an hour had passed, and the conversation just kept looping in circles. He knew right away he couldn't say a word about military strategy, but then he couldn't stop asking himself, was he really supposed to just sit there while everything around him explodes into this mess? He blurted out his feelings, and the whole crowd snapped their attention to him. Darrell leaned in and demanded what was wrong. He told them, if you get lost, hit rewind and go back to where our whole conversation started. So Darrell and Baron Borden stepped in and crashed his and Paul's succession fight. And both sides quietly pray they can swipe each other's territory first. Darrell flat out confirmed it. Ramsay turned to the whole room and demanded, who do you think will strike first in this fight? Gil tried to speak, but his words just wouldn't come. Ramsay warned that whoever took the lead this time would get shoved straight into a brutal trap. He kept going since the fight was all about the succession. The first hit would land in Bartlett's territory. If Paul makes the first move and invades, they can crush him back with the Border Lord's army, straight up sheer force. If they strike the Baron's territory, Bartlett's lands, and the Border Lords too, will sit wide open for raids. Gil and Oliver instantly nodded along. They were totally on the same page. Ramsay flat out said, so now we make our move. Everyone stared in total confusion, and Gil snapped at him. Wait, did you really just say you're handing us a disadvantage? Ramsay told him, I'm not flying blind, then pushed the question, what's your plan? And asked. Darrell rallied every soldier he could, because once he led them, his lands would lay wide open. And so he asked for just 50 more men. Then he'd find a way to flip the whole fight in Bartlett's territory. Gil leaned in and asked Darrell what he was gonna do next. After mulling it over, Darrell cracked a smile and told Ramsay, I'm in, I agree. He said he'd fund mercenaries and put them under Ramsay's command. No matter what happened, it would all land on Ramsay. Ramsay agreed. Oliver then said, use this as our base plan. Now let's strategize and make it work. Their argument kept burning, line after lines. On March 30th, at Baron Borden's mansion, a guard named Paul hurried in, saying Lord Costello had demanded his presence. Paul lit up the moment he heard it. He swung the door open and froze. Costello was leaning in, chatting with the head guard, Ludwig von Gardel. Costello warned that the young border lord was driving their troops right into the path ahead, and the count was around 3,000, so he'd pulled out nearly his whole army to make it happen. Costello leaned in and told Paul, I'm trusting you with 200 of my soldiers, go lock down my territory and make it stable. Paul nodded and agreed. Costello told him, I'll send you an aide, so don't waste her. Make sure you use her well. Paul shot him a grateful nod and promised, just say the word, I'll be more than happy to help. He waved everyone away, and Paul bolted out the door without a second to spare. After he snapped on the gear, Paul grinned and said, finally, it's time to deliver judgment to Ramsay. Just then, he stormed out of the mansion. Baron Borden's captain, Veronica, met him at the door, saying she'd been waiting on him, and she got assigned to back up this unit. Paul shot them a confident grin, introduced himself, and told everyone to get ready for the battle. Veronica nodded right on cue. She ordered every troop to stand ready. She told Paul to get ready to leave in about 30 minutes, then pressed him for which route to take. before steering him toward a detour. Paul shot that down. Taking the northern route could slam them into Hendrik's border forces, but the southern road cuts right through Lord Dominic's land, and that's the kind of shortcut that sparks misunderstandings fast. He told her it would take too long, come with real danger, and that hitting the mountains was the smarter move. Veronica nodded to herself thinking, yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. But with so many elderly soldiers in this unit, she would have begged for a smooth, flat road instead of a brutal mountain climb. She assured Paul she was with him, then they plotted the mountain route. Only this time they picked a path that wouldn't wreck them. Paul nodded and leaned in, ready he was, burning to show Ramsay what he can do. Back in Bartlett's turf, Ramsay wrapped up his hackjob setup and snapped it to life, fully running and ready to go. He hauled water from the nearby stream, built the food stores with thick earthen walls to shrug off the flames, and they had more than enough food stacked away. Right then a man stormed in called Ramsay Chief, and told him all of them were waiting over there. Hawk was the ruthless leader of the mercenary crew, the Black Eagles. Ramsay shot him a quick thank you and then leaned in, demanding to know how everything was going with Danny's coordination. Hawk leaned in and told him, for now, everything's fine. Then he promised Danny and the others would rally under their Black Eagle banner. He said that sure, you'd normally fold that mercenary crew right into the regular army, but the regulars weren't an army at all. They were just thrown together in a hurry. So he refused to hand his men's lives over that easily. Ramsay nodded and said it plain. The best move was putting battle-seasoned mercenaries in charge, but told him not to waste the regular troops, and Hawk just laughed, then snapped back to Ramsay that he should go tell the enemy forces the same thing. Justin Johnny stormed in. He told Ramsay the weapons were locked in and ready to roll. Ramsay leaned in and demanded how many arrows they had, and Johnny shot back. Roughly 200. Ramsay could see it wasn't enough, so he snapped at Johnny, hold on 1 second, that he was itching to pile up arrows and be ready for anything. And he demanded that the soldiers haul back branches for reconnaissance, then shot him a question, could he actually get permission? Hawk told him it's all good, seriously, you're fine. Ramsay snapped a quick thank you, then promised he'd race off and deliver those orders. Hawk stared at him, totally captivated. He caught himself thinking, Ramsay's still young, but he's a lord. So before he so much as moved a single troop, he checked with him. Even if he understood it, putting it into motion was a whole different beast. He grinned and said this place was exactly what he needed to crank out real work. On March 31st, mark the date because everything is about to kick off. A messenger burst into the village, screaming so loud he yanked everyone awake in seconds. Hawk leaned in and demanded to know what the hell was going on, and the messenger rushed in and told him he'd spotted around 200 enemy troops halfway up the Beverly Mountains. Hawk's stomach sank when he heard it, because he'd already been told they were going to face 300. He bragged it'd be a piece of cake, and Ramsay shot back that getting wrecked by pure carelessness wasn't funny at all. Danny grabbed the messenger and demanded, how much longer before we hit the battlefield? The messenger lined in and told him the enemy troop wasn't even moving. They were taking a breather too. So by the earliest in an hour and by the latest, they'll spot them in 3. Danny ordered the messenger to pull back and take a breather. Worry creased his face, and right then Hawk drove a kick straight into his side, who told him that if he was this worked up right now, he'd never survive long enough to reach the real deal. He ordered him to get the soldiers ready, trusted him with everything, and even called him sergeant. Danny nodded, took it in, and walked out. Ramsay leaned in and demanded Hawk's take, what he thought and whether they had any shot at all. He assured him they'd be okay if they just stuck together in numbers, but warned that only trying would prove it. Ramsay admitted that his uncertainty felt weirdly comforting, and Danny sprinted back to, Hawk, I'm telling you, I've already ordered the troops to get ready for deployment. Hawks told them to hit the brakes and run one last final check. He straight up told everyone he was taking overall command. Danny rolled in with 20 regular troops, and Ramsay was already out front with 10. He said he'd take charge of the last 50 mercenaries they'd brought with them. He ordered them to stick to the big orders and said the rest was on their judgment. Ramsay snapped that every time he heard that plan, it was still painfully vague. Hawk told them to quit panicking because that fort could stall the enemy. No sweat, thanks to the mercenaries inside. And he knew they wouldn't try any reckless stunt tricks. He told them to waste no time, let's kick this off. Paul and his troop rolled in, and his jaw dropped because that fortress had risen in no time at all. Veronica burst in and told him the fortress bridge was already up and raised. To crack through, they'd have to forge a whole new bridge, or risk their lives by crossing that moat. Paul leaned in and asked what they should do next, and Veronica swore she'd heard there weren't any seasoned soldiers over there, so maybe they could take the shot. But it looks like their reinforcements still never showed up. Paul nodded, then said, we're pushing forward exactly like we planned. Paul marched them forward, then slammed the brakes and ordered, stop right here. Lock in your formation from this spot. Right then an arrow ripped through the air and whizzed past Paul's face, missing him by the thinnest margin. He was so stunned he shouted at his troop to fall back and slip away from the fortress, and he couldn't stop wondering how arrows could even reach them from that far. He stared at that massive tower and couldn't help wondering, was that the reason behind everything? At the very top of the tower, Ramsay stood there with his archer, grinning like he owned the sky, telling them their range was more than enough. Arrows tore through the air when they were fired from high ground, but once the group reached 3 people, the height maxed out, and the accuracy started slipping fast. The barrage of projectiles tore through the air, and he shouted down to the troops below, "This is your moment." Paul was boiling with frustration, yelling that Ramsay was straight up mocking them. Veronica rushed in, trying to steady him before he completely lost control. Then he roared to his troops, "Charge forward, grab Ramsay's head." The archers gripped their arrows as Hawk snapped, "Not yet, wait until they're close enough, then let them fly." Moments later, he barked the order, and a storm of arrows rained down on the soldiers. Danny barked, "Keep firing, don't let them reach the fortress." Hawk snapped at Danny, demanding to know where Rams. Danny leaned in and told him they'd be ready for ambushes coming from behind and the sides. Then Hawk grinned and praised him, saying he was downright crafty. Soldiers were dropping like flies, one after another. Veronica warned Paul that if they kept standing like this, they'd get wiped out, so they had to fall back right now. Paul had no choice, he obeyed her, then barked for his soldiers to fall back. They bolted into the forest, and Veronica snapped that in their first fight they'd already taken a brutal loss, 50 men down between them, so they didn't have the numbers to encircle the fortress. Paul leaned in and asked her, "Got any good plan?" And she told him a classic night raid was the play, and Paul shot back, asking if she honestly thought that would even work. After a long pause, she finally blurted out that it would. She told them to hit the brakes and fall back for now. Their intel about Bartlett's turf was dead wrong, and she snapped that smashing that fortress with their current troops was nearly impossible. Paul nodded, then his mind raced. What if they skipped the fortress and hit the village instead? But he snapped himself back to reality. The village and all that rural land belonged to him, so raiding it would be pure madness. Paul said he couldn't rush it, he needed to wrestle with it all night. At night, Veronica jolted awake to a sudden crash. Hawk and his mercenaries barged in, snapping at the soldiers that their judgments were way too soft, then leaning in like, "So you really think you won't hit us with a night raid?" Veronica shouted at the troops, "Don't panic, our numbers are on our side, so stay together." Hawk heard it and snapped that if they stayed glued together, they'd be handing themselves a straight-up disadvantage. He ordered his mercenaries to cause a ruckus, then slip away. Back at camp, Hawk came in from the enemy side, and Ramsay immediately praised him, then leaned in and demanded to know what they'd seen from the enemy camp. Hawk snapped that they were finished. Morale was cratering, and before long they'd splinter and fall apart. Ramsay then shot Hawk a look and told him to order the soldiers to take a nap, as they would fire up the morning charge. Danny stormed in, demanding to know if that was really necessary. Ramsay's face showed nothing, and he ordered them to hit them hard. No mercy if they were really going to do this. Danny couldn't stop worrying, but Hawk acted like it was all no big deal. Ramsay knew he had to wipe out that grudge with Paul right here, and the gap in decisiveness was rapidly shrinking. Hawk admitted he understood Danny's worries, but said that one reckless move could have spiraled into massive losses from that point on, though they'd probably back off any moment. So yeah, they should have clocked them hard on the way out. He said his squad and Ramsay's would go after them, while Danny held the fort down. Then boom, April 2nd morning had arrived. Then a messenger burst into Ramsay's presence, shouting that the enemy was already slipping into retreat mode. Hawk barked orders at his soldiers to ready the charge, then leaned in and asked if they'd truly slept well, and they shouted back, yes. He leaned in and told Danny, "I'm coming too." So the Lord's squad had to be nearby, and he told them, "We'll wipe them out before we split up," and Danny nodded in agreement. They rounded up the soldiers and charged forward into the unknown. Hawk finally caught sight of them and jabbed a finger, saying it looked like only about 30 were left. Veronica stood her ground, fearless and locked in, with the rest of her soldiers right beside her. Hawk fired off a message to Danny Ramsay, and a bunch of other people too. He ordered the other soldiers to show them no mercy, not even for a second. Slaughter them without a second thought, then lock in on the enemy right in front of you. He roared at them to charge, and they surged forward, smashing straight into Veronica's forces and sending them scrambling. Hawk demanded they surrender, promise in hand that he'd spare their lives. He doubled down and warned that if anyone didn't want to die, they'd better drop their weapons right now. Veronica's soldiers dropped their weapons and surrendered. The Hawks begging for mercy, pleading to spare their lives, and Veronica's jaw drops in pure shock. Hawk blurted that they were finally in the clear, then told Ramsay they were pushing onward. Ramsay swore his squad would show up any second. As he spun around, Veronica was still there, standing firm, facing the soldiers head-on, daring them to come closer because she'd fight to the very end. Ramsay clocked her instantly, and the moment hit like a punch, and ordered the soldiers to fall back. He stepped up to Veronica, announced himself as the army's commander, and made it clear he could already tell she was a legend on the battlefield. Veronica introduced herself as the captain of Baron Borden's forces, then told him she needed to talk right away. Ramsay shot an apology straight at him, admitting he couldn't take that one-on-one duel. He would have wanted her to fall in quietly, he'd even swear her safety, but she refused to back down and stayed right where she was. Ramsay told himself she was a total problem, and if they played it right, they might have slipped away with Paul too. He leaned in and told Danny, "We're switching roles. Our job is to hold the fort, so you run and back up Hawk." Danny got it. Then he rounded up his squad and launched them after Hawk. Ramsay told her he'd slow down and take his time with her, but he urged her to pause and soak in what was all around her. She stared at what remained, defeated soldiers and lifeless corpses, while he smirked and told her straight up she didn't have a prayer against him. Veronica groaned, fought it for a second, then finally surrendered. When Danny's squad finally caught up to Hawk, he looked completely finished with the fight. Hawk snapped that the enemy commander had slipped away for good, and right then and there, they had no move left. In that fight, Paul's army, led by Baron Borden, got slammed into place and couldn't budge. Between the dead and the momentary hope, their ranks shrank until only 20 soldiers remained, and Paul barely clawed his way out, slipping into the Baron's capital, Boston. And just like that, Bartlett's army sealed the deal with a crushing, no doubts win. At the razor-thin border where Baron Borden's territory stops and Count Hendrick's land begins, Gilbert rode up on his horse with his soldiers flanking him, then snapped at them, "Protect your lives, because for now you should have just kept that deadlock standing." He kept thinking Darl said it, but 3 straight days of stalling had him spiraling. Was everything really okay? Right then, a soldier burst in and told Gilbert the messenger from the Bartlett territory had finally arrived. Gilbert promised he'd drop by to see Daryl. When he burst into the tent, he spotted Daryl and Oliver standing there and demanded to know what the heck was happening in Bartlett. Oliver looked him in the eye and said it was awesome to see him again. Daryl leaned in and told them the messenger swore Ramsay and his crew had crushed the enemy and walked away with a total win. Gilbert couldn't help but beam, cheering that Ramsay had finally shown some real backbone. He leaned in and demanded to know what they were doing next. Oliver told him he'd been holding the Baron's troops in place there, just to stop any reinforcements from slipping in. Suddenly, Daryl burst into loud, unstoppable laughter. Oliver and Gilbert got hopelessly tangled up in confusion. Gilbert froze when he heard that he thought the status quo was fine. He laid it out plain: they'd keep striking just enough to trap the enemy in place. No need to risk everything for the fort. The scene snapped to Ramsay. He lifted his cup high and declared they had to toast to that victory. They all lifted their cups high and erupted in cheers, celebrating their victory like it was the best day of their lives. Danny showed up to Ramsay and demanded, "What are we doing next?" Ramsay told him the whole thing hinged on Hawk, and when Hawk was plastered, he laughed and claimed he was the chosen one. Ramsay peppered him with questions about the future, how the Black Eagle Corps was holding up, and whether they were still ready to roll. Hawk swore he was one of the real ones, and he promised he'd keep raking it all in. Ramsay flashed a grin and blurted that he wanted the next job immediately, leaving Hawk completely stunned. After a moment, he charged toward Veronica, hands tied tight, held down, and demanded, "Are you okay?" And she screamed at him to stop dragging it out. If he was going to kill her, then do it already. Ramsay told her to calm down, saying he wasn't planning to end her life. Not yet. He quizzed her on whether she'd said she was a captain, noble blood, or just a merchant. Veronica brushed him off and snapped that if he wasn't going to kill her, at least take her prisoner, and do whatever he wanted. Ramsay clocked it instantly. She wasn't even hearing a single word he said, and he figured all he had to do was wait it out until she finally cooled down. Right before he walked out, her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl, and he leaned in like, "Can we negotiate?" After a little while, he ripped her bindings open and handed her something to eat. He leaned in and asked her to spill everything about herself. She walks in and snaps, "I'm Veronica, 20 years old, and yeah, I'm a captain under Baron Borden." She told him she was born to the boss of the Mossman Trading Company and his concubine in the wilds of Borden territory. Ramsay heard she came from a great family. Then he told her, "I'll go demand a ransom from Baron Borden, and once he pays, you'll be free as a bird." Veronica forced a sad smile and told him the Baron wouldn't pay a ransom, and neither would her father, Mossman. They'd both rather burn their money on real goods than hand it over to pay for her. Ramsay finally clocked the truth. Keeping her locked up was going to cost a fortune. Veronica told him she'd been forged to fight as a soldier, and then dared him to sell her to a slave trader. He leaned in and asked her straight up if she wanted to become his slave. And just like that, she snapped, telling him he was being ridiculous because who in their right mind would ever want to be a slave? Then he leaned in and asked what she wanted to do next. Tears almost spilled as she blurted out that she didn't want anything. She just wanted to go home. Ramsay nodded like it finally clicked, then pushed himself to his feet. He promised he'd do everything in his power to bring her safely back home. Veronica's breath caught when she realized just how kind he really was. The moment switched to a tense meeting, Mosman, the head of his trading company, facing Costello head-on. Mosman swore they were in a real mess, then demanded, "Is this really Lord Paul from that Marquis family, the one who got wrecked and vanished, disgraced?" Costello leaned in, grinning, and told him his ears were still razor-sharp. Losing 200 soldiers was a total disaster. Then he leaned in and said Paul was stuck under house arrest at that very place. Mosman said Count Gardel's reinforcements came in at 1,500 strong, so there was no stash of gold that could ever cover that kind of force. Costello stared at him, worry all over his face, and Mosman pressed, "So what brings you here today?" Costello pulled out a letter and announced that a swift horse had just arrived, bearing a demand from General Holland at Fort Code. It claimed they'd snatched Veronica and 20 more in Bartlett territory, and they'd demand a ransom just to get everyone back. Mosman swore he'd love to see Costello finally cough up the money like a real lord. Costello shot off an apology, saying he couldn't squeeze blood from empty pockets, and thanks to Paul, he suddenly had to cough up condolence money for 180 soldiers' families. Mosman locked eyes with him and said, "If we ditch the captives, it'll make me look bad as a lord." Costello shrugged and said, "Don't sweat it, we can just pretend we don't know a thing." And that's exactly why he shoved the military's shame onto this mission. He caught himself thinking, Veronica's not like the others at all. She declimbed the ranks through sheer grit, not family pull. And he couldn't help but wonder if he even had what it took to cough up Mosman's daughter's ransom. Mosman said they had no choice, so they had to throw in the towel. Costello blinked in shock and demanded, "So you're telling me you won't pay the ransom cover?" And Mosman told him straight up that his trading company had already poured out too much, and now his own pockets were worn to nothing. Costello thought, like it was nothing, that Mosman was just some bastard kid to her. Right then, a soldier came crashing through the door like he owned the place. Costello leaned in and told him, "We've got guests." The soldier shot back, "It's urgent, this message can't wait." He blurted that Az on the east side was getting smashed, and Costello's jaw dropped as he demanded, "Did the Border Lord's army just move in?" The soldier snapped back and said it wasn't true, then told him the enemy was Bartlett's army. Costello couldn't even process what he was seeing. Hawk led Bartlett's army straight into the village, shouting for his men to torch it, smash it, and haul off everything they could grab. He told them, "Don't stress over the fleeing villagers. Grab every bit of loot you can." Ramsay dropped the word on them that, when it came to this, right at the base of the Beverly Mountains sits the Baron's domain. And that's why he pushed Hawk and the others to go all in and land there very first. Hawk told everyone, "Once we snatch the food and valuables, we're gone. No wasting time, no lingering." Then Danny's face flashed with worry, so he hurried over, soothed him, and told him to keep his eyes locked in because this was war. He told him that normally he'd haul the villagers back, especially the young women and the children, but not this time. He snapped that it wasn't mercy at all. Letting them stay would only make everyone a burden. He leaned in and asked Danny if he got it, and Danny nodded like, "Yep, I understand." Slapping his own face to snap into focus, he barked at the soldiers, time to pull out. Hawk couldn't help but worry it would hit Danny hard, but he knew he had to toughen up now, because someday he'd be leading troops for real. He felt a surge of relief. At least that first battle didn't end in a complete disaster. The story snapped to Baron Borden's Army General Holland, right in the middle of the action. Rage boiled in his veins when a messenger told him Borden wanted him to pull troops from the front. He snapped back that it was impossible, and pressed him hard to say what Baron Borden was thinking. He snapped that their troops were worn to the bone from the non-stop attacks, and they still had zero idea what the border lords were planning. The messenger warned him that if they kept moving at this pace, the enemy from the east would tear through their lands and leave nothing standing. Holland grabbed the messenger and demanded to know how many troops he wanted. He told him he'd need around 300, and Holland figured it wasn't a total disaster. Still, anything could blow up at any moment. Holland agreed to send a full force of 200 soldiers. The messenger nodded like he finally got it, then immediately begged for the dispatch to be sent out right now. Holland snapped with frustration, staring at it like, "What the hell is Count Hendrik up to?" The story snapped over to Gilbert and Daryl, like the world just switched cameras on them. Where Gil snapped, "So how long are you gonna drag this standoff out?" Daryl snapped at him to knock it off with that ridiculous talk and promised, no matter what, they'd keep going until they finally won, obviously. Gilbert snapped, demanding to know if they could actually pull off a win, and when Oliver tried to soothe him, Daryl pressed him. What did he really think? Oliver said, "Don't freak out yet. But as this kept dragging, the price kept climbing. So they had to play it smart and guard every single supply like it was life or death. Daryl told me he'd already stocked up, just in case trouble showed up. Right then, a soldier burst into their tent and leaned in to whisper something to Daryl. Once he finally finished, Daryl said the situation is moving better than anyone ever dared to hope, and warned him to get ready for a full-scale assault. Back in Bartlett territory, a messenger burst in to tell Ramsay. Daryl ordered them to cut down the enemy troops, and fast like there was no time to breathe. Ramsay warned Hawk and Danny that the Count still hungered to ravage the village. Hawk snapped at Daryl for being greedy, while Danny just stood there looking shaky and unsure. Ramsay swore this time it wouldn't be smooth sailing, because defensive forces were about to get deployed. They already wiped out the closest Asu village, so he ordered them to hit Mocha village, Pina village, or Toto village, warning that the enemy would be expecting trouble from the villages nearby. Danny demanded to know where their real target was, because they couldn't just smash everyone all at once. Ramsay was already plotting how to outsmart the enemy. He pushed the idea that they should hit the capital right for Boston. Danny's jaw dropped in pure shock and Hawk burst out laughing. They called it an interesting idea, but warned it was a bad move because their own losses would be brutal. Hawk then pointed at Fermi, the second biggest city, and Danny shot back, "I heard it's the barony's commercial powerhouse." It was the kind of spot you'd struggle to hit, and yet he still asked, "So, this place isn't dangerous?" Hawk then swore they'd stir up chaos right there, and hit Gauze village with everything they had. Right then Veronica snapped, calling them out and cutting through the noise. They looked at her like, "Wait, what just happened?" and demanded answers. She told them to talk strategy in another room and then shot back, "What, you think I'm blind?" And Ramsay burst into laughter. He bowed his head, apologized, and said this fortress couldn't afford even a single mistake. He leaned in and asked what she thought about the Baron's army, where they were going, how they were moving. Veronica smirked and challenged him, asking whether he really thought she and that enemy soldier would ever answer her. Ramsay told her the enemy base still hadn't sent a single word, and Veronica's face fell with crushing disappointment. They burst out of the room, and Ramsay pressed Danny to lock the plan in and hit it that very night. Danny just wondered if it was a little too rushed. Ramsay nodded and said he believed this move would finally end the whole mess. The Black Raven Brigade's elite kicked off a bold diversion, and 200 fresh reinforcements from the Baron's army charged in to crush them. While the clock kept ticking, Bartlett's main forces crashed into Gauze village on the far side. Then Count Hendrik's troops launched a full-scale assault, ready for war and swinging nothing but steel. Costello leaned into his minister and demanded, "Is this really where the battle stands right now?" and told them he couldn't possibly pull in more soldiers from the front lines. The minister warned it was brutal, because during troop rotations, they could unleash a full-scale attack in the blink of an eye. They clung to their positions at first, but then one step at a time, they started getting pushed back for good. Costello caught himself wondering if he should beg Count Gardel for reinforcements, then he shut the thought down fast, because even if they rode out, they'd be too late to matter. And right in the middle of all that chaos, the whole village burst into flames. He ordered his minister to dispatch a peace envoy to Count Hendrik. On April 5th at Fort Codes, Daryl and Ramsay linked up with Costello in Holland, just as the four sides kicked off peace negotiations. Ramsay clocked Baron Borden right there with General Holland, the honored emissary of Count Gardel. Then he watched soldiers grab Paul and pin him down. Borden fired off the first words. He broke down and apologized for the whole conflict, genuinely begging forgiveness. Just like them, they'd been fooled by Paul too. Daryl grinned and told him he could only imagine the storm of turmoil churning in his heart. But that had nothing to do with them. He made it brutally clear. They kept shutting down their demands over and over, then marched out and mobilized their forces anyway. Borden lined in and demanded, "What do you mean by that?" And Daryl stepped up and announced he wanted to claim the Gorda Plain as part of his border lord's territory. For compensation, 200,000 rubella felt fair, but Holland stepped in and shut it down. He kept insisting this war was born from a misunderstanding, then asked him straight out if he dug up the proof and marched straight to Baron Borden, this whole disaster would have been stopped cold. Ramsay had to admit Holland was right. Then it hit him. That border lord had deliberately held back from any military move. He claimed Lord Rugel was his vassal, so his son should have been delivered to him right away, no hesitation. And it wasn't some easy win for the folks who'd been slacking on their duties, because you don't get to bark out demands at them. Holland said that if they're tossing around responsibilities, then Hendrik, the border lord, has to take some blame too for how badly he handled his vassals, and demanded to know how he actually planned to take responsibility for all of this. Ramsay snapped to the reality this was a dead end and there was no way forward, and grilled Baron Borden, demanding to know what compensation he believed was fair. Borden said that offering 50,000 rubella in compensation felt fair enough. Rage flared in Daryl and he stood up, snapping that the negotiations had officially collapsed. He snapped at his guard to race a swift horse to Gilbert at the front lines and shout an immediate order for the whole army to charge. Then Holland lunged in and stopped him. He told himself this whole fight again idea was pure madness. No fresh troops, no real commanders, and that fort was doomed to fall. He couldn't help but wonder, was the Baron the only one who'd actually paid attention to both the war plans and the money? Holland leaned in and told Daryl, I get you. They told them, settle this right now, Gorda Plain is where it all goes down. Borden stared in shock, and Daryl fired back that one loan was all it took. Holland said the payout would be a whopping 50,000 rubella. Doriel got slashed down to just 150,000, but Holland finally nodded and promised to make it a spotless 100,000. He told Daryl to wrap it up for both sides, and Daryl nodded right away, questioning whether Baron Borden was truly satisfied with all of this. Borden nodded and Holland's smile lit up his face, insisted they sign that treaty and call it a ceasefire. Then bam, Ramsay snapped at them to hold on, saying he had still not done negotiating yet. Everyone was left speechless. Daryl broke into a laugh, and Holland snapped that he was a little brat and flat out said he wasn't welcome here. Ramsay laughed and called it the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Like this war erupted from some twisted misunderstanding, and suddenly he was the first to get hit, top victim, no doubt about it. And still, he swore he'd never been invited to the negotiating table. Holland was left completely stunned, unable to find a single word. Ramsay leaned in and asked him straight up how he was going to fix what he'd done. After a quick breath-stopping pause, Holland promised Paul, I'll hand you the real root of all this and we'll end it peacefully. No fighting, no games. Ramsay and Paul locked eyes, and when Ramsay told him flat out he had no use for that, it hit Paul like a sucker punch, leaving him totally stunned. Holland and Borden, he reminded himself, I'm not a fighter, I'm a lord. And he chased what actually helped his people, because with Paul captured, there was no honor worth saving. So he refused to take that offer, no matter what. Borden demanded to know if Paul's destruction of their lands still wasn't the final proof they needed. Ramsay finally spilled that it was all mercenaries the border baron hired. And that meant, gut-punchingly, he'd walk away seeing not a single rubella. Ramsay stared at the truth and realized it was only half a lie. Before the fight even ignited, the shares with Hawk's Black Heron group were already settled. But he understood, right here wasn't the place to lay out the truth with brutal honesty. Borden leaned in and told Ramsay he could take the Beverly Mountains in full, and that was more than enough. Ramsay leaned in and demanded the foothills too, but Borden shut him down cold. No, just the mountains. Ramsay figured it was a solid compromise, then told them to put it in writing that they wouldn't be held responsible for landslides or anything else, and Borden nodded and agreed. Ramsay then demanded a ransom for Captain Veronica and her 20 captured subordinates, and Borden snapped it down without hesitation, saying, if you don't bring back the captive, then that's fine. Ramsay's eyes went wide, completely stunned by what he just saw, and they pushed that wish into him, wanting to come back, and then hit him with one sharp question. Wasn't the captain absolutely priceless to his forces? Borden flat out said they couldn't cough up the reparations in one go, so there was zero chance they could scrape together the ransom too. Ramsay realized Veronica's dad and the Mosman Trading Company weren't backing him up at all. Holland let out a heavy sigh and told them, if we really struck a deal, then sign the ceasefire. Daryl and Borden slapped their names onto the document, then shot hands in a solid handshake. Daryl told Ramsay he'd push back to the front, then ordered him to reclaim command and ride back to his territory. Ramsay nodded and agreed. Holland demanded what become of Paul, and Costello snapped, telling him to get rid of him. Ramsay locked eyes with his brother and mouthed his goodbye in his head, while Paul chewed his lip and swallowed his defeat. On the Gorda Plains, that day ended with nothing but one lone abandoned corpse. Back in Bartlett's territory, where the trouble starts crawling in, Danny grinned at him, welcomed him back like he'd won, and blurted, we did it. Ramsay insisted he hadn't said a single word. Danny leaned in and asked, is the war over? And Ramsay snapped back, yeah. Danny stormed off, yelling that he had to spread the news of their victory to everyone. And then Hawk swooped in and demanded to know the exact terms of the ceasefire. And Ramsay leaned in and told him it wasn't a victory at all. The Baron handed over the Gorda Plains and coughed up 100,000 rubella, yet all he ended up with was the Beverly Mountains. Hawk nodded, said, yeah, that about nails it, and handed him the spoils list. After reading for a while, Ramsay told him exactly what to grab. Food, textiles, a stack of ironware, and every last valuable thing Hawk could carry. Hawk praised him as a steady commander and said it worked wonders for him. He stormed out, promised he'd fix it immediately, and told him the lady was already waiting in his room. When Ramsay slipped into his room, there was Veronica, waiting right there like she'd been expecting him. She lit up the second she saw Ramsay, but the moment she locked eyes with his face, she knew it all went wrong for her, and told her it was okay because she already knew this would happen. She collapsed onto the bed and dared him, kill her or sell her if he wanted, or did he have something better in mind and actually plan to enjoy her body? Ramsay stared at her and shot, "So you're not coming with me." Veronica froze in shock, and Ramsay snapped that he couldn't stomach selling her, so he demanded she become his vassal and serve him. Veronica declined, saying her subordinates were already here, and that she'd end up losing control of herself and turning them into slaves. Ramsay flashed a grin and tossed her two choices: turn him down, and he'd sell every single one of them to the slavers. If she agreed to work there, he swore he'd tear the cage open and free the other captives. Veronica stared at him with raw emotion, then dropped to her knees and bowed before him. She said her name was Veronica, then swore, with everything she had, that she'd stay loyal to Sir Bartlett. Ramsay yanked his sword free, then tapped her shoulder like a cue, marking the moment her appointment was on. And just like that, another one got thrown aside as worthless, joining the pile of things they'd already given up on. Danny was soaking up his hard-won victory, laughing and partying with everyone around him. Ramsay showed up and found the whole crew partying hard. Eric practically begged him to jump in, but Ramsay waved it off, saying he'd catch up later. A few days had dragged by since the peace talks at the Gouda Plains. The worst of the crisis was over, and now the whole territory was buzzing with festival lights and roaring cheers. With Paul's disastrous reputation trailing in the wake as the Rugel heir, the merger with the Bartlett territory was somehow going smooth as butter. William Cathy rolled in with a whole barrel of kavos, claiming the Lord sent it as a treat, and then ordered everyone to line up if they wanted some. Turns out a ton of people did, and Ramsay practically beamed when he saw it. He told himself they'd really done it, win in the books, and those smiles still burning on their faces. His hand was still trembling. This wasn't just any fight, it was his very first battle. The fights hit way harder than he ever imagined, shattering everything he'd known from his calm, peaceful old life. But from here on out, he couldn't slow down. He had to keep battling to defend this land, because as the Lord, that duty was in his blood. Right then, Johnny stumbled in, so drunk he could barely stand. He told Ramsay he was genuinely grateful for the kavas, and Ramsay snapped back that it all happened because of his own hard work. Johnny promised he'd keep pushing himself every single day, and Ramsay leaned in and told him to have a blast. Then Johnny shot back, asking if he was about to get drunk. Ramsay shut it down, warning that a brutal mountain of tasks was already waiting for him. He stormed back to his office, scanned the pile of tasks, and first on the list was inspecting the mountain land he'd just bought. He shoved the job onto Rogers and the logging crew, then realized they had to start planting crops, like right away. Since finding steady food was a nightmare, he pushed for a massive granary, and insisted they train the soldiers for whatever comes next. Right then, Danny burst in and demanded to know if he was still working on a day like that. Danny slid a drink toward Ramsay, like a move that could change the whole vibe. He called it a victory celebration, so he pushed for a drink with everyone. Ramsay nodded, then dove straight into the drinking. Danny let out a breath of relief because they finally made it through. Ramsay nodded, admitting they truly had, then said he owed Danny everything. Danny barked stop and told him we're right there almost. Both of them leaned to the window and gasped. Every single citizen looked thrilled and smiling in the streets. Danny admitted it crushed them, but he was still so relieved they'd fought through it. Ramsay nodded in agreement, and Danny was gone in a flash, telling him, "Catch up with me later." Ramsay practically beamed when Danny finally showed up to check on him. He turned to the window and spotted two kids singing their hearts out, waving like they'd just spotted him. He promised they'd give it everything and fight to protect that view for the future. On April 21st, Ramsay was ready to storm out, turning to Veronica and asking, "Are you ready?" She told him they'd hauled in 6 barrels of kvass, and her men were already geared up and waiting to escort them. Ramsay thanked her and she shot back, "So that's it, are we seriously done heading to Hendo's?" Ramsay shot it down and insisted, "We greet Daryl first." Ramsay stormed up to Hendrik's mansion and Daryl came in hot and greeted him. Ramsay slapped him on the back and shouted congratulations for the win. Daryl told Ramsay it was all because of his hustle, and Ramsay blushed at how kind Daryl made it sound. He told Daryl, "I have to go, I've got stuff I need to handle," and cut the conversation short. Just as he was on the verge of walking out the door, Daryl grabbed his attention and told him to swing by again that night, and Ramsay just stood there, completely thrown off. Veronica was waiting outside, and when he showed up, she greeted him like she'd been expecting him all along. As they walked out, Veronica clocked the crowd swarming outside the mansion and snapped, "The Border Lord's estate is packed to the brim." Ramsay pointed out that after they won the war and carved up new lands, suddenly merchants and nobles were lining up to butter him up. He told Veronica he'd been ordered to stop by earlier, then leaned in and asked if she had any clue why. She told him she couldn't really put it into words. They stormed into Colin's trading company, and Ashley looked him dead in the eyes and nodded, like she finally got it. Ramsay snapped at him for being rude, and Ashley quickly apologized, then demanded to know what the heck was happening that day. Ramsay said he could take him with the wine they'd been making right there in their territory. Ashley snatched the bottle, took a sip, and tasted it for real. He leaned in and asked Ramsay what he thought the wine would fetch, and Ramsay shot back that it could sell for about 3 to 5 rubella. Ashley told him she figured it was about 3 rubella, so that meant they'd pay just 1 rubella per cup, like a steal. He noticed Ramsay rolling up with a giant barrel, then told him they could splash in some color and flip it for a cool $2,000 per barrel. Ramsay thought it over, then shut it down and said, "We're not cashing it out like last time." He leaned in and demanded to know if he'd got a loom for his livestock. Ashley nodded, grinning that they were set. She listed the prices. The loom for 3,000 rubella, the goats for 4,000, and the chickens for 3,000. Ramsay leaned in and pitched a crazy trade. Swap those 2 chickens and the loom for 4 barrels of wine. He caught himself thinking that trying to score a 1,000 rubella discount was pushing his luck. Ashley quizzed him about the other 2 barrels, and it totally caught Ramsay off guard. Ashley told him, "If you're really selling those other barrels, I'll trade you 1 loom and 1 rooster, plus 2 hens for good measure." So he could snag all 6. Ramsay nodded along, said it was the same amount, and then leaned in like, "Okay, but why?" Ashley admitted the quarter's sales numbers looked seriously bad. Ramsay heard him out and immediately locked in the deal, saying the price was totally fair. Ashley lit up, saying this would help them, then turned and left, promising he'd make arrangements immediately. Right then, Veronica slid up and whispered in Ramsay's ear, and it jolted him like a jump scare. He snapped at her not to whisper in his ear like that, and she immediately bowed her head and apologized. She asked, "Is this okay?" and admitted that if she'd bargained harder, she could have locked in way better terms. Ramsay nodded and said, "Yeah, that could be true," but he made it clear he'd bank on the Collins Trading Company going forward. So it was a real back and forth. Veronica nodded and said those ties with merchants were everything. Ashley showed up with an apology, admitting she'd kept them waiting. And they promised him, "You'll have everything sorted by tomorrow morning." Then added they'd descend over a few young, lively chickens to get things going. He told him swing by first, then head home. They took off and Ashley waved them off like, "See you." He told Veronica the soldiers traveling with them would get a free night, then leaned in and asked, "What about you?" She told him she'd be riding with him. After all, she was his bodyguard. And Ramsay clocked how her whole vibe had changed since she'd been a prisoner. He leaned in and asked if they should head back to the border lord's estate, praying they wouldn't slam him with some outrageous demands. He stormed up to the mansion and bam, found it packed wall to wall with people. Ramsay and Veronica both. Realizing it was a victory party, he froze. Like the whole room had just flipped, his fear switched to ON. He couldn't stop wondering what the border lord was thinking. Why would he invite someone like him to a gathering like this? He spotted a bunch of fancy, high-class folks chatting like they owned the world. Then Daryl swooped in and told him, "It's great to see you." He told him slow down, breathe in, and enjoy every second. Veronica felt uneasy, and she practically blurted to Ramsay that she wasn't used to places like that. Ramsay shoved a steaming hot dog into her mouth, and he told her he couldn't even guess what Daryl was really up to. But hey, it was a party, so they'd just have to roll with it. So stop fretting about what's around you. Just relax and savor that food like it's the best thing you'll ever taste. They stuffed themselves with food, laughing the whole time, and just when they were comfortable, boom, an announcement hit. They were about to hear a few words from Daryl. He strode onto the stage and thanked everyone for showing up, even though he was still new to all of this. Then he said his victory at Goda Plains belonged to every one of them, and to his amazing comrades standing right beside him. He told them he wanted to show his gratitude and thank them from the bottom of his heart. He first brought up Gilbert from the Berkeley family, claiming that he'd charged the front lines like a legend and cut down countless enemy soldiers. Then he stepped forward, thanked Oliver of the Lloyd family, and proudly said he'd seized control of logistics, handling supplies all the way from the back. And then he finally dropped Ramsay Bartlett's name, praising him as the real hero behind that victory. Ramsay's whole world jolted the moment they suddenly brought his name up. Daryl told them Ramsay had painted a brutally vivid picture of the whole battle, and without him, they never would have clinched the Goda Plain. Ramsay sat there squirming as Daryl demanded everyone shower him with the highest praise. Gilbert and Oliver roared with laughter, while Veronica sharply clapped for him. Then he called out, telling all 3 of them to step forward and onto the stage. They all jumped to it, and then out of nowhere, Ramsay's stomach flipped as the speech loomed. Gilbert and Oliver lit up the room with speeches that hit hard and left everyone fired up. When it was all over, Daryl leaned in and asked Ramsay if he could truly count on him. Ramsay told himself he just had to power through this quietly, No drama, no spotlight, just stay as forgettable as possible. He kicked off his speech and proudly introduced himself as Ramsay Bartlett. He declared this win wasn't just Duke Hendrix. It belonged to the Lords and to Gilbert and Oliver too. He swallowed his pride and begged forgiveness for what he couldn't pull off. Cummings told Daryl he'd go all in, sharpening his skills nonstop to help him even more. He pushed through the speech, then finally crashed, feeling sick and completely done. Veronica clocked it instantly. She rushed to the maid and said, "My lord isn't feeling well and I want to help." She asked, "Can we find a room somewhere, just anywhere?" and leaned in like it couldn't wait. And the maid ushers them into a private room just for them. Ramsay let out a soul-crushing sigh that sounded like it weighed a ton. Veronica looked totally lost, demanding to know how it could be bad that Duke Hendrik and all the other nobles were finally recognizing him. Ramsay blurted that at this exact moment, the royal family was tearing itself apart, half backing the Duke of Ignes, the other half siding with Prince Emel's faction. And the Duke of Ignes threw his full weight behind the Baron. So basically, he got forced to stand up in public and swear he was backing Baron Hendrik, putting himself firmly on the Duke's side. He said he never planned to take sides with either faction. He clocked it, whatever had happened was already done, and he couldn't help but think. He figured that if he wanted to stay balanced, he'd have to forge real connections with the prince's faction. At the crack of dawn, he stormed out of the mansion, so Anthony hurried over and demanded, "Are you really leaving this early?" Ramsay looked him in the eye and confirmed it, then thanked him like it meant the world for letting him crash the night. He demanded that he pass along his regards to Daryl. Anthony nodded like he got it, then told him to drop by any time he wanted, and he became their unstoppable, invaluable companion. Ramsay awkwardly blurted out a thank you, like the words got stuck in his throat. As they stepped out, Ashley popped up, greeted them with a grin and fired off the question, was he ready? And told him to yank it back immediately. Ramsay nodded in a hurry, admitted that place was terrifying, and insisted he wanted to get out right now. Ashley caught the vibe right away. This was about yesterday's victory party. Then he said it sounded like his lord was there too, and everybody was buzzing about Ramsay. They knew he was their guest, and panic already started ripping through them. Ramsay saw the town buzzing with rumors about him, and it was already everywhere. Ashley loaded up the cart with everything they'd promised and talked through, while Ramsay stewed in his head that they needed to push that territory as far as they could before any more trouble caught up with them. He fired a question at Veronica. What should they do to make the village grow and bring in more people? She couldn't stop thinking about it, and told them to push marriage like it was mandatory, or else go buy slaves. Ramsay finally clocked the truth. It all boiled down to one brutal thing: he had to start making money. On April 30th, Danny and Eric practically buzzed with excitement, because Ramsay was about to whip up a brand new drink. Ramsay leaned in and told them straight up that he wanted both of them to give it a shot. Eric leaned in and asked, "So, is it any different from Kavo's?" And Ramsay told them he was planning to brew something stronger than Kova's, so he brought them in to taste it first. Eric and Danny chugged down the glass, and the moment it hit, a sharp jolt ran through them. They leaned in and asked, "What is it then?" Ramsay leaned in and swore the drink was 10 times stronger than Kava's. They said he should have warned them first, and Eric shot back, "That drink is insane." And Danny admitted it was his first time ever trying it, then leaned in and asked what kind of drink it even was. Ramsay leaned in and told us it's called whiskey, made by fermenting processed rye, then distilled to yank the alcohol out. Danny finally figured it out. That's why Ramsay's been hauling copper and glasswork through town like he's got a secret mission. Ramsay demanded to know what it tasted like, and he grinned, "It's delicious." Eric lunged for one last glass, but Ramsay barreled in and kicked both of them out. They slammed on the door, begging for just one little sip. Ramsay realized the real issue wasn't the plan, it was the sheer amount. He hadn't even pulled out a single 120th of the mash he'd set up, and that's when the truth hit. He needed a faster, more efficient distillation method. Right then, Veronica shoved Eric and Danny aside, cutting them off fast. Ramsay got the message delivered. Baron Hendrik's messenger had finally arrived. The messenger stared straight at Ramsay and demanded, "Are you Lord Bartlett?" Ramsay nodded, and the messenger barked that it was a letter from Count Hendrik's office, then flung it at him like it couldn't wait, telling him to read it. The messenger bolted out the door, disappearing into the distance. Veronica snapped that the messenger was pure disrespect. He didn't even bother to dismount, so Ramsay shrugged and muttered that maybe he just didn't carry much authority. He tore open the letter and started reading, and Veronica shot back, "What does it say?" The second Ramsay finished reading, he snapped to Veronica and ordered her to crank up the training sessions starting right then. He leaned in and told her it's a summons letter. He got lifted straight up to the head of the Morris family, Morris von Dodd. A mysterious hooded man stepped up in the shadows and bowed, claiming he was honored to finally meet Count Morris. Then Morris grinned, called him Lord Licht, and pulled him in for a drink and a little chat. Lick shot that down, insisting he barely drank at all, and Morris kept pressing him like, "Come on, don't hold back." Just then, a stunning woman swooped in, snatched his drink, and grinned, "I'm taking my share." Morris praised her, saying she poured her liquor like a pro, then leaned in and asked her name. She flashed her name, Pamela, and told him it was an honor just to be near him. Morris was drunk and grinning as Pamela slid in beside him, cradled in his arms, soothing him, and then she asked if he'd finally made his decision. And Morris snapped that it was a brutal choice, and that he needed a little more time to think it through. Licht already knew that answer was coming, because it had been the same thing for ages. Pamela pleaded with him not to say it, and they both sat there on the edge of their seats craving his quick jump in. Morris opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. But Pamela cut him off mid-sentence, saying she needed to spell out clearly and carefully the real perks of joining them. She leaned close and breathed into his ear that she was his for the whole night. No rush, just time to savor every moment. Morris got completely flustered and blurted that they should talk all night long. Pamela and Licht slipped out of the room, and Pamela promised, "I'll catch up with you later." Once they slipped out of the room, Licht leaned in and apologized to her for putting her through all of that. Pamela called it the perfect match, then leaned in and demanded, "So tell me, have you seen those eyes?" And he'd already cut that distance in half, barged up, and demanded the guy get out, talking that clueless count into listening. Lichted in understood and told him, "I'll come back and report the count." Montmorris of the Madoc Kingdom had thrown his loyalty straight into the Pendura Empire. The scene snapped back to Ramsay, sprinting straight toward Daryl's residence. In the letter, Daryl went straight at Ramsay. Duke Ignace was panicking about his condition, so he decided to eliminate the traitor Morris. Morris wasn't just helping. He was secretly teaming up with the Pendura Empire to topple the state. He also wished that this guy would step up and team up with him as his commander. Ramsay rolled up at the mansion and ran into Daryl, ready to make those hard-won victories everybody's to share. Who would have guessed he'd show up to visit this soon, because it never once crossed his mind. Ramsay admitted he'd never once pictured getting a summons from him, never in a million years. Daryl burst into laughter, teased him with, "Are you surprised?" Then called him a full-on trickster, while Ramsay grinned and said it was an honor to witness this wild new side of him. Ramsay suddenly clocked it. This scheme had been cooking since that party, and he demanded point-blank when the deployment was finally set to happen. And Daryl told him this was happening in mid-May, and they'd send out 1,500 troops, fronted by the Jorg we already met before. Ramsay shot himself a hopeful thought. There was still time to get ready the right way. Then he pressed, "What about the other nobles?" And Daryl said Duke Ignace would show up. Count Ronald and Viscount Denny tagged along, and he swore that if it all went their way, Marquis Lure would push their numbers past 10,000 soldiers. He told Ramsay he'd be running under his orders, and Ramsay shot back, asking if anyone had rewards lined up. And yeah, he made it crystal clear. Those Count lands were getting wiped out, and the leftovers would be handed out by merit. Ramsay snapped that getting a chunk of land out on the far western edge wouldn't do him a bit of good. Daryl nodded like he got it, then promised he'd repay him, just not with money. But to make it happen, they had to go all in. He ordered him to ready 100 soldiers from the Bartlett territory. Ramsay's jaw dropped when Daryl said it again. Then Daryl ordered him to ready a full 100 soldiers. Then he'd hand him real authority and let him wield it. He recalled Veronica telling him she could rally around 50 troops instantly. He knew that doubling their troops within a month was a total impossibility. But it wasn't a matter of whether he could. He already knew Daryl needed him to make it happen. Ramsay pushed him to reach out to the Black Raven Guild, and Daryl nodded, then paused and said if he was really hiring mercenaries, this time it was his own money paying the price. Ramsay said he was in, and as he spoke he caught himself thinking, war costs everything and I never thought I'd feel it like this. Daryl leaned in and promised, "I'll tell you where our base is." He scribbled directions on a paper, then leaned in and said, "I really hope I talked my way through that negotiation." After a bit, Ramsay finally reached the spot, and there it was. A massive door looming in front of him. He told himself places like this always draw in shady troublemakers, but he couldn't afford to be choosy. He pushed inside and watched Hawk wipe the glasses, like he was ready for whatever came next. He clocked Ramsay the second he showed up and broke into a warm welcome. Ramsay leaned in and demanded to know what he was doing, and Hawk leaned in and told him, "This is the spot where I run my bar." Hawk leaned in, asked if he had something for him, and then motioned him to take a seat. And he'd go grab him some milk. Ramsay downed his drink, then leaned in and told him he was back. He wanted the Black Raven Guild's help again. Hawk snapped, "What now?" and Ramsay thrust the letter into his hands. Hawk skimmed the note and immediately understood. The Duke himself had personally demanded Ramsay. Ramsay leaned in and ordered him to line up 100 soldiers, ready for anything. And Hawk straight up said that was a whole lot, and paying for all of them would hit your wallet hard. Ramsay said he'd figured it out, and that he had to grab 70 of them from the Black Raven Guild. He mulled it over for a while, like the answer wouldn't come easy, and claimed it was about 100 rubles per person. Ramsay figured it'd cost 7,000 rubara and shot back, "When do you want me to bring it?" Hawk told him to chill, no need to sprint, then asked if they could see whether he could pull together those numbers. He promised, "I'll reach out in a few days, then you can come to me." He yanked him out of the bar like he was nothing. Ramsay stared at the dead end, knew he couldn't do anything else, turned to head back, then suddenly realized he had to reach Ashley. When he finally made it back, he realized the truth fast. Money was gone and he had nothing left. He got handed a massive 50,000 rubara straight from the Duke himself. After taking in Veronica and her soldiers, he also paid Hawk's mercenary fees and loaded up Ashley's troop with the gear they needed. It cost 300 rubara just for one person. With everything tallied up, his money had sunk to under half, and he had to rip up the production plan in that territory and redo it fast. Right then, bam, a knock slammed against the door and it was Veronica. She said that the moment she stepped back inside, he shut the door, locked himself away, and demanded updates on the deployment status. Ramsay leaned in and told her they had to send 100 troops to march straight into Count Morris territory by mid-May. Veronica's jaw dropped at that and she said, "That's way too much. If you're a Viscount, even 20 would have been plenty." She pressed him, demanding to know how he ever planned to pull off gathering a crowd that big. He told her he couldn't handle it alone, so he went straight to the Black Raven Guild and had them build it. The second Ramsay said it, a switch flipped in his brain. He snapped his hand up to his face and blurted that he'd been played, and that's exactly why. He dropped his head in pure disappointment, and Veronica leaned in, asking what he meant. Ramsay told her he found it straight up weird to hand over 50,000 rubara up front, and they forked over that massive fortune just to turn him into their plaything, slam down his escape route, and drag him straight onto the battlefield. So of course he had to lean on the mercenaries. He just knew the Black Raven Guild would hand the Duke back a chunk of that money. Ramsay clocked it immediately. This whole thing was a setup from the very beginning. He slammed on the brakes right there. He snapped that there was no point wallowing, then leaned toward Veronica and told her he ordered the Black Raven Guild to send 70 members. Veronica nodded and told them to pick the 30 who would go deploy. Ramsay then leaned in and told her that she and Danny were on standby. She froze in total disbelief and blurted, "Why?" He told her, "I need both of us to hold this territory, so I'll lead the troops." Veronica asked if something happened to him, but Ramsay snapped her words away and told her they had to make sure it never did. Then he shoved the job in her hands. She had to run the troop selection and forge the training. After a brief pause, she finally nodded and told him to hand it over to her. She stormed off in a blaze of anger, and Ramsay stared at them, puzzled, wondering how they were supposed to pull off their next move. It was May 17th and Hawk finally locked eyes with Ramsay, asking whether the Lord himself would march at their head. And when Ramsay answered, it was clear, get in, because this was the kind of side you wanted to bet on to win. As Duke Ignaz's anti-imperial army surged in at around 10,000 strong. Meanwhile, the Count's side was getting crushed by a brutal 1,000 troop deficit. Hawks nodded and said he was in, but they couldn't spot the Empire's next move, and now the big question burned in their minds. Would they rush in and back Count Morris? And they could already be racing against reinforcements converging from every side. Ramsay didn't have a clue what to do next. Daryl then spotted Ramsay, lit up, and thanked him for showing up, telling him how much he truly appreciated it. Ramsay and Hawk dropped to their knees and bowed before him. Daryl told everyone that his Hendrik border army rolled out west just 2 days ago. Ramsay promised they'd decrush the traitors for good, then he shoved himself to his feet, saying the Bartlett troop would set the whole place ablaze. The army surged forward, boots pounding the ground like war itself was coming alive. Hawk said they had to link up with General Jorg first. No delays. Like they were racing straight down this road, they'd reach the Count's territory in no time, so he turned to Ramsay and demanded, "Did you prep a horse?" And he snapped that he didn't have that kind of money. Because of some seriously slick scheming, Hawk broke into laughter and fired back, "What are you even talking about?" Ramsay shoved that thought aside for the moment and leaned in to demand answers, asking him right then. Ramsay told him the smartest play was simple. The safest route and the one that would pay the most was to choose. Then Hawk cut him off, snapping that it wasn't justice at all. It was looting every nearby town and village. Ramsay already knew that that's exactly how it would spiral into a full-on battle, so he didn't bring Danny or Veronica. After that last battle, Danny was totally drained, and you could tell it was because this kind of brutal fighting just wrecked him. Hawk nodded to the plan, then demanded, "So how do we hit it?" because if they just kept striking however they wanted, his reputation would get crushed. Ramsay admitted he didn't even have names for every noble tangled in this war. But if their pride was sky high, nobody in the world would dare take that role. He said, if they're forcing you to do this, and this is just what you were told to do, then maybe you can twist the order. Hawk nodded, saying, from where I stand, this screams victory. But those lords are going to swarm the main camp the second they smell glory. He clapped Ramsay on the back and told him to hit first, hard and fast. Ramsay argued that even while serving the border duke, they deserved the clout to act like independent forces. So they'd have to strong-arm the general until he finally caved and agreed. Right then an idea sparked in his head and he immediately leaned toward Hawk like, yo, do you have a map? Hawk shoved the map into his hands and demanded to know, was he planning something? Ramsay didn't just say it, he confirmed it for real, urging them to slam the brakes on merging with the border duke's army. Hawk shot the duke's order a worried look and asked, are you sure this is really okay? Ramsay said they'd been dealing with it for far too long, and now it was time to hit back and settle the score. At the front lines, Hendrik's general boiled with rage, snapping, what the hell was the Bartlett army doing out there? He and the other viscounts were already there, waiting in the shadows, and one of them muttered that maybe they never should have summoned them for this battle. Someone even dared to ask, if they were fresh to the camp along the frontier, could they really round up enough soldiers to stand their ground? Somebody else swore they'd been hearing praise at the victory party earlier and pressed him. Tell me you didn't start getting overconfident, did you? Right then, a messenger burst into the tent, telling them a message had just landed from Lord Ramsay. The general clocked the messenger's Bartlett crest and smugly decided they could afford to gear up. He grabbed the messenger and demanded to know where the Lord was, but it looked like their meeting got pushed back. The messenger crumpled onto one knee and blurted, I'm here to report that his lord was getting slammed right now by Count Morris's forces. The general's jaw dropped the moment he heard it. And just like that, the Viscount got rattled and straight up panicked, claiming they were destined to take that battle. The general barked at them to calm down, then snapped at the messenger to race back and report every detail of what just happened. Right now. The messenger burst in and told him their army had already slipped out of the frontier count's lands, marching straight toward them. Just as they got close to the count's domain, volunteers from the Mode and Ryle villages sprang the ambush on them. He shouted that his lord was striking back, and then he swore he'd seize those villages next. The general ordered his troops forward first, and promised that once they were finished, he'd pull them right into his ranks. The messenger blurted out that his lord was marching on the northern village to seize the city of Forte, and the general froze in shock. The viscounts huddled together and whispered it back and forth. Forte was the second biggest city in the count's domain, and with over 1,000 people packed inside, Ramsay's army couldn't possibly tear it down. The general demanded proof, and the messenger nodded and said, yeah, that's exactly how it is. People just shook their heads and said, yeah, that plan won't work. Their forces were going to struggle, so he ordered the messenger to tell his lord, grab only those 2 villages, then regroup early. Then the messenger leaned in and shouted that his lord had ordered 100 troops, and that he'd been handed the right to lead an independent detachment from the frontier count. With the general's power behind him, he declared that taking down traitor Morris would be a breeze, and he desperately wanted backup from the rear. The viscounts went speechless when they heard Ramsay rolled in with a full 100 soldiers. They only had about 20 to 50 of them, and they still couldn't believe a lowly minor noble managed to amass that many. He couldn't shake the gut feeling that this mess was going to explode into trouble. He wasn't just tossing around nonsense you couldn't discuss without the Lord there. Lord Darrell backed it with his own endorsement. The general said, I get it, and ordered the messenger to expect greatness, because he was betting his future on it. The messenger bolted out, and one of the viscounts snapped, asking if he was really going to let them run wild. The general told him it didn't matter whether Bartlett's army showed up or not, because the battle would play out the same either way. He told them to leave too. Then he linked up with Duke Ignace. Bam, their forces were won, and ordered everyone to gear up for the march. Then the whole scene snapped over to Pamela and Morris, like the story just changed lanes mid-chase. Morris was curled up under his blanket on the bed, and Pamela stared at him like, seriously, how long are you going to stay there while the sun's already blazing overhead? Morris was shaking with fear, blurting that a huge army was closing in on them. Pamela leaned in and told him, you're gonna be okay, trust me. With the count surrounded by a whole crew of skilled, ready-to-action subordinates, she clamped her hand on his face and blurted, the Empire's reinforcements are here. Morris smiled at that, and the moment his mood lifted, everything felt brighter. Pamela brushed off his worry and told him to drop it, then pushed the idea that they should keep playing a little longer. They kicked things off with a bunch of moves, and outside the room, 2 guards stood watch, one licking and the other eyeing Percy like he was already theirs. Percy snapped that he didn't want to be under that man's thumb, not even for a little while. Lick snapped at him to knock it off, because saying that was part of the job. Percy nodded and fired back, yeah, I've got a point. Licks told them to crank it up and give it even more effort. Just then an old man snapped to his ministers and ordered them to strike right now. Like, right this second. It felt pointless to stay put when there wasn't a single shred of hope that anyone would ever come to help. The minister snapped at everyone, hang in there. The Empire's reinforcements are coming fast. Then he ordered his guard to harden the defenses right away. One guy spotted Percy and Licked it, and demanded to know if the Empire would send reinforcements. Percy and Licked locked eyes like they just hit the same nerve. And Lick leaned in and said, yeah, obviously, because right now the Empire was busy gearing up its troops. So it was safe to lock it down and fortify the place. The man's eyes lit up hearing that, and he snapped to his guard to fortify the business immediately. Percy and Licked locked eyes and grinned at each other like they'd just won a secret victory. At the magic royal castle, the spellbound drama was about to blow wide open, because something huge was coming and everyone could feel it. Crown Prince Emel of the Magic Kingdom warned, don't send reinforcements. So negotiations were the smartest move. His ministers pleaded, will you really turn your back on Count Morris? He shares our ideals. Emel declared that Count Morris and Duke Ignes were lifeblood to their people, then snapped, so tell me, who actually wins from the bloodshed? He told himself it was the Empire, so they had to stop it. No way were they letting that spark ignite into a full-blown conflict. His minister told him they got his intentions, then pressed him hard. So how are you planning to answer? And they vowed to snatch every last inch of Count Morris lands, then carve them up and hand them over to Duke Ignes and the rest. The ministers froze in disbelief, shouting that this move only fueled the anti-Empire crew, and warned that if they didn't stand firm, it would teach everyone the wrong lesson. And if it kept going like that, someone would storm the throne and usurp it. They argued this was the moment to break them and teach a lesson using the Empire's full might, or go all in and wipe Ignes's faction off the map completely. Emil locked eyes on it, and he told himself with zero doubt that the throne didn't interest him at all. He just wanted one thing, a peaceful life with his wife and their kids, where joy never ends. Fresh, more troublesome sparks burst into the air, but he still knew that meeting would drag on with nothing decided. Just him clinging to his own skin, waiting for self-preservation to take over. The story cuts to Ramsay and Hawk, crouched in the bushes, holding their breath and waiting to strike. He grabbed Hawk and demanded to know how big the village was. And Hawk was like, yeah, we're down at the lower end of the spectrum. And he swore it wouldn't be a problem with that many people. He told Ramsay he'd nailed it, making it look like the village was the first to attack. So they rolled in, seized the nearby villages, and used justice as a disguise to plunder everything. Ramsay said teaming up with the main force wouldn't earn them any real glory. And honestly, they weren't expecting much from those guys in the first place. So it was way safer to move on your own and grab the money straight from the source. He told them to stick to the plan, and Hawk hit back, saying he'd got his back. The villagers bolted into a full sprint, like hawked terror was chasing them. He ordered the soldiers to rip the village clean for every last supply. And he told the villagers to pack into one spot. No panic, no fear. Because if they held their ground and didn't fight back, he promised they'd all be free. Ramsay told himself he'd have to play this game smart and move with precision or risk wrecking Bartlett's reputation. Their game plan was brutal. Send the Black Heron gang and Bartlett's forces to circle the village from the flanks, then snatch hostages to scare the villagers into surrender. Meanwhile, the Black Heron gang swept into the village and hauled away every last treasure and supply. They only grabbed enough food to get the march going, then the rest was shipped straight to Bartlett's territory. They piled 4 battle-trained soldiers onto a single cart and sent everyone else back who wasn't used to fighting. Then the villagers gathered in the square, and Ramsay's speech was the final spark that set everything off. He threw his apology out with a deep bow, and the villagers instantly gasped at what he'd done. He told them he hated getting this rough, but when Baron Hendrik gave the order, he couldn't refuse. But he refused to hurt a single one of them. He ordered them straight to Count Morris, warning that the other villages weren't safe. Then he bowed his head and apologized all over again. The villagers couldn't stop whispering, was the Baron behind it all? So they all agreed to march straight to Count Morris. Hawks caught it and immediately told Ramsay, nice performance, so you're an actor, huh? He went to Ramsay and asked him once Rose Village was taken, what came next? And was he truly setting his sights on Forte? Ramsay pondered it, then Hawk snapped that the tactics were his to run, so he wouldn't mess with his carefully planned strategy. Ramsay shot him a grateful nod and told him, come on, we've got to move on. Now it's the 21st of May. Out in the west of the Kingdom of Maguk, right in Count Morris's territory, where the story kicks off at. Just like the plan promised, 10,000 anti-imperial fighters poured in and gathered in one place. Prince Ignaz stood right at the front, taking the lead and driving the army forward. He fired off his VI counts, counting them again and again. He told them right there, "Thank you for showing up," and made sure they knew he meant it. He told them they had to have heard the rumor. Count Morris was secretly working with the Empire. Even after multiple chances to explain, Count Morris didn't just brush them off. He doubled down and started packing his forces. He snapped that they couldn't let this keep dragging on and they had to band together and weld this nation into one. Because it was tearing itself apart from the inside and getting crushed from the outside, and they couldn't waste a second. They were going to cut down Count Morris right here, right now, and every single person in that room agreed. And a man named Rossi stepped forward and demanded they cut the chatter and go straight to the military council. He leaned in and warned them the enemy had around 2,000 soldiers, and they were already bracing up to fortify. Morris was banking on the Empire's reinforcements, but he warned, "We have to crush them before help even shows up." One of the counts leaned in and demanded, "Do we smash with an all-out attack right now?" Rossi warned him that the Empire was lurking behind the curtain, and that this move would wreck them unless they cut their losses fast. Another count leaned in and demanded, "So what do we do?" Rossi opened her mouth to speak, but a soldier cut right in and who told them a messenger had come just to speak with General Jorg. Jorg hesitated to let the messenger in on this crucial meeting, but Rossi shot back that it was totally fine. Maybe it was urgent. The messenger burst in panting and breathless, and Jorg clocked him instantly as Bartlett's messenger, and he demanded to know what he was sent to deliver. Because then he asked him what he wanted, and the messenger burst in, saying he'd brought a report from Lord Ramsay. And just like they planned, they hit Maud and Rose village hard. But the villagers had already fled straight to Murija Castle. George went wide-eyed at it, and in his head he blurted, "In battle, this kind of chaos is basically the rule." And he let them slip right through his fingers. Then he grabbed the messenger and demanded, "Why didn't you capture the villagers?" and insisted that hauling villagers into Morris's castle only made the enemy stronger. The messenger told him they didn't catch them because supplies were running dangerously low. George then snapped that they should have just wiped every last one of them out, and demanded to know why he'd ever let them slip over to Morris's side. The messenger swore his lord was convinced taking the castle was the move that would pay off the most. Jorg froze, completely baffled by what he just saw. Rossi leaned in and grilled the messenger. Did his lord really say that, or was he messing with her? The messenger swore it was true, saying they'd keep sweeping up the nearby villages, then haul the villagers straight to the castle. Rosie snapped the messenger off then before he could leave, made him say her lord's name. He leaned in and told them, "My lord is Ramsay Bartlett, the Viscount serving under Baron Darrell von Hendricks." Ignaz praised the messenger for a job well done and ordered him to get out and go. Rosie couldn't stop thinking about why he didn't wipe out the villagers and ship them straight to the enemy's castle. If they twisted it to their advantage. So yeah, this wasn't a raid for show. They were gearing up for a full-on siege. Rossi fired up the crowd and declared that to break Count Morris Castle, they had to encircle it and lay siege. Everyone's jaws dropped at what just happened, and one of the counts snapped that he wouldn't go along with it. Because they weren't some run-of-the-mill lowborn, they were the real-deal nobles, drenched in tradition, prestige, and status. So in a battle that ugly, their pride would get shredded, and their dignity would be left in the dirt. Rossi heard it and shot back to himself that the nobles' duties were nothing at all. And yeah, the truth still hit hard. Someone had to take control and govern the territory. He knew they had to put their pride on a throne, even if it meant ditching practicality. Ignaz pressed Rossi for another option. Rossi fired up the crowd, telling them to push through right now before the Imperial army could link up with them. He told the crowd, "If this is done, then move. Hurry up, gear yourselves, and get ready to charge west." Ignaz spotted Rossi lost in thought and snapped, "Hey, what's wrong?" And if something was raging in his head. Rossi told him that Viscount Ramsay Bartlett's battlefield genius and meticulous groundwork were all because of him, and it was something to behold. Was a weirdly intriguing. The moment snapped over to Hawk and Ramsay, and Hawk leaned in, grilling him on what their next move was. They'd already wiped out almost every village, so the only one left standing nearby was Forte. Ramsay nodded and admitted they were getting crushed on manpower, because they didn't have enough troops left to haul the seized supplies. Ramsay told them to act like they were closing in on Forte while they waited. Hawk leaned in and asked if they could pull it off, because with this many people, there was simply no way to box them in. Right then, a soldier barreled up to Ramsay and told him, "We're not there yet, but we're getting closer and you need to keep pushing." But a tiny cavalry squad was barreling toward them, and nobody knew who they belonged to. Ramsay and Hawk froze in shock, and Hawk snapped to his guards, ordering them to swarm up and get ready to intercept. Ramsay couldn't stop asking himself, was that tiny unit lurking out there to scout or to slip back with a message? Right as the unit rolled in, Hawk cut them off and demanded, "Who's your commanding officer?" One of the guys from the unit barked that they were General Jorg's messengers, sent by Baron Hendrik's own representative. They demanded to know if they were the army of Ramsay. Ramsay doubled down and confirmed it himself, because of course he did, saying, "I'm Ramsay." The messenger's eyes went wide when he spotted him. Then he hurriedly apologized for trying to talk to him from horseback, and told him the general had called for a meeting, so he needed to bolt, regroup at the main camp, and not waste a second. They told him the main camp was southwest from that spot. They said their goodbyes and Ramsay leaned into hawk-like, "So what do you think?" He said the moment they recognized the independent cavalry, they immediately called everyone together for a meeting. He couldn't understand why, but he knew they had no choice but to go. He roared to his soldiers, "The brakes done, gear up, we're moving out." Ramsay couldn't stop wondering, had the whole battle shifted again? After what felt like forever, he finally burst into the main camp. And Hawk took one look around, so many soldiers and civilians packed the place. Then he said the scale was downright impressive. A guard barged in and demanded to know if Lord Bartlett was there. Ramsay even confirmed it himself, straight up saying, "I'm Ramsay." Ramsay clocked how polished that guard looked and a chill hit him. Was this elite detail from some higher noble? Then the guard's eyes widened when he spotted Ramsay. Then they told him Duke Ignaz wanted him there, and to follow right after him. Ramsay's jaw dropped when he heard the Duke was actually there. The Duke leaned in and promised Ramsay he'd hand the army over to him. Then Hawk, still stunned the Duke had shown up, pushed Ramsay forward and told him to go on. After a bit they finally reached a tent, and the guard blurted out who he was, apologized for barging in, and proudly announced he'd brought Lord Bartlett along. The guard shoved Ramsay toward the door, and the Duke's presence alone made it clear he had no choice. Ramsay dropped to his knees and shot out, "I'm Ramsay," then admitted he'd heard they needed him, so he sprinted over as fast as he could. Ignaz told him to drop the act and finally relax, saying he didn't need to stay so stiff anymore. He said the business guy wasn't him at all, it was Rosi. Rosi stepped forward and claimed he was an aide to the Duke. He leaned in and told Ramsay, "I've got a bunch of questions I need answers to." He just had to give an answer. Ignaz was a good-hearted man and small stuff wouldn't set him off. He demanded to know why his army slaughtered those villages, and Ramsay said it was just a calculated strike. Nothing more than a move to crush the enemy's power. Rosie agreed. He said wiping out the villagers and crashing production was one move, then snapped, "So why did you let them slip away?" Ramsay basically told them, "Yeah, we've got our fights, but you're still under the same kingdom." And with the huge gap in troop numbers, he declared the win was a done deal, yet slaughtering them anyway only made it feel cold and cruel. Rosie shot the question back. Why didn't he just enslave them and rake in cash, killing two birds with one stone? Ramsay snapped that his army didn't have the supplies to haul slaves back, so it was a brutal call. But they decided it was still better to let them live. Rosi told him to drop it right there. But yeah, it turns out it didn't go his way at all, and the whole thing spiraled into a full-on siege. Ramsay pressed him, demanding to know what he was really trying to say. Rossi snapped that he was being fake, then admitted he'd already sent villagers to Morija Castle, trying to burn through the food, because he expected Duke Morris to march straight into the siege. Rosi flashed a smile and said, "It's done, so it's done," and he told everyone that for tomorrow's siege, he wanted to hear every one of his suggestions. Ramsay shot back, "So what else are we supposed to do? If the troops are different, shouldn't we hit them hard and charge straight in?" Rosi warned them that doing that would only crank their damage even higher. And he was determined to come out on top, even if it meant cutting down every loss along the way. Ramsay muttered to himself that he'd said it, but the truth was brutal. None of them had any military training at all. Ramsay said this was only one example, then lined in and hinted at something else. After they kept chatting for a while, he finally stormed out. Ignaz leaned in and grilled Rossi about the strategy, and Rossi didn't hold back. He said it had potential, sure, but it still needed sharpening, even if the overall direction was on the right track. He kept insisting that, for a country lord, Ramsay was freakishly capable, and he fully expected Baron Hendrik to roll out some seriously top-tier masterpieces. Ignis said it downright wasn't fun getting brand-new toys shoved in front of her, and maybe he should stamp his own mark on it too. It was May 23rd, right at that exact moment, and Morris was drowning in stress. He yanked Pamela closer and demanded to know where the reinforcements were, because if they weren't coming, someone was lying. She told him she'd look into it, then she took off, leaving him standing there. Rage flooded the room. She stormed into the room, locked eyes with Percy and shot out, "Good job." Pamela demanded where Licht was and she told her she'd hooked him into helping the soldiers. Pamela sat down and shot a question, was it time to leave this place? Percy leaned in and told her that she and Licht had been talking, right then, about sneaking out that very night. Pamela froze at that, then blurted that she'd never heard a thing about it. Percy said it was only because she hadn't been told, and then he pushed her to give it her all. Pamela blew up, yelling that they needed to round up those jewels and make the Count pay for what he'd done. Just then, Licht burst into the room, and the look on his face screamed trouble. Pamela let out a relieved breath and told him she was just happy he was safe. And Percy lined in and demanded to know what was eating him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. He said that even with dusk crawling in, the Een troops showed absolutely zero signs of backing off. And somehow they kept slamming the gates again and again, with no arrows to speak of. Pamela snapped that it was faster to smash the gates apart. With that many of them, they should be swarming straight for the castle gates. They said the odds were brutal, numbers stacked against them. Yet somehow those gates stayed shut and unbreached, because they were running with far too few soldiers. It felt like they never even planned to take the castle. Percy said they had to be scared of the Empire's reinforcements, because if the Empire was coming, they'd strike even if they stayed trapped there. Licht lined in and demanded, "Are you really telling the truth?" Pamela said she didn't care one bit about their plans, and bluntly asked Licht how they were getting out of there. Licht shouted that enemies were everywhere and the battle was tearing through the chaos, so they had no choice. He had to vanish in plain sight by blending in with the townsfolk and slipping away. He said that, thank goodness, a bunch of villagers had somehow managed to take refuge inside that castle. Percy insisted they had no other option at all. Pamela told them, "I'll pack everything fast," and she ordered them to wait right there for her. Licht couldn't stop wondering what Duke's army was up to, and he realized the kingdom had a real mastermind on their side, someone crafty, because they were carefully grinding them down without ever letting the fighting spiral out of control. It was May 24th. And Lord Douglas and Lord Dobie were locked in an intense talk about the battle. Douglas warned that the anti-Empire forces hammered them day and night, and even with their troops split in groups, they couldn't catch a single real break. He snapped that the real problem was the arrows. Too many were being burned up way too fast, and without the right ammo, they were getting wiped out. He snapped to his soldiers, asking if they had spotted Licht and Percy yet, and every one of them shook their heads denying it. Dobie snapped at him like, "That's enough, stop right now," swearing the Empire had them boxed in from the very start. They had zero plans to send reinforcements, just used the kingdom like a game piece, draining it down to nothing. He told them, "From this moment on, you've got to think about the future." Since reinforcements weren't coming, surrender started looking like the only move. So he turned to Douglas and asked what he thought. And he warned them, if they surrendered, every last one of them would be executed. So they clenched their fists and fought to the bitter end like true warriors. Dobie said they could pull it off. Then he admitted they'd be dragging the townsfolk and soldiers into the mess, too. Douglas warned, if this keeps going, the townspeople will be chained into slavery. So they have to clash and force better terms for peace. Just then, a soldier burst in and told Douglas the enemy was cranking up their attack. So someone had to grab the reins and lead from the front lines. Douglas blurted that he'd step up, then vanished into the next move. Dobie muttered to himself that as a general, they couldn't afford to misread the perfect moment to pull back. He stormed into the room where Morris was. Morris huddled under the blanket, trembling like he couldn't stand the thought of facing what waited out there. Dobie leaned in and told him to give up, because the Empire wasn't sending reinforcements, and they had zero chance of winning. Morris snapped, refusing outright, and demanded to know where Pamela was. Dobie yanked Morris in close and then slammed a hard slap across his face, shouting at him to wake up, because the war was raging in the middle of the night. He told him Pamela was gone and the Empire had used them, like tools then discarded. Morris finally understood what went down, and he just crumpled there, crushed by disappointment and betrayal. The story snapped over to Ignaz and Rosie, and Ignaz leaned in, demanding to know what was going on. She told him it had only been 2 days, but the exhaustion was already crawling across her face, and she insisted that give it 2 or 3 more days and they'd storm that castle without breaking a sweat. Ignaz told him that meant Ramsay's plan had totally worked. Then a flashback hit Rosie and Ramsay's conversation, where Ramsay pushed the idea to run the army in 3 shifts. He explained they decut the army into 3, rotate the troops non-stop, slash their losses, and keep the attacks hammering day and night. And on top of that, they were laying waste without a single arrow. While in the middle of a siege, reloading with new weapons was brutal. So if they didn't keep firing arrows, their supply would dry up in just a few days. Ramsay told them to soften their attacks for the first 2 days, so they'd cut the damage on both sides and slowly grind the enemy down. Back in the present, Rosie snapped that they'd have to fire arrows and press the enemy hard at the wall. And honestly, shooting arrows with the tops cut off worked like a charm. If they kept that up for 2 or 3 more days, they'd better hold the line, because once the soldiers start wavering, everything falls apart. Right then, a guard burst into the tent, breathless and moving like he was running out of time, and said the enemy was cracking, like they were ready to throw in the towel. This blew Agnes' mind and after a while, Ignes and the other lords were lolling there, just sitting and waiting. Count Maurice von Dodd and his crew were dragged in, bound up tight and restrained at every move. He dropped to his knees, like the world just demanded it. And Ignes demanded to know what snapped the situation, what happened that suddenly flipped their hearts. Maurice looked at him and basically said, "There's no way we win, so I can't keep hurting people for nothing," then added, "If I can save my own life for this, then losing my head is a small price to pay." He and Ian fired up their plan to stare. Ian said he was done talking, he wouldn't say another word. With that decision sealed, he swore to protect every soldier and every townsfolk, and promised they'd never be dragged into slavery. Maurice looked him dead in the eyes, swore he had no regrets, and demanded he behead him. Ignes snapped a command, signaling his soldiers. He yanked his sword free and swung in one razor-fast strike, beheading Maurice and ending him for good. Then he swept a cloak over his body. Ignes then grilled Douglas and Dobie, demanding to know exactly what was going down in the Count's territory. Dobie said he wasn't looking for excuses at all, because in the end it was their fault. But they were nothing more than puppets, dancing to the Empire's every command. Dobie laid out the whole story to him, and at first they pushed Lord Maurice to marry and they swore they'd deliver a noble-born daughter. Even though he was into it for a moment, the one thing he waited for never showed up. His bride never arrived. They tossed out believable reasons for picking a bride for the Count's house. But the truth was, there was never a real plan at all. 2 imperial generals were dispatched in secret, disguised as protectors to get close. Believing their promises of full support, they raised their bows and aimed at the prince like they were ready to end him. But the second the battle erupted, those generals were nowhere to be found, and not a single body turned up. So he shrugged and said they'd probably bolted the moment they sensed the castle was about to collapse. They finally understood they'd walked straight into the Empire's trap, and with no reinforcements showing up, surrender was the only move left. He told him that Lord Maurice regretted it so deeply it hurt, and he couldn't shake the regret of trusting the Empire's sweet lies, only to unleash needless suffering on his soldiers and helpless citizens. So there was no way out. He had to offer his head and beg for mercy for the citizens. Ramsay heard it and immediately thought, they infiltrated, so why did those generals back off so easily? And it lit a fire in him as he wondered what the Empire really wanted, and whether they were just trying to plunge the kingdom into chaos. Dobie shot back, asking who cooked up this plan, and whether the rumors were true that Rossi was the mastermind behind it. Rossi leaned in and demanded to know what strategy, and then what. And Dobie leaned in and told her he'd spent every single day and night talking about that seat getting attacked, until it finally broke him down. And those tipless arrows kept getting on his nerves, over and over. Rossi got his point across and jabbed a finger at Ramsay. Ramsay froze, stunned. Everyone around them whispered the same thing. He's just a kid, but his idea is straight up brilliant. Ramsay couldn't shake the question of why she'd singled him out. Rossi clapped sharply to shut everyone up, then snapped that it was time to move on to the next matter. Ian promised he'd reveal what happens to Lords Dobie and Douglas in a moment, then barked at his guards to drag them away. Then he turned to the crowd and declared, "All right, next up, rewards and honors." And he promised the first award in this campaign would go to General Jorg, like the fateful words had to reach him right now. The whole room erupted in applause, and Ramsay's gut told him this wasn't the finale. It was a setup. And in the end, in that whole operation, nobody ever really stole the spotlight. Even if they scraped together the council, the money, and the men, those lives lost in the march won't return. And sure enough, the most powerful nobles would still get the real rewards. After a while, Ian stepped forward and announced he'd wrapped up the rewards and honors. Then he told everyone point blank that they absolutely crushed it. As everyone started to drift out, Rosie snapped Ramsay's name, then she cut him off. And he thanked him for going all out this time. Ramsay leaned in and told her he genuinely valued her kind words. Rosie leaned in and told him Ignes promised him a reward too, then ordered him to follow her, no questions asked. Ramsay blinked in shock, then rushed after her to go meet Ignes. Ignes grabbed his gratitude and told him straight up that it was his strategy that made the win feel effortless. Ramsay grinned and said he felt genuinely honored by every word. Ignes said he wanted to honor him with a reward. But here's the problem, Bartlett had no land to offer. So instead he shoved him a bag of gold and called it a deal. Ramsay's heart sank at this, but he forced himself to accept it. He sat there thinking, to the north lay the Hendrik March, so no land was coming for them. Only the eastern royal domain could be claimed, and that one belonged to the king alone. To the west sat the Borden barony, and they couldn't touch the southern dominion either. To make this land thrive, they needed crops, and the people strong enough to grow them because he knew they couldn't push their territory any farther. Ian clocked the look on his face, and instantly realized exactly what Ramsay was after. He told him shoot for something higher, and there's a real chance a way will open up. Ramsay's jaw dropped when Ignace read his face like it was a book, and then Ignace hit him with the truth. If he wanted land, he'd have to grab it. And he needs to tear into the Borden Baron. Ramsay was so stunned he burst out laughing, saying, "You're asking me for the impossible." With the power gap so brutal, it was over before it even started. Behind the battered barrier, Count Gardel stood firm, but his weak army had absolutely no shot at winning. Ignace demanded to know if Lord Darrell's blows still haunted those wounds, and he promised that if anything went wrong, he'd jump in and lend him a hand. Ramsay got rattled by that and blurted that he needed time to think it over. He stormed back to Hawku. He spotted a bag of gold in Ramsay's hand and demanded he share the loot with them, but Ramsay didn't even look back. He just kept striding ahead. He kept thinking Ignace is ready to help, but we're not even neighbors, so how the heck are they supposed to assist? He already knew Bartlett versus Borden, with the Gardel coalition riding shotgun, was going to end exactly the way everyone could see coming. But the townsfolk's joy wouldn't last unless their peace stayed safe and untouched. He couldn't afford to leave a single ember of conflict behind. He couldn't stop thinking that he was supposed to soak up the calm life while he built up the territory. But right away, everything went sideways. He stormed back into his territory and saw goats just roaming around, free as day. Veronica cracked a warm smile and welcomed him in, and he said things had gotten wild over there. She snapped back that her master had shipped in a ton of livestock and supplies from the expeditions. Ramsay leaned in and told her goats were omnivores that somehow thrived even in dead, barren lands. Perfect livestock for them. He ordered Eric to set up the chicken and goat pen stock, and Eric shot back that he was already on it. He started to toss out more ideas, but Danny shot him down, apologizing for catching him off guard the second he came back, then telling him to rush to the reception room because a visitor was waiting. Ramsay couldn't believe what he was seeing, and so he bolted for the reception room, staring at a well-dressed man who told Ramsay he'd finally done it. Ramsay's mind whirled with pure confusion. As the man said, he'd been waiting for ages. Ramsay snapped that he didn't think they had an appointment, then demanded to know exactly who he was. The man quickly swallowed his pride, apologized for the mistake, and then he stepped forward and introduced himself as Henry, the rightful son of Baron Ilma de Dominic. Ramsay heard that and the truth hit him hard. Baron Dominic ruled the land just south of Bartlett. He couldn't shake the question, why was he showing up right now? Then he pressed him hard, asking what Lord Henry's business was for being here with him. Henry said that ever since they'd become neighbors, he figured he'd pop over just to say hello. Then he heard Ramsay was out there battling Lord Hendrik. He timed his visit to match his return, then leaned in and said the sofa and table were a gift, so go ahead, use them whenever you want. He raised a glass, took a sip of the wine and said it was captivating, then leaned in and asked if it was called Kavos. Rage burned in Ramsay as he realized Danny had served Henry Kavos. He finally sat down and said that hearing Henry praise, it made every ounce of effort he'd poured into it feel totally worth it. Henry lit up, told him he loved it, and asked straight up if he'd teach him how to make it. He pressed other people for answers, and every single one of them said the same thing. Ramsay was the only one who knew. Ramsay leaned in and told him straight up that he couldn't. It was a vital resource that everyone depended on. He told himself there was zero chance he'd hand over his money-making recipe, then wondered if Henry was seriously that naive. Henry leaned in and told him, just sell it to me, then pressed for the price right away. Ramsay leaned in and promised him a cask for 3,000 rubella, then bumped the price higher, and he couldn't help thinking it felt way too steep. But Henry didn't even think twice. He shouted that he'd take all 10 barrels. Ramsay froze for a second, then shot back that he'd get ready and send it over. Henry told him if the moment ever comes, then come find me. Ramsay grilled him, asking if he meant at home, and Ramsay's mind snapped back. Was he really closing the gap like some wide-eyed school kid? Henry told him the date was locked, in 4 days from now would work just fine. Then he spun around and left, swearing he'd be waiting for him. Danny said Henry was pure chaos in human form, like a whirlwind that wouldn't slow down. And Ramsay said he wasn't asking for much, he just wanted a breather. On June, Roger, Ramsay, and Danny headed south out of Bartlett's territory. And while Roger shoved the cart along, he was already wiped out, groaning, "Are we there yet?" Ramsay said it was about time, and since it was his first trip to the city, the excitement was hitting him from the start. Roger told Danny to flip the switch, but Danny shot back, "We just swapped shifts." Roger then leaned in and demanded a quick break. They cracked for a breather, and Ramsay leaned in to ask the big question. Once they finished delivering, were they racing straight back to the village? Danny shut them down, swearing they were headed for Dominican land, then completely blanked on the capital's name. Roger stepped in and reminded him, its name was Dominion Dordom. Danny told me he was thinking about going to check it out. He and Roger both cornered Ramsay for pocket money, and Ramsay, already grumbling to himself, figured it was a reward for hauling the goods and promised he'd hand it over once they wrapped up the delivery. They buzzed with excitement and sprinted straight toward the cart. Roger shook off his exhaustion and told Danny, "Leave the cart, give it to me." Ramsay then snapped that they were a greedy bunch. After what felt like forever, he finally reached Dordom, and there it was, a massive concrete building towering in front of him. He noticed a mile-long line at the entrance, plus guards ready to inspect everyone, and he instantly figured the place was packed with merchants coming and going. After what felt like forever, their turn finally crashed onto the stage. Ramsay leaned into the guard and claimed he'd come straight from Bartlett territory, sent by Lord Henry of House Dominic himself. The guard jerked his head to another guard, then rushed an apology to Ramsay for the delay and told him to hang tight for a second. Ramsay's eyes widened at the abrupt turn of events, thinking that spoiled Henry would finally get the easy, no-big-deal treatment. Just then Henry burst in, breathless with an apology for the wait and firing off a frantic question, did he wait too long? Ramsay leaned in and told him, don't stress, everything's gonna be fine. Henry told them to rush to his place immediately, and Ramsay could already tell, same old pushy Henry as always. After a bit they finally rolled up to his mansion, tucked just outside the city. Ramsay spotted two strangers waiting outside the gate, then turned to Henry and demanded to know who they were. Henry leaned in and told him point-blank that those two were his real father and mother. Ramsay shot into a quick bow, then blurted out an apology for how he'd acted. Henry's father leaned in and told him, you don't have to be all formal. And it had been ages since Henry last invited a friend over. He pulled him in with a hand on his shoulder, and his mom chimed in that they'd already cooked up some seriously delicious treats. Ramsay snapped, what about the goods? And Henry shot back that his family would handle the rest. One of the workers snapped up the goods right there, then shoved the money straight into Danny and Roger's hands. Ramsay realized the vibe was turning awkward fast, because he couldn't just say they weren't friends anymore. Most of all, he had to dodge every moment that could set those neighboring lords off. Henry's father strode in and introduced himself like a storm, declaring his name was Ilma de Dominic. Ramsay bowed and introduced himself, but Ilma shot him a look and told him to stop acting stiff, just breathe, relax, and enjoy himself. Ilma sobbed that Henry finally had a friend, and then her mom shoved a full plate of food into his hands, telling him, take this and share it with your buddy. And if he was heading out, he'd better grab some pocket money. Henry hated being put on the spot, so he shot it down and told them they had enough already. He shoved Ramsay and insisted they get moving right now. Ramsay looked at them and thought, man, this feels like a perfectly normal family. Henry swung him past the door, showed him his room, and told him to toss his coat wherever he wanted. Henry burst into laughter and admitted he'd just revealed a side he desperately wished he hadn't. Ramsay praised his room like it was a masterpiece, bragging that it was packed with nothing but top-tier furniture. Henry told them, we're a real family, people who built their fortune by trading and nothing else. And his father had bought that title off a royal family that was already falling apart. And after that, the old-school aristocrats locked in on them as enemies. Ramsay couldn't help thinking it. His parents were bursting with joy, so they must have been pained about how he never had any friends. He finally clocked that Henry wasn't exactly innocent either. Henry told him to handle everything himself, right there in front of the whole family. Ramsay froze at that, thinking, in noble circles, family interests always bulldoze everything. Sure, getting by here is easy, but he didn't want any part of that, so he asked Henry if he could show him around the city, and Henry shot back, you mean Dordom? Ramsay nodded and said it was a loud, thriving trade city. Trust me, we've got to check it out when the time comes. He told himself that only time would reveal whether they'd become friends. He'd decide after seeing how it all played out. Henry grinned at the news and said, nobody knows this city like me, so I'll show you every last secret. Together they bolted outside and darted through a bunch of shops and bustling markets. One of the shop owners yanked Henry aside, told him he had some killer wine, and asked if he wanted a glass. Henry shot back, I'm swamped today, and promised, I'll come see you tomorrow. Ramsay realized the whole town actually adored him. Henry then spotted a fried bread stall and asked the woman for 2 hot, fresh ones. Ramsay saw it happen and knew, deep down, this carefree vibe was going to make blending in with them nearly impossible. They tore into the fried buns together, and Henry leaned in, asking if Ramsay's territory really didn't have a town like this. Ramsay leaned in and told him, we usually hit Hendo S to trade. Henry's eyes snapped to something, and he couldn't ignore it. Ramsay told him he didn't have to speak so formally anymore, and that nobody was going to chew him out for it. Ramsay agreed, and Henry bragged that Hendo's was a giant city, but don't worry, trade wasn't slipping away for them. Ramsay let out a sharp laugh and gave the quickest yes. Right then, a massive castle snapped into view, and Henry turned to him like, what's wrong? And Ramsay leaned in and asked if this church was tied to the minor church. Henry leaned in and told him this city was packed with merchants from the empire, and even had a special spot set aside for their prayers. Ramsay snapped his fist shut with pure anxiety and fired back. So you're telling me the Dominic family is pro-empire? He thought if that's how it goes, the Bartlett family will end up as Duke Agnes's enemy, because Baron Borden will hit them from the west, and Count Dominic will smash in from the south. Henry said not really, and shrugged like he didn't want to give it away, and lay out that they stay neutral, never picking a side, and they don't take kindly to anyone who tries to stir that up. They were a family of traitors, and as long as you had the money, they treated you like you were part of the lineup. He burst into laughter and snapped that a stuck-up nouveau rich brat like them was getting shut out. No offers from either side. Ramsay snapped at him, saying he didn't have to keep tearing himself down. Henry leaned in and asked whether he'd finally found something he wanted. Ramsay's gaze snapped to a flower that instantly caught his eye. Henry told me this flower had just burst in from the Empire, tiny, but absolutely stunning. Ramsay spotted the flower instantly, and the moment he did, he knew something about it was wrong, something totally different. In his past life, his grandma raised it in her garden, right from the ground up. And he just knew this was no ordinary bloom, it was a potato flower. He stormed up to the florist and snapped that he was taking that flower. She leaned in and told him it'd cost him 5 rubara. Ramsay heard that and snapped, figuring out they never understood how valuable it could be as food. Henry leaned in and asked if he'd ever been interested in flowers. Ramsay decided to keep his mouth shut for now, and leaned in to tell Henry that picking flowers was a proper gentleman's pastime. Henry eyed him like something was off, then snatched him up and promised, "I'm taking you somewhere way better than you think." He dragged him into a shadowy alley, and Ramsay demanded to know what kind of shop this was, and whether it was even safe to be down here like this. Henry told him to chill, saying he was a total regular around here. They stormed up to the shop's door, where a man stood watch like he owned the place. The man practically beamed as he welcomed Henry in, and the whole mood shifted instantly. And Henry set Ramsay down in front of the man for the first time. Ramsay smiled at the man and said it was a real pleasure to finally meet him, and grilled him, "So what kind of place is this exactly?" The man snapped, "This is a slave shop, and I'm Morris, the owner." They both stepped into the shop, and Ramsay's gut tightened. He'd heard the rumors about the place, and this was his first time walking in. He leaned in and asked Henry what he always did around here. And Henry told him, "I'm hunting for someone to play with me today. Come to my house after and you'll get paid too." Henry stormed out grinning, and Morris leaned in to tell Ramsay, "If you like someone, don't sit on it, go tell them." Ramsay remembered Veronica had warned him they needed slaves. He tried to tell himself he couldn't let the lingering pain from his past life, where he was taught to buy slaves, drag him down. He noticed the slaves came in every age and gender, each with a different price tag. He spotted a door and shot Morris a question, "What's behind it?" Morris leaned in and asked if he was interested, and if he wanted to take a look. Ramsay nodded, and the two of them stormed straight into that giant hall. Morris pointed out that right here they'd rounded up the former nobles, plus priests or their kids, basically the rich highborn crowd. He told them they were proud, stubborn, and hard to deal with. Most buyers wanted nothing to do with them. But these still ended up being a seriously valuable product that fetched a crazy high price. Ramsay saw that and realized, these people, even nobles above him, were trapped here like slaves. Then a boy in chains came into view, and in that dungeon the meeting was seconds from starting. Right there, a cruel fate began to click into place.